Chapter 1. Finite Mind, Finite God. The God debate is commonly staged as a binary. Either God exists or God does not. In this book, I argue that this binary is not the fundamental metaphysical fork it is treated as. It is a bad frame. The God-no-God frame invites us to treat God as an ordinary object claim, comparable to claims about planets, particles, or historical events. That invitation quietly installs a fragile assumption at the starting point, that the term God functions like an ordinary name for a candidate item within reality. If the starting point is incoherent, then centuries of argument do not indicate depth. They indicate that the argument was staged within the wrong category. Finite mind. Finite God applies existential logicism, L, to the God topic. L does not begin by adopting a party line. It begins by identifying what cannot be coherently denied, and then refusing every attempt to reintroduce contradiction, brute fact, or infinite regress as a substitute for explanation, layer. That method matters here because the God topic is not only a theological dispute. It is also a question about what a finite mind can mean when it asserts, denies, or debates ultimacy. This book is not a weapon, it is a tool. This is neither a debunking tract nor a purely sociological reduction of religion. I will not ridicule prophets or gurus, nor will I claim that religious motivation is inherently irrational. An honest reading of human history shows that religions have provided serious metaphysical and moral guidance for millennia. My claim is narrower, and it cuts more deeply when ultimacy is discussed. The concepts and arguments must satisfy the same coherence constraints that govern every other serious inquiry, or they cannot withstand scrutiny. A view does not become intelligible by being sacred, traditional, or emotionally indispensable. What would count as a success from a logical standpoint? If a God claim is to remain logically sound, it must satisfy minimal conditions independent of theological preference. At minimum, it must designate a coherent target, rather than a bundle of incompatible predicates. 2. Retain intersubjective traction, meaning it can be stated in a way that different finite agents can meaningfully contest and refine. 2. Avoid functioning as a brute stopper that halts explanation by stipulation. And IV. Remain compatible with the constraints already secured by L, including the impossibility of absolute nothingness and the rejection of explanatory infinite regress. Ion. Layer. If a God claim cannot meet these conditions, the debate is not difficult, because the truth is hidden. It is difficult because the terms are not yet doing stable work. 1.1 The ground floor that every side already presupposes. Any sincere dispute presupposes at least three things: that something is occurring, that terms retain enough stability to function, and that inference has norms. In L, the first presupposition is secured by the epistemic refutation paradox, ERP. The ERP is not a rhetorical maneuver. It is the claim that global skepticism cannot be tokened without leaving behind at least one residue, namely the occurrence of the attempt itself. If an epistemic agent tokens any substantive state, then there exists at least one occurrence. A global denial of occurrences cannot be coherently tokened. This yields a minimal realism in which at least one occurrence is inescapably given. We will refer to this as token realism. This starting point is deliberately modest. It does not choose materialism, idealism, or any other high-level metaphysics. It only insists that a question cannot be asked unless there is an occurrence in which it is asked. That is why the existential ground is not a worldview competing with other worldviews. It is the ground floor they all already stand on. Two further L results constrain the most common extremes. First, the illusion of nothingness, ion, blocks the temptation to treat nothing as a metaphysical alternative that could have obtained. In L's modal formulation, reality is necessarily non-empty, meaning there is at least one occurrence that obtains. Second, the logical elimination of the infinite regress, layer, blocks the temptation to treat infinite regress as a complete explanation. In L, a dependent story counts as complete only if it is well-founded in the relevant sense, rather than deferred without termination. Finally, persistent present determinism, PPD, constrains how time and before can be used when creation and ultimacy are discussed. If an argument relies on a picture of time that contradicts the structure of experience, the argument may be sophisticated and still be category confused. These L pillars are not optional background. They're the framework that determines which conceptual moves remain live. This volume extends that framework to God talk, where God talk is treated as a claim made by finite agents from within experience. Zejda, 2025. 1.2 Why the God question is often ill-posed. The God-no-God frame tempts both theist and atheist into the same conceptual mistake. The mistake is not primarily evidential. It is categorical. The frame encourages the treatment of God as if it were a candidate item in the inventory of reality, merely more powerful, more distant, or less detectable than ordinary objects. Within that frame, theism asserts a supernatural entity, and atheism denies that entity. The debate then becomes a dispute over evidence, miracles, scripture, and metaphysical arguments. The problem is that God is not stable across these uses. In one register, God is treated as a personal agent who wants, commands, rewards, punishes, loves, hates, and intervenes. In another register, God is treated as the unlimited, necessary, ultimate ground of what obtains. These are not two opinions about one object. They are different categories. A question built out of incompatible predicates does not become meaningful by repetition. It becomes an institutional habit. In the introduction essay, I informally called the disciplined exit from this habit existential agnosticism, EI. So we will use it here. The name itself is not important, and the label can be revised later. The logical point, however, is inescapable. Some disputes simply cannot be resolved in their current state because the terms have not designated a coherent target. In that situation, there is no substantive choice between the two sides. In the same way, there is no substantive choice about whether a square circle exists. The work is to dismantle and then repair the frame until it becomes a claim with determinate content. 1.3 Unlimited ultimacy implies collapse into totality. One of the central structural moves in this book is what I call the collapse proof. Suppose God is defined, in the sense that many, if not theists, intend as unlimited and ultimate. Then there cannot be God plus something else at the same ontological level. If something exists outside God, then God is not ultimate in the relevant sense. Two cases remain. Either the term God refers to total existence, in which case God exists collapses into the existential ground, or the term God refers to a bounded subsystem, in which case God is finite and non-ultimate. This is not a verbal trick. It is a constraint on reference under a specified role. If a term is required to be unlimited and ultimate, it cannot coherently pick out a separate individual alongside the rest of what obtains. This collapse also explains a common symmetry in God debates. The atheist is often correct to reject an anthropomorphic cosmic character. The error is to treat that rejection as the end of inquiry. A negation is not yet an account of the ground floor. L supplies a positive ground floor and a disciplined method for extending it without contradiction. The task is not to select a tribe. The task is to state what follows from what cannot be denied. 1.4 The finite mind constraint. The God-no-God frame also hides a second constraint. Even if ultimacy is real, every claim about it is made by a finite mind from within the epistemic interface. L formalizes this as Tripp's prison. Whatever is known, believed, imagined, or denied arrives as a token inside experience. And there is no standpoint outside tokening from which a token can be compared to reality without using another token. This is not psychological pessimism. It is the structural condition of having a mind. Some theological strategies attempt to bypass this condition by invoking a God's eye view, a view from nowhere, or an appeal to mystery. L blocks the bypass. Even an appeal to a God's eye view is itself a frame, tokened within experience. Frames can be widened, refined, and abstracted. They cannot be escaped by stipulation. This condition will be treated as a primary datum throughout the book. If a claim about God cannot be cashed out into anything tokenable in experience, it is not yet a claim with determinate content. If a claim about God can be cashed out into tokenable content, then it is human-mediated by definition. That does not render it false. It locates it, and it constrains what kinds of authority the claim can plausibly bear. 1.5% A roadmap without the illusion of neutrality. This chapter is an opening thesis statement, not a catalogue. Still, a project that claims to disassemble the God topic must make its scope visible. To be complete, the analysis must address I, the major families of God concepts, 2, the major claims of authority and revelation, and 2, the moral architecture behind salvation, hell, and accountability. God concepts as a constrained space. I treat major God concept families as a constrained space rather than an endless zoo. Classical theism, deism, personalist theism, pantheism, panentheism, process and open theism, polytheism and henotheism, and non-dual or apophatic ultimacy are not merely different preferences. They are different attempts to solve the same representational problem, Zalta. 2026a, Zalta 2026 hours, two sieves recur throughout, the collapse proof and the preference finitude result. A God with preferences behaves like a finite agent, and thereby inherits finitude. A God that is truly unlimited collapses into totality, and thereby ceases to be a competing entity. Revelation and authority as channel claims. I treat revelation and authority claims as instances of a single structural thesis, the human interface thesis. Whether the claim is prophecy, miracle, scripture, angelic mediation, religious experience, or institutional tradition, the informational endpoint is always a human report in human language. I also treat closed revelation and the silence of new revelation as data that require explanation, not as background assumptions, internal justice logic and accountability constraints. A wide range of traditions explicitly build some form of fairness clause into their moral architecture, often formulated as an ignorance exception or capacity condition. In other words, responsibility is portrayed as sensitive to knowledge and ability. A representative Christian formulation is commonly rendered as follows: from everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. Luke 12:48, NRS View 2021. A representative Pauline formulation is commonly rendered as follows: what the law requires is written on their hearts. Romans 2:15, NRS View 2021. Catholic doctrine often states the same constraint, in the language of no-fault ignorance, commonly summarized by the phrase, through no fault of their own. Triple C, Section 847, Catholic Church 1997. A representative Quranic constraint on punishment by access is commonly rendered as follows: we do not punish until we have sent a messenger. Quran 1715, Abdel Halim 2004. A representative Quranic constraint on burden by capacity is commonly rendered as follows: God does not burden a soul beyond its capacity. Quran 2:28-6, Abdel Halim 2004. These examples are not being invoked as metaphysical proofs. They are invoked because they encode a moral principle internal to the religions themselves. Culpability is constrained by access and capacity. Once that principle is taken seriously, a further consequence follows. Belief is not a voluntary button that can be flipped on demand. Contemporary epistemology discusses this under the heading of doxastic involuntarism, Zalta. 2026d. If belief is not directly voluntary, and if ignorance excuses, then the moral distinction between unreached and reached but unconvinced, due to evidence, psychology, and history, becomes unstable. I call the resulting pressure point the salvation paradox, maximally intelligent reading and the drift toward apophysis. I treat the strongest interpretive defense of religion as an object of analysis rather than an objection to be dismissed. The contemporary label Steelman is widely used for constructing the strongest plausible version of an opponent's argument. For the purposes of this book, the present usage formalizes that norm as a hermeneutic policy under L constraints and aligns it with established principles of interpretive charity. I will call this the Steelman hermeneutic. When a believer is pressed by contradiction or cruelty in a text, the most coherent move is often to retreat from literalism, to contextualize, to moralize, and to abstract. Across traditions, this drift converges on some version of the apophatic move and, at its limit, the Ineffability Shield, Zalta. 2026. For example, Jewish and Christian scripture contains metaphysical language that points away from ordinary finite predicates, often crystallized in the I am formulation. I am who I am. Exodus 3:14, NRS View 2021. Islam contains widely cited guardrails against assimilation of ultimacy to creaturely likeness, often summarized as, there is nothing like him. Quran 4:211, Abdel Halim 2004. Taoist and Advaita traditions build related constraints directly into the grammar of ultimacy, often rendered in formulations such as, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao, Tao Te Ching 1, Laozi 1972, and the eliminative refrain, not this, Upanishads, Neti, Upanishads 1965. My claim is not that these traditions secretly teach L. My claim is that when read under maximal intelligence, many traditions are pushed by their own internal standards toward an ultimate that is beyond finite predicates. At that point, the remaining content looks increasingly like the existential ground, not like a separate supernatural person, institutions, overlays, and the map territory mistake. Finally, I treat the institutional layer without moral theater. Religions are not only metaphysical claims, they are also social technologies. Durkheim, 1995, Weber 1978, Foucault 1977. That does not mean they're reducible to control. It means that doctrine, ritual, purity codes, identity boundaries, and threat architectures predictably emerge when a translation layer is treated as the territory. This is the control overlay problem, and it must be analyzed with conceptual and empirical discipline, not with cynicism. Korzybski, 1933, 1.6. What follows when the frame dissolves? A common fear is that dissolving the God-no-God frame yields nihilism. That fear confuses the removal of one picture with the removal of value. L treats morality as a product of deterministic forces interacting with conscious systems, not as edicts falling from outside reality. In L, the contingency guillotine, CG, blocks ought from being smuggled into the world as a stance-free cosmic law and the deterministic moral forces, DMF. Framework explains why moral phenomena can retain full force inside experience, even when a divine lawgiver is removed. Zejid. 2025, this book extends that result to soteriology, meaning, identity, and existential fear. The target is not the human needs that religion responds to. The target is the intellectual cage created when finite maps are treated as ultimate territory. Korzybski. 1933. The next step is therefore not to argue about ultimacy in the abstract. It is to secure the channel constraints that govern any alleged ultimacy communication. Chapter 2 begins by establishing the human interface thesis, the claim that public revelation, whatever its source, arrives for assessment as human testimony in human language. That fact does not refute revelation. It specifies the only location where revelation can be evaluated by finite minds. 1.7 Formal derivation for Chapter 1, Finite Mind, Finite God. 1.7.1 Finite Mind Constraint, then detained by M. Then C is necessarily tokened with any God concept GM, is an inter-not function as a direct external grasp of ultimacy. Entertaining a cognitive act of M. Any cognitive act that is available to M is by definition of an epistemic subject available to a presentational medium, here called the experiential interface. Therefore, if C is entertained by M, there exists of M in which C is presented or encoded for M. That is exactly what it means for C to be tokened within M's interface. For the second claim, suppose for contradiction that GM functions for M as a direct external grasp of ultimacy, meaning that its content is accessed in a way that is not mediated by any internal tokening within M. Then M would have epistemic access to content that is not presentable within M's own interface. This contradicts the minimal condition for an agent having any epistemic standpoint at all, namely that whatever is available for judgment, assent, denial, or inference is available only via internal presentation. A fully explicit development of this mediation constraint is supplied in Chapter 2, the human interface thesis and its corollaries. Theorem 1.2, Finite Mind, Finite God. Assume GM is any God concept entertained by a finite mind M. Either IGM is treated as a finite agent within the world, in which case it is not ultimate and collapses into a finite object of experience, or 2, GM is treated as ultimate and unlimited, in which case its literal content collapses toward totality or existential ground and cannot remain a distinct personal being. Therefore, for finite minds, the classical God-no-God framing is structurally unstable, and the distinction collapses into either finitude or totality. Proof sketch. Fix a finite mind M and a God concept GM. There are two stable readings. Case I, agentive personal reading. If GM is treated as a personal agent in the ordinary sense, acting, willing, commanding, preferring, then it inherits preference structure, and therefore limitation. The formal route from personhood, predicates to preference structure, and from preference structure to limitation, is established in Chapter 7, Preference Finitude and the Finite God Trap. Under that result, GM cannot be unlimited ultimacy. It is a finite entity within the world. Case 2, ultimacy totality reading. If GM is treated as ultimate and unlimited, then the concept cannot coherently be located as a distinct entity, alongside the totality it is supposed to ground. The core collapse step is given by lemma 1.5, proved below. Ultimacy plus unlimitedness entails that nothing exists outside the referent of the concept, so the concept's extension collapses toward totality. Once ultimacy is treated with full discipline, literal anthropomorphic predication cannot be maintained without equivocation. Chapter 6 applies the formal endpoint of this pressure, apophatic convergence. The strongest theology is pushed toward negative theology, analogy or metaphor, which abandons the claim that the referent is a distinct personal being in the ordinary sense. In both cases, the classical binary framing does not remain stable. The agentive personal reading yields finitude. The ultimacy totality reading yields collapse toward totality and a demotion of literal personhood. The present theorem is therefore a capstone schema whose full development is distributed across chapters 2, 6, and 7, 1.7.2 supporting definitions and lemma. Definition 1.3, finite mind and experiential interface. A mind M is an epistemic subject capable of entertaining concepts, forming doxastic attitudes, and performing inference. The experiential interface of M, written I, M, is the totality of internal presentational states through which anything is available to M for judgment. M is a finite mind if the information capacity of I, M, is bounded in the minimal sense that M cannot represent, at a single time, arbitrarily many independent distinctions with unbounded precision. No thesis about the material implementation of M is assumed. A concept C is tokened within I, M, if there exists some state SIM, such that S functions as M's internal presentation of C, the state in virtue of which M can entertain, deny, or reason about C. Definition 1.4. God concept types. Let GM denote a God concept entertained by a mind. MGM is agentive personal if it attributes to its referent personhood predicates in the ordinary, action-guiding sense, for example. Willing, commanding, choosing, rewarding, punishing, preferring. GM is ultimacy totality if it attributes to its referent ultimacy predicates, for example, being the necessary ground of all existence. Unlimited, not bounded by anything ontologically independent. Lemma 1.5. Ultimacy collapse schema. Let G be a candidate referent of an ultimacy totality God concept. If G is unlimited and ultimate in the sense that nothing exists outside its grounding scope, then there is no ontologically independent reality outside G. In particular, if there were some existent X outside G, then G would be limited by X and would not be unlimited ultimacy. Proof. Assume G is unlimited and ultimate. Suppose, for contradiction, that there exists some X such that X exists and X is outside the grounding scope of G. Then X constitutes an ontological remainder relative to G, which means G does not exhaust the relevant totality. In that case, G is limited by what remains outside it, and therefore fails to be unlimited ultimacy. Contradiction. Hence no such X can exist. Remark 1.6. Lemma 1.5 is not a claim about whether reality is personal, impersonal, material, or spiritual. It is a structural claim about the concept of ultimacy. If one asserts an unlimited ultimate, one cannot also consistently posit an ontologically independent remainder outside its scope. Chapter 2, the Human Interface Thesis. A large portion of the modern conversation about God begins in the wrong place. It begins as if the primary question were a clean metaphysical binary, a dispute about what exists. But historically, religions do not function as bare metaphysics. They function as scriptural authority claims, as prophecy and miracle claims, as interpretive regimes, as canonical boundaries, and as moral jurisdiction flowing from those things. If the central social claim of a religion is that it carries binding authority, then the primary philosophical question is not first-order metaphysics. The primary question is epistemic and institutional. How would any finite agent ever gain access to what is alleged to be ultimate, and how could that access generate binding authority for anyone else? That is the practical question that governs worship, law, salvation, and moral obligation. This chapter begins by fixing the epistemic object. Before I evaluate downstream doctrines, I isolate the channel by which anything called revelation becomes public and usable. Finite mind, finite God is built on existential logicism, L, and L begins with a structural fact, any content that functions. In reasoning does so from within an epistemic interface, as a token structure in an epistemic frame. That constraint is not uniquely religious. It is the condition of cognition itself. Here it becomes the first tool for a historically disciplined disassembly. 2.1 Epistemic frame closure, and why it matters for religion. In L, an epistemic interface is the total channel by which an agent is related to reality. It is not merely sensory. It includes perception, attention, memory, inference, and the practical criteria by which the agent treats some token states as describing what is real. The epistemic refutation paradox, ERP, formalizes a minimal closure point. Any attempt to adopt a global epistemic stance is itself an occurrence, tokened within experience. Tripp's prison tightens that into a non-escape principle. Anything that can matter to an agent's reasoning is realized as a token state within some epistemic frame. In ordinary language, the closure claim can be stated like this. Any description that can matter to any agent is already a token structure inside some agent's epistemic frame. There is no operational standpoint outside all frames. If a supposed description never enters any reasoning process, then it is epistemically idle. If it does enter reasoning, then it enters as a token within a frame. This is not a limitation of religion. It is a limitation of cognition. The relevance to religion is direct. A religious system that claims to deliver ultimate truth cannot evade the interface condition. Whatever the alleged source is, the only object. Anyone ever evaluates as an interface-bounded artifact, a report, a memory, an utterance, a text, a ritualized recitation, a doctrinal summary, an interpreted tradition. That artifact may or may not be reliable. It may or may not track what its adherents think it tracks, but it is not the alleged source itself. It is a human-accessible token sequence. This chapter does not begin by declaring that every religion is false. That would be easy and uninformative. I begin by locating the public object. Once the object is fixed, many debates about God and revelation change category. They become debates about testimony, transmission, and interpretation, rather than debates about a pure external authority. 2.2. The Human Interface Thesis. Religions often speak as if there were an unbroken chain from God to human minds. What exists historically is a chain from human minds to other human minds. Sometimes the chain is grounded in a founding figure, who is treated as an endpoint. Sometimes it is grounded in a text treated as an endpoint. Sometimes it is grounded in an institution treated as an endpoint. But in every case, the public evidence is a chain of human tokenings. I will use the phrase human interface thesis to name this structural fact, human interface thesis. A public religious authority claim, insofar as it functions in human reasoning and practice, is human interface bound. It can be received, evaluated, transmitted, and acted upon only as a token structure within human epistemic frames, mediated by human cognition, human language, and human social transmission. 2 clarifications matter. First, this thesis is compatible with many metaphysical views. One can be a theist and accept it. One can be an atheist and accept it. It is not a conclusion about whether God exists. It is a conclusion about what it would mean for a human community to possess, as a community, a binding word from God. Second, the thesis applies most sharply to what I will call public revelation. Public revelation is any revelation claim offered as authoritative for people other than the initial recipient. Private revelation may be psychologically powerful for the subject, but the moment it is offered as authority for others, it enters epistemology of testimony. 2.3. The revelation is recognized as interface-bound. It becomes natural to treat the path from alleged source to public artifact as a filter. The filter need not be malicious. The point is not moral theater. The point is structural. Filters have stages, stages have transformations, and transformations have consequences. I will use the term revelation filter for the composite transformation that maps an alleged source event into a publicly available religious artifact. At minimum, the revelation filter includes A. A cognitive stage, perception, attention, memory, imagination, affect. B. A linguistic stage, expression in a particular natural language with its semantic and pragmatic constraints. C. A social stage, testimony, authority recognition, transmission chain dynamics. D. A documentary stage, recording, copying, redaction, translation. E. A canon stage, canon formation, and the institutional act of delimiting what counts as authoritative. F. An interpretive stage, hermeneutics and the hermeneutic circle by which texts receive meaning in communities. In effect, interface pipeline is not a single pipe, but a sequence of pipes. Each pipe has compression, loss, and re-encoding. Even if one grants, for the sake of argument, that there is a divine source at the headwaters, the water that reaches the public is not raw source. It is what survives the pipeline. This framing does not require adjudicating every historical detail of every canon. It is enough that religions, as historical phenomena, in fact have transmission chains, textual variation, translation disputes, and canon disagreements. That is an ordinary property of human cultural artifacts. Textual criticism exists as a discipline precisely because texts have histories. Metzger. And Ehrman 2005, oral tradition, when it functions as a transmission mechanism, has its own dynamics and vulnerabilities, precisely because it is a human social practice rather than a frictionless conduit. Van Sina. 1985. 2.4% revelation as testimony, not as direct access. Most believers are not prophets. Most believers do not receive public revelation firsthand. Their epistemic situation is therefore not primarily mystical. It is testimonial. In contemporary epistemology, testimony is recognized as a fundamental source of belief, with its own standards and vulnerabilities. Cody. 1992, Zalta 2026 The Thought. The relevance to religion is immediate. Testimony reduction. For any agent who did not directly experience a supposed revelatory event, the evidential basis of that event is testimony or artifacts produced by testimony. Texts, recitations, traditions. Therefore, the epistemology of public revelation is an instance of the epistemology of testimony. Cody. 1992, Zalta 2026I. This does not mean testimony is worthless. Human life is saturated with testimony, and it would be irrational to reject it wholesale. The point is that testimony is never identical to direct access. It is mediated access. It inherits the ordinary properties of mediation, trust calibration, competing reports, incentives, memory limits, social pressures, and interpretive frames. In religion, these ordinary properties are amplified. The time horizons are longer, the communities are larger, the identity stakes are higher, and the costs of dissent can be severe. A theory of public revelation that treats testimony as a clean download is not historically adequate. It confuses the alleged upstream with the actual downstream. 2.5% non-human intermediaries do not bypass the interface. Many traditions anticipate an obvious objection. Perhaps revelation is not merely human speech. Perhaps God uses angels, spirits, visions, or other non-human intermediaries. Even if such intermediaries existed, the human interface thesis problem is not solved. The reason is simple. Whatever the intermediary is, the community's access to it is still human. A claimed angelic message enters history as a human report. A claimed vision enters history as a human report. A claimed demonic deception enters history as a human report. The ontology of the intermediary does not change the epistemic form of the evidence. Intermediary invariance. Introducing a non-human intermediary does not change the downstream epistemic situation for a community, because the public deliverable remains a human-accessible token sequence. The intermediary does not eliminate the interface. It adds a hypothesized causal layer upstream of the same kind of downstream artifact. This is exactly the kind of move L already anticipates when it formalizes the impossibility of an operative view from nowhere. If a supposed external message plays a role in reasoning, it does so as a token internal to some frame. The human interface thesis is the application of that general result to revelation claims. 2.6 Language and translation. Interpretation is not optional. Religions often present their texts as if meaning was simply present on the page. But meaning is not a property of ink. Meaning is a property of use, context, and interpretive practice. That claim is not a fashionable slogan. It is a basic fact about natural language and understanding. If revelation is expressed in a human language, it inherits the constraints of human language. A. Lexical limitation of finite vocabulary encoding finite distinctions. B. Pragmatic dependence, meaning depends on context and shared background. C. Metaphor and approximation. Discourse about ultimacy routinely operates non-literally. D. Translation variance. Multiple target languages produce systematically different renderings. The discipline of hermeneutics exists because interpretation is unavoidable. Gadamer. 2004. Zalta 2026e, the hermeneutic. Circle is not a defect to be eliminated. It is the structure of understanding. One interprets the parts by the whole and the whole by the parts, guided by prior assumptions. In religion, this is intensified. The interpreter often arrives with high-stakes commitments, community expectations, and inherited doctrinal frameworks. The resulting meaning is not discovered in a vacuum. It is produced within a living practice. Translation drift. Because semantic content depends on linguistic resources and interpretive context, doctrinal content is not preserved identically across languages and communities. Even under maximal good faith, translation and interpretation generate structured divergence. Gadamer. 2004, Zalta 2026e. This means that even if a text were perfect, it would still require an interpretive community. And once interpretation is admitted, disagreement is no longer surprising. It becomes expected. Exegetical dispute and doctrinal divergence are not anomalies. They are the normal footprint of interface-bounded texts interacting with finite minds in social settings. Zalta. 2026e 2.7 Canon formation. Who decides what counts as the word of God? A third pressure point is canon formation. Even if one grants that some set of texts are in some sense revelatory, one still faces a selection problem. Which texts? Which versions? Which boundaries? Which interpretive authorities? Historically, canons are formed. They're not simply found as finished products with universal agreement, floating above history. Canon formation follows a recognizable mechanism across traditions. There is early plurality, there are competing claims to authority, there is selection and stabilization, there is exclusion, and there are institutions that maintain the boundary. M.C. Donald. 2007, Barton, 2019. To make the structure concrete, here are short transmission chain sketches for several major traditions. The aim is not encyclopedic coverage. The aim is to exhibit the same invariant. Public authority arrives as a human historical artifact. Judaism. The public religious object includes received texts, scribal transmission, and interpretive traditions that stabilize meaning over time. Even when a community treats a text as uniquely authoritative, the text is encountered through historically located forms, language, and inherited interpretive practice. Barton. 2019. Christianity. The public object begins with founding claims about Jesus and apostolic witnesses, then moves through oral proclamation, letters, and gospel composition, then through manuscript transmission, copying, and textual variation, and then through canon delimitation and doctrinal stabilization in institutions. Metzger. 1987, Metzger and Ehrman, 2005. M.C. Donald, 2007. The resulting Christian landscape includes canonical boundary disputes and interpretive fragmentation that are historically intelligible once the interface and filter are taken seriously. Metzger. 1987 Islam. The public object begins with a founding recipient, then recitation and memorization in a community, then compilation and stabilization of a textual corpus, and then the development of layered authority structures distinguishing Quran, Hadith, jurisprudence, and commentary. Questions of collection, standardization, and report reliability are not external criticisms. They are part of the tradition's own technical vocabulary because the object is a transmitted artifact. 1977, 9 Hindu traditions. The public object includes a distinction between Shruti and Smriti, with extensive oral transmission, later textual stabilization, and interpretive schools that mediate meaning and practice. The boundaries of authority are maintained through lineage, commentary, and ritual pedagogy, not through an uninterpreted universal broadcast, flood. 1996 Buddhist traditions. The public object begins with remembered discourses, then compilation into multiple canonical bodies, often described under the umbrella of the Tripitaka, and then further layering through regional transmission, translation, and the emergence of later textual corpora and commentarial traditions. Gethin. 1998. I will not attempt in this chapter to resolve every historical critical question. Later chapters will quote primary sources where doctrinal claims are being evaluated. Here, the point is structural. Any claim that a canon is uniquely authoritative must pass through human decisions and human institutions. The moment a community says, "These are the texts," it performs a normative act. That act is itself a human occurrence, carried by tokens, stabilized by institutions, and maintained by pedagogy. This does not imply bad faith. It implies finitude. It implies that scriptural authority is inseparable from social authority. 2.8 Closed revelation and the silence pressure. The disassembly also requires confronting closed revelation and silence of new revelation. Many major traditions imply, explicitly or functionally, that the public revelatory deposit is closed in the relevant sense. Canon is treated as fixed. Foundational recipients and events are treated as past. Authoritative editions are treated as illegitimate, heretical, or subordinate. Metzger. 1987. Burton claim that no one ever has religious experiences now. It is a narrower claim about public authority. The binding mechanism is historically localized. It relies on ancient events and ancient texts. It does not update in a way that is publicly verifiable and globally accessible with the clarity one would expect if the point were universal disclosure. That observation does not refute any metaphysics on its own. It does, however, fix the epistemic situation that later arguments must respect. If ultimacy intends to bind all minds, then the method by which it binds them is, in practice, a human historical artifact. It is not a continuously present, universally legible channel. In later chapters I will connect this to the Fairness Clause and to doxastic involuntarism. For now the task is simpler. I am fixing the frame. Public religion, as a historical reality, is not a pipeline from God to humanity. It is a pipeline from humans to humans with an upstream hypothesis attached. 2.9%. What this chapter secures for the rest of the argument. With human interface thesis and revelation filter in place, I can state the guiding constraint that will govern every later critique. I will refer to it as the human interface constraint. The formal statement and proof appear in this chapter's appendix. Informally, the constraint is this: human interface constraint, informal. If a revelation claim plays any role in an agent's reasoning or practice, then it is represented within that agent's epistemic frame as a token structure, and any warrant the agent can have for it is mediated by the stages described by the revelation filter. There is no route by which a claim can function as binding public revelation for an agent, while bypassing human mediation. This is not yet the disassembly. It is the first tool needed to do it without drifting into rhetoric. Once the epistemic object is fixed, later chapters can proceed with precision. If revelation is interface-bound, then it cannot serve as a clean divider between insiders and outsiders without invoking further assumptions about access, capacity, and responsibility. If canon is historically formed, then exclusivist authority claims inherit historical contingency. If interpretation is unavoidable, then doctrinal pluralism is not a scandal but a predictable output of finite minds working with finite texts. The next chapter turns these constraints into a moral pressure point by examining how traditions themselves encode ignorance, capacity, and accountability. 2.10 Formal derivation of the human interface thesis. Definition. 2.1 Epistemic interface. Let it be an epistemic agent. An epistemic interface for A is a structure. IA equal to tar. A, where A tar, is a non-empty set of token states available to A, perception, memory, imagination, inferential states, and other representational states. B, A is an update relation on TA, capturing experience, memory consolidation, and other state transitions. C, A is an inferential relation by which it treats some token states as reasons for others. Reasoning as tokening. A proposition or content phi is available to A only insofar as phi is represented, for A, by some TTA. Definition. 2.2 Public doctrinal claim. A public doctrinal claim is a proposition delta presented within a community as I, action guiding or belief guiding for members, and 2, normatively binding for agents beyond the immediate claimant, typically by appeal to public revelation, scriptural authority, or institutional authority. Definition. 2.3 Testimony. Testimony is an act or artifact in which an agent S presents a proposition phi as true to a recipient R, and R treats that presentation, directly or via an artifact such as a text or recitation, as part of R's evidential basis for phi. Cody 1992, Zolter 2026I. Definition. 2.4 Transmission chain. Fix a proposition phi I and a recipient agent A. A transmission chain for phi I relative to A is a finite sequence, x0, x1, xn, of agents and artifacts such that A, x0 is an originating report or originating event as reported. B, for each I and she plus 1, is produced from she by communication, teaching, copying, redaction, translation, or institutional stabilization. C, xn is the tokened artifact by which phi is presented to a within A's epistemic interface. This definition treats both oral tradition and text-based preservation as special cases of the same general mechanism. Vancina. Metzger and 5. Human interface thesis. Metzger and Ehrman 2-point agent is mediated by some transmission tags and human linguistic artifacts within A's epistinterface. The human interface thesis that every public doctrinal claim is human interface bound. Definition filter. Let E be an alleged revelatory event. A public doctrinal claim revelation filter for E, F E delta, E delta, equal to ATS, LSE, include A, C, cognitive tokening, memory, imagination, and affect an originating subject. B, L, linguistic encoding, expression in a particular natural language, with its semantic and pragmatic constraints. C, S, social transmission, testimony and authority recognition dynamics that propagate the report. DD, documentary stabilization, recording, copying, redaction, and translation within document histories. E, K, canon selection, canon formation as a delimitation of authoritative artifacts. F, H, interpretive uptake, hermeneutics as communist-stabilized meaning assignment. This definition abstracts over historical details while tracking the generic structure of transmission and canonization in public religions. Metzger and Ehrman, 2005. Metzger, 1987, Tripp's prison. Let A be an epistemic agent, and let phi be any proposition that figures in A's reasoning or practice. Then phi is available to A only as a token structure within A's epistemic interface. Proof. This is the closure result established in L under Tripp's prison as a consequence of ERP. Any epistemic stance, including any act of entertaining phi, is itself an occurrence within experience, and therefore must be realized as a token state internal to some epistemic frame. Lemma 2.8, testimony reduction. Let D be a public doctrinal claim purportedly grounded in an alleged revelatory event E. Let her be an agent who did not directly experience E. Then any warrant A has for D is mediated by testimony and artifacts produced by testimony. Equivalently, the epistemology of D for A is an instance of epistemology of testimony. Cody, 1992, Zalta 2026I. Proof. If A did not directly experience E, then A's epistemic access to E is not direct experience, but a report or an artifact, text, recitation, tradition, produced by others. By theorems 2.3 and 2.4, such reports and artifacts are testimony or products of testimony. Therefore, any warrant A has for delta is mediated by testimony. Lemma 2.9 variants. Let delta be a public doctrinal claim purportedly grounded in an alleged revelatory event E. Let her be an agent who did not directly experience. Suppose an additional hypothesis H is introduced asserting that E involved a non-human intermediary, for example, an angelic messenger, a spirit, a demon, or another non-human agent. Then H does not alter the epistemic form of A's warrant for delta. In particular, A's access to delta remains mediated by testimony and human interface artifacts. Cody. Proof. For an agent ago, for an agent acquaintance E, the evidential basis for delta consists of a transmission chain terminating an interface. Introducing H changes only an upstream causal stream fact that delta is available to it only via human testimony and transmission. Hence the epistemic form remains testimonied. Lemma 2.10, translation drift, and let L be a distinct natural language. Let U be an utterance in L, used within a transmission chain supporting a public doctrinal claim delta. If U is transmitted into L by translation and then stabilized by community interpretation, then the semantic and pragmatic content associated to U is not preserved as a unique invariant across agents and contexts. Consequently, the public content of delta is not invariant under cross-language and cross-community transmission. Gadamer, 2004. Zalta, 2026e. Proof. Natural language meaning is context-sensitive and depends on pragmatic background, shared practices, and interpretive presuppositions. Translation is therefore not a structure-preserving isomorphism on meanings, but an underdetermined mapping that requires interpretive choices. Community stabilization of meaning proceeds via hermeneutic practice, including the hermeneutic circle, which can differ across communities and histories. Gadamer, 2004. Zalta, 2026e, therefore, across translation and interpretive uptake. Semantic content exhibits drift rather than a unique invariant preservation. Theorem 0.11. Human interface constraint. Let her be an epistemic agent. Let delta be a public doctrinal claim that plays a role in A's reasoning or practice. Then, A. Delta is available to A only as a token structure within A's epistemic interface. B. Any warrant A has for delta is mediated by a revelation filter, and therefore by interface-bounded artifacts, experience, testimony, text, tradition, produced and stabilized through a transmission chain. In particular, there is no route by which delta can function as binding public authority for a while, bypassing human mediation and interpretation. Proof. Clause A follows from theorem 2.7%. For clause B, because delta is a public doctrinal claim in a public religion, its availability to A is historically mediated by communication, preservation, and community meaning assignment. By theorems 2.4 and 2.6, those mediations constitute a revelation filter and a transmission chain, and therefore any warrant. For delta is mediated by interface-bounded artifacts. If a non-human intermediary is posited upstream, theorem 2.9 shows this does not change the epistemic form for A. If translation and interpretation are involved, theorem 2.10 shows that the public content is not uniquely invariant across agents and contexts. Hence no bypass of human mediation or interpretation is available for public doctrinal authority. Corollary 2.12, no uninterpreted public word of God. There does not exist a public doctrinal claim delta that is publicly accessible to human agents as an uninterpreted non-human deliverance, in the sense of being available with warrant, while bypassing human interface mediation and interpretive uptake. Proof. Assume for contradiction that such a delta exists for some human agent while bypassing human mediation and interpretive uptake. Because delta plays a role in A's reasoning or practice, theorem 2.1 post implies delta is available to A epistemic interface, and that any warrant for delta is mediated by the revelation filter. This contradicts the bypass condition. Chapter 3. The Fairness Clause, Ignorance Exceptions Across Religions. The previous chapter argued that public religion arrives through human interface. Whatever else a tradition claims about divine origin, it is mediated by finite transmitters, finite languages, finite institutions, and finite cognitive uptake. That point matters for epistemology. This chapter isolates a different pressure point. It matters for moral structure. Across multiple traditions, divine judgment is not presented as a flat binary gate keyed to a single propositional state. Even when a tradition publicly emphasizes belief, allegiance, or right worship, its own authoritative materials often introduce excusing conditions. The structure is recognizable. Responsibility is conditioned by I, what an agent could reasonably know, and second, what an agent could reasonably do. In this chapter, I call that recurrent structure the Fairness Clause. Two clarifications prevent category mistakes. First, I am not claiming that every adherent of a tradition interprets these materials in the same way. I am tracking what is present in canonical or semi-canonical sources and widely recognized doctrinal summaries, and then reading the logical consequences that follow from their presence. Second, I am not treating the Fairness Clause as an external moral axiom smuggled into religion from secular ethics. The argument runs the other direction. The claim is that major traditions themselves, in their own authorized language, introduce excusing conditions that make culpability sensitive to epistemic access and normative capacity. Those concessions become internal constraints on how a tradition can coherently frame judgment. 3.1 The structure of responsibility, access, and capacity. Human moral practice already distinguishes between ignorance that excuses and ignorance that does not, and between incapacity that excuses and incapacity that does not. Legal systems, for example, routinely distinguish intent, negligence, coercion, diminished capacity, and developmental immaturity. The point here is not to import any particular legal doctrine into theology. It is simply to note that the underlying distinction is not exotic. Philosophically, the same structure appears in debates around ought implies can. The slogan is contentious in its strongest form, but the motivating intuition is straightforward. A demand that is literally impossible for an agent, in the relevant sense of possible, does not function as a fair basis for blame. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy tracks the major positions and arguments in the modern literature. Zalta. 2026. G. Within religion, the same intuition is often expressed without the philosophical label. It appears as a fairness constraint on divine judgment. A tradition may disagree about how much knowledge is required, what counts as real opportunity, what capacities matter, and how divine grace interacts with human limitation. But the structural move is the same. There are conditions under which non-compliance is treated as non-culpable or less culpable. For clarity, I will speak in two dimensions. 1. Epistemic access. Whether the agent had genuine access to the relevant claim, command, or message in a way that could plausibly ground responsibility. 2. Normative capacity. Whether the agent had the developmental, psychological, social, and volitional capacity to comply, given the agent's actual constraints. These dimensions are closely related but not identical. An agent may be flooded with information, yet lack the background structure needed to evaluate it responsibly. Conversely, an agent may have high capacity but no genuine access. The intuitive birthplace problem, which I call the birthplace lottery, is mostly an epistemic access problem. It highlights that the distribution of religious exposure is contingent on geography, culture, and history. The argument of this chapter is limited and precise. I am not yet claiming that the Fairness Clause forces any particular conclusion about who is finally saved, condemned, or purified. I am establishing a constraint. Once a tradition embeds ignorance, exception, and capacity condition language into its own authoritative materials, the tradition can no longer treat belief state alone as a clean moral sorting mechanism without additional distinctions. 3.2 Christian sources. Differentiated accountability and conscience. In Christian scripture, the idea that judgment tracks knowledge is explicit in several places. A clear statement appears in the parable of the faithful or unfaithful slave, knew what his master wanted, will receive a severe beating, did not know, will receive a light beating. Luke 12:47-48, NRS View 2021. The passage does not reduce responsibility to bare ignorance, as if ignorance automatically exonerated. It instead introduces gradation. Knowledge increases accountability. Lack of knowledge can mitigate. A second line of thought appears in Paul's discussion of Gentiles and the law. In the relevant passage, Paul emphasizes conscience and an internal moral witness even where explicit law is absent. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts. Conscience also bears witness. Romans 2:14-15, NRS View 2021. The immediate theological context is complex. Interpreters dispute how Paul's argument integrates with later doctrinal formulations about justification, grace, and faith. That dispute is not necessary for the structural point. The text itself introduces the idea that explicit exposure to covenantal law is not the only morally relevant variable. Moral responsibility can be tracked through what a person knows by conscience, even absent formal instruction. If these texts are taken seriously, the simplest belief gate framing already becomes unstable. A person's relationship to a message is not exhausted by whether the message was audible, printed, or preached. It includes whether the person could plausibly understand it, whether the person could plausibly evaluate it, and whether the person's nonconformity is willful or constrained. At this stage, it is important to distinguish two claims that are often conflated. The Fairness Clause, ignorance exceptions across religions. A tradition can insist that faith matters, worship matters, and confession matters. The same tradition can still concede that culpability varies with access and ability, and that some people may be excused from what they could not reasonably grasp or perform. The Fairness Clause does not deny that a tradition has a preferred path. It pressures the tradition to clarify how judgment relates to epistemic and developmental contingencies. 3.3 Catholic Doctrine. Rants and infants invincible, ignore. Catholic teaching provides a particularly explicit articulation of the Fairness Clause in doctrinal form. The Triple C states that the maxim outside the Church, there is no salvation, is not aimed at those who lack knowledge through no fault of their own. The relevant paragraph reads, through no fault of their own, do not know the gospel of Christ, seek God with a sincere heart, may achieve eternal salvation. Triple C, section 847. Catholic Church, 1997. This is not a marginal footnote. It is a direct doctrinal concession. It formalizes an ignorance exception and links it to conscience, sincerity, and available light. The paragraph does not collapse into a crude universalism. It still distinguishes between knowing refusal and non-culpable ignorance. But it plainly rejects the idea that mere lack of explicit Christian exposure automatically implies culpable rejection. A second locus for the Fairness Clause concerns infants and children who die without baptism. Here, Catholic teaching is cautious rather than declarative, but the structure is again unambiguous. The Triple C states, the Church can only entrust them to the mercy of God. Triple C, section 1261. Catholic Church, 1997. This is the moral pressure point in doctrinal form. If divine judgment is just, then there must be a principled way to address cases in which the ordinary mechanism of explicit confession, sacramental participation, or conscious assent is unavailable. The Catholic tradition does not claim to know the full mechanism, but it makes the fairness concession explicit. These two doctrinal elements are important for the book's larger arc. They show that even within a highly institutional form of Christianity, there is an internal acknowledgement of epistemic luck and developmental limitation. The tradition is already, by its own lights, committed to a moral structure in which epistemic access and normative capacity matter. 3.4 Islamic sources, messenger condition and capacity limits. Islamic scripture also contains explicit language that functions as an ignorance exception and a capacity condition. A widely cited fairness statement appears in a verse that connects punishment to prophetic proclamation. Nor do we punish until we have sent a messenger. Quran 17:15. Abdel Halim, 2004. Another widely cited statement links obligation and burden to capacity. God does not burden any soul with more than it can bear. Quran 2:28-6. Abdel Halim, 2004. As with the Christian sources, there is a large interpretive literature about how these principles interact with divine omniscience, predestination debates, moral accountability, and the role of fitra, or natural disposition. I will not front-load that entire debate here. The structural point is again sufficient. Islam contains, in its own scripture, language that conditions judgment on message delivery and capacity. In other words, the moral structure of accountability is not merely belief. Full stop. It is belief and response under conditions, where the conditions include whether the message truly arrived, and whether the agent could bear what is asked. 3.5% a Protestant boundary marker, the age of accountability. One reason the Fairness Clause matters is that it pushes traditions to specify boundary conditions. A particularly clear example appears in a widely used Southern Baptist confession, the Baptist Faith and Message, 2000. In the section on humanity and sin, it states, as soon as they are capable of moral action, they become transgressors. Baptist Faith and Message, 2000, Southern Baptist Convention, 2003. This is an explicit age of accountability claim. It asserts a developmental threshold below which condemnation is not assigned in the same way, because the capacity for moral action has not yet matured. The existence of such formulations does not settle debates within Christianity. Other traditions emphasize original sin, baptismal regeneration, covenant membership, or different models of culpability in children. The point is again structural. These debates are not accidental. They arise because a tradition that takes judgment seriously is forced to wrestle with the relationship between culpability and capacity. This is exactly what the Fairness Clause captures. Even when the details differ, the same moral constraint presses on the system. Blame and punishment must track what an agent could meaningfully know and could meaningfully do. 3.6 What the Fairness Clause accomplishes and what it does not. At this point, the function of the chapter can be stated without overreach, what it accomplishes. The Fairness Clause shows that a binary framing such as believer versus non-believer cannot be treated as a complete moral partition in any tradition that embeds ignorance exception and capacity condition language into its authoritative materials. Once access and capacity are recognized as morally relevant, the tradition must answer questions like these. What counts as hearing the message in the morally relevant sense? What counts as a genuine opportunity to understand? What counts as resistance versus inability? What counts as culpable rejection versus non-culpable non-assent? The birthplace lottery makes the pressure obvious, but it is only the first step. Even within a single culture, access and capacity vary drastically. Exposure can be thin, distorted, coercive, traumatic, or socially compulsory. Capacity can be compromised by development, disability, fear, indoctrination, or informational overload. None of those conditions are exotic edge cases. They're part of ordinary human life. What it does not accomplish. This chapter does not conclude that everyone is saved or that belief never matters. Those are separate theses, and they require separate arguments. What this chapter does establish is that many traditions themselves encode a fairness structure that prevents the simplest version of the salvation gate from being stable. It forces additional distinctions. It demands a non-trivial theory of responsibility. That demand sets up the next chapter. Chapter 4 moves from epistemic access to belief formation. The central question becomes, even when access exists in some minimal sense, does a person have control over whether the information clicks as true? If belief is not directly voluntary, then the fairness concession expands beyond the unreached and the infant. It extends into the ordinary case of the reached but unconvinced. That is the salvation paradox. A tradition affirms that disbelief is blameworthy, while also affirming excusing conditions that increasingly cover the causal and cognitive landscape that produces disbelief. 3.7 Formal derivation of the fairness clause. 3.7.1 Dependencies. This chapter's formal results presuppose the interface results of Chapter 2 specifically. A. Definition 2.1, Human Interface Thesis, and B. Definition 2.2, Revelation Filter, as background for why epistemic access to any putative public revelation is historically and socially contingent, rather than uniformly distributed. The responsibility constraints also draw on the broad moral principle often summarized as ought implies can, Zolter, 2026 grams, 3.7.2 supporting definitions. Definition 3.1, epistemic access, let A be an agent, and let phi be a putative normative requirement, a command prohibition, creed requirement, ritual requirement, or moral requirement. Agent A has epistemic access to phi if A has access to the relevant content in a form it could realistically encounter and understand such that ignorance of phi is not reasonably excusing. Definition 3.2, normative capacity. Agent A has normative capacity for requirement phi if A has sufficient ability, opportunity, and psychological competence to comply with phi in the relevant circumstances. Definition 3.3, moral culpability. Agent A is moral culpability bearing for failing to satisfy requirement phi if A, phi is a genuine normative requirement within the relevant system, B, A fails to comply with phi, and C, the failure is properly attributable to A in the sense required for blame, punishment, or condemnation within that system. Definition 3.4, access condition. A normative system satisfies the access condition if for any agent A and requirement phi. Lack of epistemic access to phi defeats or significantly reduces moral culpability for non-compliance with phi. Definition 3.5, capacity condition. A normative system satisfies the capacity condition if for any agent A and requirement phi. Lack of normative capacity defeats or significantly reduces moral culpability for non-compliance with phi. Definition 3.6, ignorance exception. An ignorance exception is a clause, rule, or principle within a normative system that reduces or removes moral culpability when the relevant ignorance is not the agent's fault, or when epistemic access is realistically absent. Definition 3.7, fairness clause. A moral or religious system contains a fairness clause if it affirms that just evaluation of agents is constrained by both A, the access condition, and B, the capacity condition. Definition 3.8, birthplace lottery. The birthplace lottery is the structural fact that access to religious messages, institutions, languages, and interpretive frameworks is contingently distributed across geography, history, and social environment. Definition 3.9, exposure-gated soteriological criterion. A soteriological criterion is exposure-gated IFF possession of, encounter with, or placement under a particular message, institution, or confession is treated as a necessary condition for salvation, or avoidance of condemnation, irrespective of whether such exposure was available to the agent. 3.7, lemmas. Lemma 3.10, responsibility requires access. Let a normative system S be such that blame or punishment in S is intended to track moral culpability rather than arbitrary power. Then S must satisfy the access condition. Proof. Fix an agent A and a requirement phi. Suppose A lacks epistemic access to phi in the sense of definition 3.1. If S nevertheless assigns full moral culpability to A for failure to satisfy phi, then S treats A as blameworthy for non-compliance with a requirement that it could not realistically have known in the relevant sense. That assignment does not function as culpability tracking evaluation. It functions as imposition detached from fault, since the non-compliance is not attributable to the agent by the agent's own epistemic situation. Therefore, if S is to preserve the intended distinction between culpability and caprice, it must incorporate an access constraint. This is one instance of the broader family of principles, often discussed under ought implies can. Lemma 3.1 TAS 1, responsibility requires capacity. Let a normative system S be such that blame or punishment in S is intended to track moral culpability rather than arbitrary power. Then S must satisfy the capacity condition. Proof. Fix an agent A and a requirement phi. Suppose A lacks normative capacity for phi in the sense of definition 3.2. If S nevertheless assigns full moral culpability to A for failure to satisfy phi, then S assigns blame for a failure that was not within the agent's realistic ability and opportunity to avoid. Under the intended reading of punishment as tied to fault, this collapses the distinction between fault and mere misfortune. Therefore, if S is to preserve culpability as an attribution sensitive to agency rather than luck, it must incorporate a capacity constraint. Again, this is a standard moral principle, discussed in both classical and contemporary work on responsibility. Zolter. 2026 grams, Aristotle 99 Rosen 2 Ignorance Exception Schema. Let S be a system that affirms differential accountability by knowledge or understanding, meaning that holding other factors fixed. Increased knowledge increases culpability or punishment. Then S is committed to an ignorance exception, at least in the minimal sense that ignorance can reduce culpability relative to informed refusal. Proof. Assume S includes a monotonicity principle for knowledge, for agents A and B who are alike with respect to the relevant action and its object. If A has greater epistemic access than B, then A is at least as culpable as B, and possibly more so. By this principle, ignorance is not morally inert. Lower access yields lower culpability, at least in comparative cases. The recognition of comparative reduction is exactly an ignorance exception schema, whether the system frames it as mercy, excuse, diminished responsibility, or differential judgment. 3.7.4 Core Theorem and Empirical Anchor. Theorem 3.13, the Fairness Clause Theorem, let S be a religious or moral system that I assigns punishment, condemnation, or negative judgment on the basis of non-compliance, and 2, aims to treat this judgment as just rather than as sheer imposition. Then S must contain a fairness clause in the sense of definition 3, or else S abandons its own justice constraint. Moreover, many major traditions explicitly encode one or both components of this clause within authoritative sources. Proof. The first claim follows immediately from Lemma 3.10 and Lemma 3.11. If culpability tracking evaluation is intended, then access and capacity constraints are required. Therefore, the conjunction of the access condition and the capacity condition is required. That conjunction is the fairness clause. For the second claim, it is enough to observe that major traditions explicitly state access and capacity-sensitive evaluation principles in canonical or doctrinal sources. Representative anchors include A. Luke 12, 47-48, NRS View 2021, Knowledge-Dependent Accountability, B. Romans 2, 14-15, NRS View 2021, Moral Evaluation Beyond Explicit Textual Law via Conscience, C. CCC, Section 847, Catholic Church 1997, No-Fault Ignorance treated as morally relevant, D. CCC, Section 1261, Catholic Church 1997, Infant case handled via mercy rather than certain condemnation, E. Quran 1715, Abdel Halim 2004, No punishment until a messenger, F. 28.6. Abdel Halim 2000 and Faith and Message 2000. Capacity-based moral accountability for children. They establish that access and capacity constraints are recognized internally. Why exposure-gated soteriology? Why exposure-gated soteriology? 3.13. Then any purely exposure-gated soteriological criterion is exceptions that defeat its rote gate by assigning condemnation under conditions of absent access. Proof. Assume S contains a fairness clause. Let C be an exposure-gated soteriological criterion, definition 3-9%. Consider an agent or two lacks the relevant exposure due to the birthplace lottery, definition 3.8, and therefore lacks epistemic access to the content required by C. If S condemns us solely because it lacks the exposure required by C, then S assigns condemnation under absent access, violating the access condition component of the fairness clause. If instead S exempts her from condemnation due to absent access, then C no longer functions as a strict gate for all agents. It becomes a conditional rule whose scope is restricted by access exceptions. Either way, a purely exposure-gated criterion cannot remain both universal in scope and consistent with fairness constraints. Remark 3.15, bridge to Chapter 4. The corollary concerns exposure and access, not belief formation. Chapter 4 strengthens the pressure by separating epistemic access to a message from an agent's ability to form the required belief, which introduces doxastic involuntarism and the next stage of the salvation paradox. Chapter 4. The salvation paradox: if ignorance excuses, then so must non-belief. 3. Isolated the fairness clause. Across major traditions, the same moral constraint appears in text, doctrine, or ordinary practice. Responsibility tracks epistemic access and normative capacity. A person cannot be blamed, in the relevant ultimate sense, for what was never accessible, never intelligible, or never psychologically and cognitively possible under the actual conditions of life. This chapter pushes one step further, but it is a step many systems avoid taking explicitly. Once access and capacity constrain culpability, the moral status of belief itself becomes unavoidable. Many soteriological systems treat assent to a doctrinal package as the decisive gate of ultimate outcome. If the fairness clause is granted, that move inherits a pressure that is not solved by louder preaching or sharper apologetics. The pressure is structural. It lives in the interface between moral judgment and the psychology of belief. I will call this pressure point the salvation paradox. It is not a claim that religious communities are irrational. It is a claim about what follows once a tradition insists at the same time on I, fault-sensitive justice, and 2, a belief-gated criterion with maximal stakes. Under maximal intelligence, those two commitments do not remain stable together without revision. This chapter isolates the revision points. 4.1 Soteriology and the belief gate. Religions that speak in the language of salvation, condemnation, liberation, or final judgment implicitly specify a sorting rule. In the philosophical and theological literature, this domain is called soteriology. The present project does not require any one tradition's detailed mechanics. It requires only the structural role there exists, explicitly or implicitly, a criterion by which persons are assigned to ultimate outcomes. A second term is needed because the criterion is doing the work. A soteriological criterion is any condition treated as necessary, sufficient, or decisively weighty for ultimate assignment within a soteriology. Examples include assent to certain propositions, membership in a community, sacramental status, right practice, right orientation of will, or some hybrid of these. When eternal, irreversible, or maximally significant consequences are attached to the criterion, the justification burden increases accordingly. A criterion that might look intelligible at low stakes can become morally unintelligible at maximal stakes. To keep the chapter concrete, consider a familiar Christian formulation of a belief gate. One common rendering of John is explicit about belief functioning as a dividing line. Those who believe in him are not condemned, but those who do not believe are condemned already. John 3:18, NRS View 2021. I am not building a case on one verse or one tradition. The point is structural. A large class of soteriologies rely on some version of the belief gate, whether the gate is expressed as faith, acceptance, submission, or right view. Once that is the mechanism, the Fairness Clause immediately raises a question. What, exactly, is the moral status of belief formation? 4.2 The missing step, from access to belief. A fairness principle is easy to state at the level of information access. It is harder to carry that principle through to belief formation. Many popular presentations treat belief as if it were a direct act of will, as if belief were chosen like raising a hand. That picture makes the belief gate look straightforward. A message was presented, a choice was offered, assent or refusal followed. Chapter 3 already undermines that simplicity in two ways. First, access is not mere exposure. A message can be heard and still be epistemically inaccessible if it is presented in a form the agent cannot realistically comprehend, evaluate, or integrate. Access is capacity sensitive by construction. The Fairness Clause only does moral work if access means more than physical proximity to words. Second, capacity is not merely physical. Normative capacity includes psychological constraints, developmental constraints, cognitive constraints, and situational constraints. Many traditions already admit this when they introduce mercy clauses for infants, children, the unreached, and those without the relevant law or messenger. Those clauses are not decorative. They are attempts to preserve the claim that ultimate judgment is not mere power. It is, in some intelligible sense, just. Once these points are admitted, belief can no longer be treated as an isolated switch. Belief is the output of an interface pipeline: evidence, interpretation, effect, trust, social pressure, credibility norms, and cognitive architecture. This is not the salvation paradox. If ignorance excuses, then so must non-belief. Thesis against religion. It is a thesis about minds. Any theory that proposes to judge minds must, at minimum, respect the structure of minds. 4.3 Belief is not a direct voluntary switch. The epistemology literature discusses voluntary control of belief under the heading of doxastic voluntarism. Zolter. 2026d. The core question is simple. Can an agent directly choose what to believe, in the way one chooses an action? The term doxastic involuntarism names the opposing thesis. Belief is not in general directly voluntary. Zolter. 2026d. A minimal observation motivates the involuntarist direction. It is possible to decide to say a proposition. It is possible to decide to act as if a proposition were true. In the ordinary case, it is not possible to decide to find a proposition credible when it does not appear credible, or to find it incredible when it appears credible. This is not a metaphysical mystery. It is part of what belief is, a world-modeling state responsive to what seems true to the agent given the agent's evidence and cognitive condition. Zolter. 2026d. The present project does not require a maximal thesis. It is not necessary to claim that no belief is ever voluntary in any sense. A sharper and more defensible claim suffices. There exist many cases of sincere non-belief where the agent's non-belief is not culpable in the way required to justify maximal punishment. That modest claim is enough to stress any soteriology that treats non-belief as a universal blame trigger. 4.3.1 Direct voluntarism and the at-will test. A practical sanity check is the at-will test. If belief were directly voluntary in the relevant sense, an agent should be able to form a belief at will in cases where the agent recognizes that the evidence does not support it. In practice, the attempt typically yields one of two outcomes. Either I, the belief does not form, and the agent remains at the level of imagination or pretense, or two, some change in perceived evidence occurs, in which case the belief is not produced by bare will but by altered cognition. This is one reason many philosophers treat strong direct voluntarism as highly restricted. Zolter. 2026d. The upshot for the belief gate is immediate. If belief is typically not a direct will switch, then a belief-gated soteriology cannot assume that non-belief is, by default, a culpable refusal. 4.3.2 Indirect influence does not restore a clean gate. A common reply appeals to indirect control. Even if belief is not directly willed, an agent can influence belief by choosing what evidence to seek, what communities to join, what authorities to trust, and what habits to cultivate. There is truth in this. People shape their epistemic environments. The difficulty is that indirect influence does not restore the clean binary required by belief-gated salvation. Indirect influence is itself distributed by the birthplace lottery and by contingent psychological and social conditions. Some agents are raised in environments where inquiry is encouraged, dissent is tolerated, and cross-worldview contact is normal. Others are raised in environments where inquiry is punished, fear is attached to doubt, and information sources are systematically controlled. Even in environments that value inquiry, individuals differ in cognitive style, trauma histories, trust baselines, and vulnerability to authority pressure. At most, an indirect influence story yields a graded and highly contingent responsibility profile. That is precisely what the Fairness Clause implies. It does not yield a flat global rule that converts non-belief into culpable rebellion by default. 4.3.3 Doxastic luck and moral luck. Once belief formation is treated as pipeline output, the role of doxastic luck becomes visible. An agent's doxastic state is affected by facts the agent did not choose: birthplace, language, education access, parental religion, peer group, local threat architecture, and the credibility environment in which certain claims are treated as default. Pew Research Center 2015a. Pew Research Center 2015 billions. This structure is a special case of a broader phenomenon discussed in moral philosophy as moral luck. Nagel. 1979, Williams 1981. The relevance here is not that religion reduces to sociology. The relevance is that responsibility cannot be assessed as if agents were created in a vacuum, with equal epistemic starting points and equal cognitive resources. If a tradition admits this point by carving out ignorance and capacity exceptions, then it has already conceded the governing principle. The only remaining question is whether the principle is applied consistently at the belief layer. 4.4 Empirical, pressure, social inheritance, and switching patterns. The birthplace lottery is not merely a rhetorical phrase. It names a structural fact. Access to religious frameworks is contingently distributed by history and geography. The same contingency holds for belief formation within those frameworks. Large-scale social research consistently finds that childhood religious environment is a major predictor of adult religious affiliation and belief. Pew Research Center 2015A. Pew Research Center 2015 Billions. Religious identity is also relatively sticky, even where religious switching occurs. Switching happens, but it is patterned. It depends on social networks, marriage, education, and cultural context. Pew Research Center 2015A. Pew Research Center 2015 Billions. This is exactly what one would expect if belief formation were not a direct will switch, but a function of cumulative informational and social pipelines. This chapter does not require precise percentages. The salvation paradox requires the smaller and highly defensible claim that belief is significantly influenced by causal factors that vary across persons in ways not fully under their control. That claim is enough to connect the fairness clause to any belief-gated soteriological criterion. 4.5% the equivalence class, unreached and unconvinced. The central move of this chapter is an equivalence claim. Many traditions say in some form that a person is not condemned for failing to believe a message the person never had a fair chance to receive. Chapter 3 documented explicit versions of that claim across traditions and formalized it as the fairness clause. Now consider a second case. A person is exposed to the message, but due to no-fault determinants, cannot form the relevant belief. Determinants may include distorted presentation, credible counter-evidence, trauma-associated distrust of the messenger, cognitive constraints, or the absence of any compelling justification that would make assent rational for that agent. The person does not refuse to believe as an act of spite. The person simply does not find the claim credible. If belief is not directly voluntary in the relevant sense, then the moral status of this second case cannot be reduced to a culpable refusal by default. Structurally, it is another instance of access and capacity constraints. It is not identical to being unreached, but it is morally analogous in precisely the dimension the fairness clause tracks, fault-sensitive responsibility. This is the reason the stability of the intuition matters. Born unreached and reached, but unconvinced due to the salvation paradox. If ignorance excuses, then so must non-belief. Fault determinants live in the same moral neighborhood once the fairness clause is granted. That neighborhood is the set of non-culpable non-belief cases. A compact way to say it is this. If ignorance can be excusing because it is not chosen, then non-belief can be excusing for the same reason when non-belief is the predictable output of a constrained epistemic pipeline. 4.6 The paradox stated as a three-way constraint. At this point, the tension can be stated without rhetoric. Under the fairness clause, ultimate judgment must track fault-sensitive responsibility. Under minimal doxastic realism, belief is not a universal will switch, and there exist cases of non-culpable non-belief. Zalta. 2026d. If a tradition nonetheless insists on a belief-gated soteriological criterion with maximal stakes, it faces a forced choice. In the formal layer, I record this as Theorem 4.7, Salvation Paradox. In prose, the content is, widen the excusing class. Treat a wide class of non-believers as excused or eligible for the same ultimate outcome as believers. This preserves fault-sensitive justice, but weakens the belief, gate into something closer to a pastoral boundary than an ultimate sorting device. Deepen the criterion. Redefine the decisive condition into a category that is not bare assent, such as sincerity, orientation of will, conscience tracking, or responsiveness to accessible moral reality. This preserves maximal stakes while shifting the gate away from propositional belief. 2. Abandon the fairness constraint. Reject, hollow out, or bracket the fairness clause so that ultimate outcomes may be assigned in ways not constrained by recognizable. Fault-sensitive responsibility. This can preserve a strict gate, but it does so by conceding arbitrariness at the moral level. The salvation paradox is precisely that all three options represent a substantive revision relative to the popular simple story of belief as a clean gate under a just judge. 4.7 Steelman replies, and where they converge. The point of the salvation paradox is not to caricature believers. Many sophisticated theologians and reflective practitioners already sense the instability and try to resolve it. The chapter is compatible with charitable readings. It simply tracks what each charitable move commits one to. 4.7.1 Reply. God judges the heart. This is a common reply, and it is often morally serious. It is also a concession in the direction this book predicts. If ultimate evaluation turns on the heart, then the decisive criterion is no longer bare assent to a doctrinal proposition. The biblical tradition itself contains explicit language in this direction. For example, the Lord looks on the heart, 1 Samuel 16:7, 4:21. A second theme in Paul. A compact excerpt is they show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, Romans 2:15, NRS View 2021. The salvation paradox, if ignorance excuses, then so must non-belief. The exact theology can be debated, but the logical point is clear. If judgment of the heart is the stabilizing principle, then the strict belief gate is already softened into option 2. The decisive category shifts toward conscience, sincerity, and moral responsiveness. 4.7.2 reply. Nonbelief is always culpable. A harder reply insists that all nonbelief is blameworthy. Sometimes this is framed as suppression of known truth. Sometimes it is framed as willful refusal to submit. This reply attempts to preserve belief as a gate by denying that there exist non-culpable cases. The scriptural hook for this reply is often Romans 1. A standard excerpt reads, "Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath shewed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." Romans 1:19-20, NRS View 2021. The difficulty is not that such texts exist. The difficulty is that the reply collides with the exceptions traditions already accept and with the mind realism already baked into their mercy clauses. If infants, the unreached, and the no-fault ignorant exist as excused categories, then non-belief cannot be universally culpable. The reply can be restricted to those deemed reached, but then the argument must establish not merely that the message was heard, but that epistemic access was fair and capacity was adequate, and that the resulting non-belief is fault-sensitive rather than pipeline-determined. That is a demanding claim. It may be true in some cases. It cannot function as a universal default without collapsing back into arbitrariness. 4.7.3 reply. Faith is a gift. Another reply moves in a different direction. If faith is granted rather than chosen, then belief is not the object of praise or blame in the ordinary sense. One common textual anchor is Ephesians 2. A compact excerpt reads, "By grace you have been saved through faith. It is the gift of God." Ephesians 2:8, NRS View 2021. This reply can be coherent, but it changes the moral picture. The soteriological mechanism becomes more like allocation than like fault-sensitive judgment. Unless the reply also gives up the claim that allocation is constrained by responsibility in the way the fairness clause suggests, it drifts toward option 2. If the allocation remains constrained by responsibility, then the belief gate is again softened into something deeper than assent. 4.7.4 reply. Appeal to mystery. A final reply denies that human moral categories should constrain divine judgment. This is the appeal to mystery maneuver, sometimes stabilized by an ineffability shield. It is always available as a philosophical maneuver. As a moral defense, it changes the claim being made. A common biblical hook is Isaiah 55. "My thoughts are not your thoughts." Isaiah 55:8. NRS View 2021. The move may protect a system from refutation by moral reasoning, but it also disconnects the system from the motivation for the fairness clause. Instead of divine judgment is just in a way intelligible to moral reason, the claim becomes divine judgment may be just by standards humans cannot. The salvation paradox. If ignorance excuses, then so must non-belief. Access. That can be asserted, but it no longer supports a stable moral intelligibility story for the belief gate. 4.8. What this chapter secures for the disassembly. This chapter has a narrow goal. It is not to declare what the correct soteriology is. It is to show that once a tradition admits its own fairness constraints, and once belief formation is treated with minimal psychological and epistemological realism, belief alone cannot remain a clean ultimate sorting device. The upshot is a convergence. Under maximal intelligence, belief-gated salvation systems drift toward one of two endpoints. Either they accept arbitrariness in a way that is difficult to reconcile with moral reason, or they reinterpret salvation into a deeper category that looks increasingly like conscience, sincerity, and responsiveness to what is real and available. This also sets up a bridge to the primacy test. If the decisive category is not bare assent to a text, then the operative authority becomes the agent's conscience tracking what is available in reality, not a mere compliance relation to a doctrinal list. That is exactly the shift the primacy test measures in practice. The next chapter tightens the consequence. When the belief gate weakens and the decisive criterion deepens, doctrinal difference begins to look less like territory and more like translation layer. At that point, the book moves from dismantling specific gates to modeling why traditions contradict in detail while converging in structural roles. 4.9 Post-formal derivation of the salvation paradox. Remark 4.1 Dependencies. This chapter depends on the fairness clause as defined in Theorem 3.7 and anchored by the cross-tradition commitment in Chapter 3. It also uses the birthplace lottery definition, Theorem 3.8, and the interface constraint from Chapter 2. 4.9.1 Definitions. Definition 4.2 Soteriology. Soteriology is the normative architecture by which a tradition specifies I. What counts as ultimate failure or ultimate fulfillment for persons, and 2. Which conditions are treated as assignment relevant for those outcomes. Definition 4.3 Soteriological criterion. A soteriological criterion is any condition treated as necessary, sufficient, or decisively weighty for ultimate assignment within a soteriology. Examples include assent to propositions, community membership, sacramental status, right practice, right orientation of will, or a hybrid. Definition 4.4 Belief gate. A soteriological criterion is belief gate if satisfaction of the criterion requires a doxastic condition of the form. The agent believes or assents to at least one specified proposition or set of propositions. Equivalently, failure of belief is treated as sufficient or near sufficient for ultimate exclusion in a wide class of cases. Definition 4.5 Doxastic voluntarism and doxastic involuntarism. Doxastic voluntarism is the thesis that an agent can, by a direct act of will, form or abandon beliefs at will in a wide class of cases. Doxastic involuntarism is the thesis that, the salvation paradox, if ignorance excuses, then so must non-belief. Belief is typically responsive to what seems true to the agent, given the agent's evidence and cognitive state, and is therefore not directly controllable by mere decision in a wide class of cases. Zolter, 2026d. Definition 4.6. Doxastic luck. Doxastic luck is the influence on an agent's doxastic state of factors not fully under the agent's rational control, including, non-exhaustively, social inheritance, education access, linguistic environment, credibility environment, trauma history, and local information constraints. Pew Research Center, 2015a. Pew Research Center, 2015 billions. Definition 4.7. Non-culpable non-belief. Non-belief in a proposition P, such that the agent's failure to believe P is not reasonably attributable to culpable refusal, negligence, or fault of will, given the agent's epistemic access and normative capacity constraints. Zalter, 2026d 4.9.2 lemmas. Lemma 4.8. At-will test. There exist propositions P and epistemic states S such that if an agent A is in S and P does not appear credible to A in S, then it cannot form belief in P by a direct act of will while remaining in S. Proof sketch. A direct act of will can produce verbal assent or behavioral pretense. It does not, in general, produce the doxastic state of taking P to be true while the agent's evidential assessment and seeming remain unchanged. This distinction between belief and voluntary performance is a standard motivation for restricting strong direct doxastic voluntarism. Zolter, 2026d. Let P be a doctrinal proposition. If P does not in general entail that an agent believes P, in particular, there exist agents as such that A is exposed to P, under conditions counted as accessed by T, yet A does not believe P, and this non-belief may be non-culpable non-belief. Proof sketch. Exposure to a proposition is compatible with diverse evidential situations, interpretive frames, trust baselines, and cognitive constraints. By theorem, thought universally producible by direct decision once the proposition fails to appear credible to the agent. Therefore, access, even when sincere and repeated, does not logically guarantee belief. Where the failure is not attributable to culpable refusal or negligence, it is an instance of non-culpable non-belief. Theorem 4.7, Zolter, 2026d, lemma 4.10, moral luck transfer. Let T in is belief gate. If an agent's satisfaction of the criterion depends on doxastic states significantly affected by doxastic luck, then ultimate outcomes in T become sensitive to factors beyond the agent's control, and thus inherit a form of moral luck. Nagel, 1979, Williams 1981, Zolter 2026 degrees Fahrenheit. Proof. If ultimate outcome is a function of belief or assent, and belief is partly a function of factors not fully under the agent's rational control, theorem 4.6, then ultimate outcome is partly a function of those factors. That is precisely the structural condition moral luck analyses track. Outcome-relevant evaluation depends on contingency outside the agent's control. Nagel, 1979, Williams 1981, 4.9.3 main theorem. Theorem 4.11, salvation paradox, let T a tradition with a soteriology. Theorem 4.2, that assigns ultimate outcomes using a belief gate soteriological criterion. Theorem 4.4. Assume, A, fairness clause, T affirms that just condemnation is constrained by epistemic access and normative capacity, such that no-fault ignorance and no-fault incapacity can excuse failure to satisfy the criterion. Theorem 3.7, B, doxastic constraint. Doxastic involuntarism holds in the modest sense, secured by theorems 4.8 and 4.8 and 4 time. 2026, D. Then T must adopt at least one of the following revisions. I. Excusal expansion. Treat a wide class of non-believers, including some reached but unconvinced cases, as excused or eligible for the same ultimate outcome as believers, thereby weakening belief as a decisive gate. Criterion deepening. Reinterpret the soteriological criterion so that ultimate evaluation turns on fault-sensitive properties other than bare assent, such as conscience tracking, sincerity, moral responsiveness to what is available, or orientation of will. Fairness rejection. Reject, hollow out, or subordinate the fairness clause, thereby accepting that ultimate outcomes can be assigned without fault-sensitive responsibility constraints. In particular, T cannot consistently maintain both the fairness clause and the universal thesis, that non-belief alone is sufficient for maximal condemnation in all reached cases. Proof. By the fairness clause, T treats no-fault access and capacity constraints as excusing conditions for moral evaluation. Theorem 3.7. By Theorem 4.9 and Theorem 4.7, there exist agents who fail to satisfy a belief requirement without culpable refusal or negligence in the relevant sense. If T nonetheless treats non-belief as universally sufficient for maximal condemnation, then T assigns maximal condemnation in at least some no-fault failure cases, contrary to the fairness clause. Therefore, T must either I. Exempt such cases, weakening the belief gate, 2. Redefine the criterion into a deeper fault, sensitive evaluant not identical to assent, or 2. Abandon the fairness constraint. 4.9.4 corollaries. Corollary 4.12, unreached and unconvinced form a fault-sensitive equivalence class. Assume a tradition T affirms the fairness clause. Then the unreached case, no fair epistemic access, and the reached but unconvinced case where non-belief is non-culpable non-belief belong to the same fault-sensitive category with respect to ultimate culpability, even if they differ descriptively. Proof. Both cases are instances of failure to satisfy the belief gate soteriological criterion without the relevant fault of will or negligence, due to access or doxastic constraints. By the fairness clause, culpability does not attach in the relevant sense to no-fault failure. Corollary 4.13, God judges the heart collapses the belief gate unless constrained. If a tradition resolves theorem 4.1% by making ultimate evaluation turn on fault-sensitive properties such as conscience, sincerity, or moral responsiveness, then bare assent to a doctrinal proposition cannot remain the decisive soteriological gate without additional, independently justified constraints. Proof. If evaluation turns on a fault-sensitive property X, not identical to assent, then assent is at most evidential or contributory relative to X, not decisive in itself. Treating assent as decisive would reintroduce the inconsistency diagnosed in theorem 4.1%, unless the additional constraints re-establish fault-sensitive responsibility for assent. Chapter 5. Religions as translation layers. 5.1. Why the diversity problem belongs inside the argument. Religious diversity is not a peripheral problem for the philosophy of religion. It is the default global condition under which any theory of religion must operate. There is no single doctrinal package that appears across cultures as a uniform, culturally invariant deposit. Instead, there is a wide field of traditions, many of which make mutually exclusive claims about ultimacy, salvation or liberation, divine attributes, ritual obligations, and the structure of the afterlife. A responsible account of religion must explain why that is so. The diversity problem also exposes a methodological weakness in the usual public framing, theism versus atheism. If one stays at the level of bare metaphysical assertion, disagreement looks like mere stubbornness. But once one examines the actual data, the conversation quickly becomes historical and sociological. That shift is not a failure of philosophy. It is a cue. The question has been posed at the wrong level of abstraction. The underlying logic has to be clarified first. Otherwise, the debate oscillates between metaphysical slogans and social explanation. The previous chapters established 3 constraints that make the diversity problem intelligible from within the argument. First, under the human interface thesis, anything a tradition calls revelation arrives as human language, human memory, human institutions, and human interpretation. This is not a dismissal of religion. It is a statement about the only medium through which claims can become available to finite agents. Second, the fairness clause appears within multiple traditions as a moral guardrail. Accountability is tied to access and capacity, not merely to possession of the correct propositions. That posture is not a concession to modernity. It is a logical pressure generated by any attempt to preserve justice under uneven informational distribution. Third, once belief is treated realistically, the familiar soteriology that makes propositional assent the decisive gate to ultimate status becomes unstable. If ignorance can excuse, then non-belief caused by comparable access and capacity constraints can excuse as well. This does not end religion. It changes what religion can plausibly be doing. The present chapter tightens that shift. The core claim is that the most coherent way to understand the global pattern is to treat religions as translation layers. They are maps, not the territory. 5.2 maps, territories, and finite representation. A common mistake is to treat religion as a camera rather than as a map. Cameras interpret, but they aim at a particular kind of fidelity. Maps are explicitly selective. They compress, they highlight, they omit. They are made for navigation. Under constraints, the conceptual point is older than this project. In general semantics, it is captured by the maxim that the map is not the territory. Korzybski. 1933, Across Epistemology and Philosophy of Science. The same structure reappears under different labels. Representation is not identity. Description is not the described. Model is not world. I will use the term map territory gap to name the relevant structural difference between I, finite representations, and 2, reality itself. A representation necessarily omits detail, imposes categories, and encodes priorities. The gap does not imply that representation is useless or deceptive. It implies that representation is partial, interest-relative, and corrigible. Once the map territory gap is taken seriously, interpretive questions become unavoidable. A text is not self-interpreting. A tradition is not a single proposition. A religion is a layered object, narrative, doctrine, ritual, moral practice, institutional authority, and habits of interpretation. The hermeneutic point developed in modern philosophy is that understanding is historically situated, not a direct grasp of meaning without mediation. Gadamer. 2004. This motivates a second term that will do systematic work in the remaining chapters. A translation layer is a culturally stabilized mapping from lived reality into a portable human format, typically including narrative, doctrine, practice, and moral guidance. A translation layer functions as a navigation interface for finite agents. It is not equivalent to the reality it addresses. The operative word is mapping. The claim is not that religions are arbitrary. The claim is that they are structured translations, produced and maintained under finite cognitive constraints and social conditions. This will matter later, because many religious disputes implicitly assume that religious language is either literal description of ultimacy or else mere fiction. The translation layer framing preserves a third option, partial representation with mixed fidelity. 5.3. The translation layer claim. The thesis of this chapter can be stated compactly as a pattern claim. Across cultures and historical periods, major religious systems display a joint structure, I. Doctrinal divergence. Traditions disagree on central descriptive and metaphysical claims, including the nature of ultimacy, the afterlife, the mechanism of salvation or liberation, and the proper structure of worship and practice. 2. Cultural contingency. Adherence is strongly correlated with geography, family, and cultural inheritance, and conversion patterns do not resemble an error-correcting process with a stable convergence target. Pew Research Center 2015a. Pew Research Center 2015 Billions. Existential convergence. Many traditions preserve overlapping existential themes and functional roles, including moral formation, or meaning-making, communal identity, and coping with finitude. Durkheim. 1995. Given the human interface thesis constraint and the map territory gap. The best explanation of this joint pattern is that each tradition functions as a finite translation layer, a narrative and rule structure by which finite minds relate to existential reality. Consequently, no single translation layer is guaranteed to be a complete or error-free representation of that reality. 2 clarifications prevent misinterpretation. First, this claim does not say that diversity automatically disproves truth. Diversity is compatible with more than one meta-picture. It is compatible with a strict exclusivism story in which exactly one system is correct and others are defective. It is also compatible with the translation layer story in which multiple systems are partial mappings of a shared underlying reality with different compressions, different emphasis, and different error profiles. The present project argues that the human interface thesis and map territory gap make the second picture structurally natural, especially once fairness constraints are acknowledged. Second, the translation layer claim does not deny the possibility of truth in religion. It changes what truth must look like. Under the map territory gap, the relevant question is not which map is the territory. The relevant questions are these: what features of reality does a map reliably track? What does it omit or distort? What practical consequences does it have? And by what intersubjective tests can those claims be evaluated? Those are not anti-religious questions. They are what intellectual seriousness looks like once mediation is admitted. 5.4 Standard responses to religious diversity. Philosophy of religion already contains a standard taxonomy for the diversity problem. Zalta. 2026 hours, I use it here as a framing tool, not as a verdict. One response is religious exclusivism. On this view, one religion is uniquely correct in the relevant sense, and ultimate outcome depends on belonging to that tradition or affirming its central claims, with other religions being mistaken in the decisive way. A second response is religious inclusivism. On this view, one religion possesses the full or normative truth, but outsiders may nevertheless be saved or reconciled through that religion's ultimate source, often without explicit membership or explicit assent. This is where mechanisms like invincible ignorance tend to appear. It is also where the fairness clause becomes structurally unavoidable. A third response is religious pluralism. On this view, more than one religion can be a genuine path to salvation, liberation, or ultimate reconciliation. Pluralism is often motivated by the claim that ultimate reality outruns any one doctrinal formulation. John Hick's classical contemporary formulation is an influential example of this posture. Hick. 1989, the translation layer model reinterprets these options in representational terms. Under religious exclusivism, one translation is treated as uniquely privileged. The map territory gap is minimized by emphasizing inerrancy, uniquely authoritative transmission, or direct revelation that is said to preserve doctrinal content without relevant distortion. Under religious inclusivism, the map territory gap is partially acknowledged. The tradition's own moral and epistemic sensibilities force it to admit that ultimate assessment cannot reduce to exposure to a local doctrinal package. Under religious pluralism, the map territory gap is foregrounded. Ultimate reality is taken to exceed any single doctrinal frame, so multiple traditions are treated as legitimate maps oriented toward the same underlying reality. The point here is not that one of these labels must be adopted as an identity. The point is that diversity forces every tradition, implicitly or explicitly, to answer the same representational question. How can a finite community claim access to ultimate reality, and what sort of access is being claimed? This also explains why the fairness clause is not an optional ethical patch. If a tradition insists on the strongest exclusivist posture while also maintaining robust fairness constraints, internal tension accumulates. Either accountability is softened, in a way that approaches inclusivism, or the doctrine of justice becomes difficult to maintain without special pleading. That is one path by which the earlier chapters feed directly into the present one. 5.5 Cultural contingency and the birthplace effect. A central empirical fact about religion is that it is transmitted like language. Most people receive a religious identity in the same way they receive a mother tongue by immersion, modeling, community reinforcement, and early habituation. Large-scale survey work consistently reports strong correlations between adult religious affiliation and childhood environment, family practice, and geographic location. Pew Research Center 2015a. Pew Research Center 2015 Billions. This correlation is not a moral critique. It is a representational constraint. If religious affiliation were primarily the output of a reliable, culturally invariant detection method for ultimate reality, the distribution would look different. There would still be variation because humans err, but one would expect a convergence signature. Independent investigators across contexts would tend toward the same conclusions over time, as happens in domains with robust intersubjective methods. Religions do not exhibit that signature. They exhibit a different signature, stable cultural clustering, combined with non-trivial but limited switching. Pew Research Center 2015a, Pew Research Center 2015 billions, that is exactly what the translation layer model predicts. Translation layers are inherited and sometimes replaced because they function as whole life interfaces. Switching is possible, but it is typically not analogous to correcting an arithmetic mistake. It often involves social ties, identity restructuring, and moral reorientation. This matters for the God question, because it changes the evidential landscape. Inherited affiliation is not evidence against a religion. It is evidence against a certain picture of religion, namely the picture in which religion's main function is to convey a single uniform set of propositions that any rational agent should converge upon irrespective of cultural origin. 5 or 6% why religions contradict but still rhyme. The translation layer claim has two faces. One face is contradiction, the other face is convergence. 5.6.1 contradiction as representational divergence. Religions disagree on claims that cannot all be true simultaneously into peripheral detail. It includes metaphysical claims about ultimacy and eschatology. Consider a small set of examples with example 1. Ultimacy and the unity of God Christian doctrine is historically associated with Trinity language, a triune naming of God that is central in much mainstream Christian confession. A canonical scriptural locus often used in Trinitarian practice is the baptismal formula. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Matthew 2:8-19. Islamic doctrine, by contrast, treats divine unity in a way that rejects triune formulation. A standard Quranic admonition reads, in a common English rendering, do not say. Abdel Halim, 2000 of the only relevant texts, interpretive machinery. The point is simpler. The doctrinal surfaces are not jointly satisfiable if read as literal metaphysical claims in the same sense. Something has to give. Either one surface is privileged, or one or both surfaces are treated as partial, analogical, or context-bound translation. Example 2. Personal continuity and the structure of the self. Many strands of Hindu thought affirm Atman language and identify the deepest self with an ultimate reality. A canonical formula from the Upanishadic tradition is the succinct identification that thou art Upanishads, Chandogya Upanishad 6.8.7, Upanishads 1965. Classical Buddhist teaching, by contrast, is commonly summarized by anatta, not self, the not-self doctrine. A representative refrain in standard translation reads, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself, SN 22/9, Anattalakan Asutta, Pali Canon, 2012, again, interpretive nuance matters. But even under charity, the doctrinal emphases are meaningfully different. One translation layer builds navigation around identification with an ultimate self, or ultimate identity. Another builds navigation around dissolving the grasping for such a self. Example 3. Afterlife mechanics and human finitude. Many Abrahamic frameworks are structured around one earthly life, followed by judgment. A succinct statement, often cited in Christian contexts, reads, it is appointed for mortals to die once, and after that the judgment. Hebrews 9:27, NRS View 2021. Many Indian frameworks, by contrast, are structured around reincarnation and repeated embodiment, with liberation as a different kind of endpoint. A standard verse reads, as a person casts off worn-out garments and puts on new ones, Bhagavad Gita 2.22, Bhagavad Gita 1972. These frameworks generate different pictures of moral development, urgency, and the meaning of practice. They are not merely alternative metaphors for the same underlying mechanics. A common response is to treat such divergence as decisive evidence that religion is simply false. That inference is too fast. Doctrinal divergence is compatible with at least two broad pictures. One says that exactly one system is correct, and the others are defective. The other says that systems are translations of something deeper and partially shared, with different compressions and different error profiles. The human interface thesis and map territory gap make the second picture structurally natural. In practice, even many religious communities behave as if some version of the second picture is partly true. They interpret, contextualize, allegorize, and develop traditions of exegesis. The act of interpretation itself is an admission that surface form is not identical with ultimate content. 5.6.2 Convergence as response to common human conditions. At the same time, religions rhyme because they address common conditions of finite life, suffering, mortality, social conflict, guilt, aspiration, awe, and the need for coordination. The sociological literature has long emphasized religion's role in social cohesion, moral regulation, and meaning production. Durkheim, 1995, Weber, 1978. Religions as translation layers. Convergence is visible not only in abstract function but also in recurrent ethical motifs. For example, a neighbor love imperative appears in Christian teaching. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Mark 12:31, NRS View 2021. A parallel anti-hatred maxim appears in widely cited Buddhist verse. Hatred is never ended by hatred. By love alone is hatred ended. Dhammapada 5, Pali Canon 2012. This does not prove that the metaphysical overlays match. It shows something weaker and more stable. Translation layers that are built to navigate finite life tend to converge on certain moral and existential utilities. Therefore, overlap in moral and existential content cannot by itself certify the literal truth of any one metaphysical overlay. It can, however, motivate a deeper inquiry into the shared ground that makes the overlap intelligible. That deeper inquiry is exactly what L attempts to systematize. 5.7% implications for the God debate. Once religions are treated as translation layers, the common debate posture changes in three ways. First, the change is epistemic. The question which religion is correct cannot be answered merely by asserting scriptural authority, because scriptural authority is itself a feature of a translation layer. To treat it as self-authenticating is to collapse the map territory gap by stipulation. That move is logically available, but it is methodologically symmetric across traditions. It cannot produce intersubjective convergence. Second, the change is moral. The earlier fairness clause already pushes traditions away from salvation by informational accident. The translation layer model explains why that push occurs. If doctrinal packages are inherited and culturally clustered, justice cannot plausibly be tied to the luck of exposure to one local package. Traditions that preserve a robust moral concept of justice tend to develop interpretive strategies that reduce dependence on birthplace and accident. Third, the change is constructive. The translation layer model does not recommend cynicism. It redirects attention to what survives translation, the stable features of lived reality, the intersubjective consequences of action, and the logical constraints on coherent talk about ultimacy. In other words, it redirects the conversation from rivalry between narrative packages to analysis of existential ground and the finite conditions of representation. 5.8 Transition. This chapter has treated religions as maps rather than territory. The next step is to examine what happens inside the most sophisticated versions of theism when the same discipline is applied. When theologians read their own tradition in the strongest and most philosophically defensible way, they often retreat from literal predicates about the ultimate and move toward negative theology. That move is not an embarrassment. It is an implicit concession to the same finite mind constraints that drive this entire project. In the next chapter, I formalize that convergence and show why the smartest reading of God language tends to become apathetic, and why that tendency reinforces, rather than undermines, the translation layer model. 5.9 Formal derivation of the translation layer. 5.9.1 Notation and dependencies. Remark 5.1 Dependencies. This chapter's formal results use the following previously established constraints as dependencies. I. Human interface thesis. Any public religious authority claim is received and evaluated through human cognition, language, institutions, and interpretation. T. Finite mind constraint. All content available to an agent is tokened through an epistemic interface, frame closure. T. Fairness clause, and the associated access and capacity constraints, insofar as they bear on the moral instability of salvation by informational accident. The present formal section does not reprove these dependencies. It uses them as constraints on what can count as a coherent account of global religious diversity. Remark 5.2%. Basic objects. A religious system R is treated here as a structured package consisting of at least A. A set of doctrinal claims, descriptive and metaphysical. B. Practices and rituals. C. Norms and moral guidance. D. Institutional transmission mechanisms. E. Interpretive habits, hermeneutic rules. Let RE denote a family of historically significant religious systems across cultures and periods. 5.9.2 Definitions. Definition 5.3 Map territory gap. The map territory gap is the structural difference between I, a finite representation of reality produced and used by finite agents, and 2, reality itself. A representation necessarily omits detail, imposes categories, compresses structure, and encodes priorities. The gap does not entail that representation is deceptive. It entails that representation is partial, interest-relative, and corrigible. Korzybski, 1933, Definition 5.4 Translation layer. A translation layer is a culturally stabilized mapping from lived reality into a portable human format. Formally, a translation layer for a community can be modeled as a mapping. Tau, L, A, where L is a domain of lived, tokenable experience for finite agents, and A is a domain of transmissible artifacts, texts, practices, institutions, interpretive rules. A translation layer functions as a navigation interface for finite agents. It is not identical to the reality it addresses. Gadamer. 2004, Definition 5.5 Doctrinal divergence. A family Ri exhibits doctrinal divergence if there exist central propositions phi, sasi, such that A, Ri is committed to phi in its literal doctrinal form. B, Rj is committed to phi, or to a proposition inconsistent with phi, C. The conflict is not merely peripheral, but bears on the system's account of ultimacy, salvation or liberation, the afterlife, or normative authority. Definition 5.6 Cultural contingency. A family Ri exhibits cultural contingency if affiliation is statistically associated with cultural variables such as geography, family inheritance, and childhood environment, in the sense that for some partition of populations into cultural contexts, G, the conditional probabilities P, Ri, or G, vary substantially across G. Pew Research Center 2015A. Pew Research Center 2015B. Definition 5.7 Existential convergence. A family Ri exhibits existential convergence if, despite doctrinal divergence, there exists a stable overlap in functional roles or existential motifs. One way to model this is to assign to each Ri a set F, Ri, of recurrent functions, for example, moral formation, communal cohesion, meaning-making, coping with mortality and suffering, and require that F, Ri, equal to I, for a non-trivial class of such functions. Durkheim, 1995, Weber, 1978, 5.9.3 Lemmas. Lemma, live-place, birthplace effect. In particular, for many large populations, affiliation is strongly associated with geography and childhood environment, so that cultural contingency holds for Ri at the level of broad religious identity. Pew Research Center 2015A. Pew Research Center 2015 Billions. Proof. This lemma is empirical. Large-scale survey work reports stable correlations between childhood environment, region, and adult religious affiliation, and switching patterns. Pew Research Center 2015A. Pew Research Center 2015 Billions. Lemma 5.9, Divergence from Local Constraints. Assume the human interface thesis and the map territory gap. If two communities, C1 and C2, form religious systems as publicly transmissible artifacts, texts, practices, institutions, under different linguistic, social, and historical constraints, then the resulting systems are expected to exhibit doctrinal divergence. At least at the level of surface formulation, and often at the level of central metaphysical claims. Proof. By the human interface thesis, public religious authority claims are instantiated as human-accessible artifacts. Artifacts are produced and stabilized through finite languages, local categories, institutional incentives, and interpretive norms. By the map territory gap, any such artifact is a compression of lived reality, not an identity with it. If C1 and C2 differ in language, inherited conceptual categories, political institutional conditions, and historical pressures, then the available representational resources and stabilization mechanisms differ. Since the mapping from lived reality to transmissible artifacts is constrained by those resources, the outputs need not coincide. In particular, compression and categorization under different constraints predict divergent doctrinal packages, even when the underlying existential pressures overlap. Hence, doctrinal divergence is structurally expected under the stated assumptions. Gadamer, 2004, Lemma 5.10. Convergence from common conditions. Assume finite agents share stable conditions of life, finitude, mortality, social coordination problems, suffering, and the need for meaning-making. Then, even under doctrinal divergence and cultural contingency, it is expected that many religious systems will exhibit existential convergence in recurrent functions and motifs. Proof? Religious systems function, among other things, as navigation interfaces for finite agents. Navigation problems generated by common human conditions are not culture-specific in the relevant sense. They recur wherever finite social agents exist. Therefore, even if representational form diverges across cultures, by Lemma 5.9, functional pressures can select for similar motifs and roles across traditions. This yields overlap. In F, Ri, across many Ri, which is exactly existential convergence. Durkheim, 1995, Weber 1978, 5.95. Theorem 5.1. Let Ri be a family of major religious historical periods. I. Divergence in central metive claims. I. Doctrinal divergency and affiliation and transmission. Definition 5.8. Existential converse thesis. The best explanation of this joint functions as a finite translation is the best explanation of form. Consequently, merely by its self-description as revelation to be a complete or error-free representation of existential reality. Proof. The proof is abductive. The aim is to identify the most coherent explanatory model compatible with I, the human interface thesis, TU, the map territory gap, and 2, the joint empirical pattern. By Lemma 5.8, affiliation is strongly associated with cultural inheritance and context, yielding cultural contingency. By Lemma 5.9, distinct cultural and linguistic constraints on the production and stabilization of artifacts predict doctrinal divergence. By Lemma 5.10, shared human conditions predict existential convergence in functional roles and motifs. A model that treats religion primarily as an unmediated, culturally invariant deposit of a single propositional package is not naturally aligned with this joint structure, since such a model predicts either widespread doctrinal convergence or a distribution signature closer to intersubjective error correction than to cultural clustering. By contrast, the translation layer model predicts all three components at once: cultural clustering through social transmission, divergence through local representational constraints, and convergence through shared existential conditions. Therefore, under the stated constraints, the translation layer model is the best explanation of the joint pattern. Corollary 5.12, doctrinal rivalry is downstream of mediation. If the translation layer model is correct, then doctrinal rivalry between traditions is downstream of representational mediation. Accordingly, the primary philosophical task is not to ask which doctrinal map is identical with the territory, but to ask which features of existential reality are tracked across translation, which distortions arise from finite compression and local constraint, and what intersubjective criteria can adjudicate claims that purport to exceed the map. Proof. By Theorem 5.1.1, religious systems are finite mappings rather than identity statements about existential reality. Rival doctrines are therefore rival outputs of distinct mappings and stabilization processes, not direct competitors for the status of unmediated territory. Hence, rivalry is downstream of mediation. The remainder follows by unpacking the map territory gap. If representation is not identity, evaluation must proceed by tracking, omission, distortion, and testable consequences, rather than by stipulating that a map is the territory. Remark 5.13. It is not a truth-value theorem stating that religious claims are false. It is a representational theorem stating that religious systems are mediated, finite, culturally stabilized mappings under the human interface thesis. Truth and falsity questions remain, but they must be posed within the discipline imposed, by the map territory gap and by intersubjective methods rather than by self-authentication. Chapter 6. Smartest reading drives toward negative theology. 6.1. Why the strongest defense matters. Modern disputes about God often fail in a predictable way. A critic targets the weakest available reading of a tradition, usually a naive literalism. A defender responds by insisting that the tradition must be read more intelligently. The discussion then stalls in a procedural argument about metaphor, context, and depth, rather than advancing on the underlying question: what does a tradition become when it is interpreted under maximal intellectual responsibility? In this project, I treat the strongest interpretive defense as an object of analysis. The aim is not to deny that sophisticated interpretive lineages exist. They do. The aim is to ask what happens when that sophistication is applied consistently under constraints already established in the prior chapters. Those constraints can be stated compactly. 1. Under the human interface thesis, any purported relation is mediated by finite human cognition and finite human language. Whatever a tradition claims as its ultimate source, the deliverable that reaches a community is always an interface object, testimony, memory, text, institution, and interpretation. 2. Under the translation layer model and the map territory gap, religious language is a representational system. It may track reality, but it is not identical to the reality it addresses. Treating the surface form as a literal mirror of ultimacy is methodologically irresponsible by default. 3. Under the finite mind constraint, finite agents do not get to use infinite language as if it were simple. If a tradition claims ultimacy, it assumes an immediate representational burden. It must explain how finite predicates and finite symbols can meaningfully refer to what is taken to be beyond finitude. This chapter isolates a pressure that emerges when these constraints are taken seriously. When a tradition is read under maximal intelligence, the effort to preserve ultimacy while avoiding contradiction and anthropomorphism tends to converge toward negative theology, also called the via negativa or the apophatic tradition. Zalta, 2026a. The convergence is not a rhetorical trick. It is a structural outcome of treating ultimacy claims as real claims rather than as slogans. 6.2. The Steelman hermeneutic as an interpretive policy. I use Steelman hermeneutic to name a familiar policy of interpretive charity in serious theology and religious philosophy. The policy is not unique to any one tradition. It is the natural response of reflective believers and theologians when confronted with the defects of naive literalism. The core idea is simple. If a tradition is to be treated as potentially rational, then it should be interpreted in the way that maximizes internal coherence, moral seriousness, and conceptual stability, subject to the tradition's own sources and interpretive standards. In practice, the Steelman hermeneutic tends to involve a recurring bundle of moves, metaphor, and analogy. Anthropomorphic depictions are treated as pedagogical, symbolic, or analogical, rather than descriptive in the ordinary creaturely sense. A contextual repair. Troubling passages are placed in historical, legal, or rhetorical context to reduce surface contradiction or cruelty. A doctrinal abstraction. Claims are reformulated at a higher level of generality, where they can be made more coherent, even if that also makes them less testable in ordinary ways. A tradition-guided interpretation. Meaning is supplied by interpretive lineages, not merely by surface semantics. Acknowledgement of limits. When mismatch remains, the interpreter asserts that ultimacy exceeds human categories. 2 clarifications matter. First, the Steelman hermeneutic is not a license to make a text say anything. It is a disciplined attempt to read a translation layer as what it most plausibly could be, given that it emerged inside a finite community under finite conditions. Second, the Steelman hermeneutic is not neutral with respect to content. It is a systematic pressure toward abstraction. If a tradition insists that the ultimate is not merely the largest, object in the cosmos but the absolute ground of reality, then ordinary finite predication becomes dangerous. It risks turning ultimacy into a local item within the world. For that reason, the strongest interpretive strategy from inside many traditions is to remove, qualify, or downgrade finite predication. That removal is the doorway into negative theology. 6.3 and apophatic pressure. Philosophers and theologians often distinguish between cataphatic theology and negative theology. Zalta, 2026a. Cataphatic theology uses affirmative predication. God is good, God is wise, God is just. Negative theology emphasizes denial and constraint. God is not limited, not comparable, not one being among others. This is not merely a stylistic preference. It is a response to the structure of predication. Finite predicates do at least 3 things. This is the predicate finitude point. Predicates are finite tools for carving and managing distinctions inside experience. 1. They classify. To say that something is wise or powerful is to place it in a category that can be compared across cases. 2. They bound. Any creaturely wisdom has a profile, a scope, and an edge. Any creaturely power has constraints and trade-offs. 3. They contrast. Predicates draw distinctions inside a shared field. To call one thing wise implies that something else is less wise, or wise in a different way. If ultimacy is taken literally, the tradition is committed to the claim that the ultimate is not one item among others, inside a shared field. Ultimacy is not supposed to be an object that can be cleanly compared, bounded, and contrasted in the ordinary way. This creates what can be called apophatic pressure. The more a tradition insists that its ultimate is truly ultimate, the less it can mean by unqualified creaturely predicates. The resulting move is not a retreat from intelligence. It is the cost of maintaining the ultimacy claim without collapsing it into a finite object. If ultimacy is not one being among beings, then ordinary predication cannot apply univocally. Where traditions retain affirmative language, the strongest readings tend to treat it as analogical, symbolic, or pragmatic. In classical philosophical theology, strategies such as analogical predication and doctrines such as divine simplicity function as technical tools for preserving ultimacy while resisting the slide into creaturely description. Ashworth. 2014. This book does not require agreement with any one such strategy. The point is methodological. The Steelman hermeneutic tends to push traditions towards some form of apophatic discipline, because without that discipline, the ultimacy claim becomes unstable. 6.4 Canonical anchors across traditions. The pressure toward negative theology is not confined to esoteric texts or marginal mystics. It appears in widely cited anchor lines, often treated as central guardrails by the traditions themselves. In the Hebrew Bible, in Exodus, in a way that foregrounds being rather than a creaturely descriptor. NRS View 2021. It resists simple classification. The phrasetical theistic philosophy often moves from scriptural language into metaphysical language. The move is not necessarily a betrayal of scripture. It can be the Steelman hermeneutic applied to a line that refuses to behave like a creaturely identifier. Once the divine name is read as pointing toward being, or toward the source of being, a cascade follows. If the ultimate is being itself, or the source of being, then it is not one being among others. Ordinary predication becomes delicate. The more the ultimacy claim is taken seriously, the more the language is forced toward qualification, analogy, or negation. 6.4.2 The Quran. Explicit incomparability. A parallel guardrail is explicit in the Quran. The verse below can be read as a summary constraint on how God language must be handled. There is nothing like him. He is the all-hearing, the all-seeing. Quran 4:11, Abdel Halim 2004. The key point is the direction of the claim. Incomparability is not a peripheral slogan. It is a rule against treating God as comparable to created things. This is structurally apophatic. The tradition may still use attribute language, but the strongest reading must manage it under a constraint. Predicates cannot be treated as creaturely descriptions applied straightforwardly. Islamic theology has long developed technical language to mark this tension, often framed as the interplay between tanzi, declaring incomparability and transcendence, and tashbih. The fact that Scripture nevertheless speaks with similarity language, Watt, 1985, the presence of this machinery is not an embarrassment. It is an implicit acknowledgement of the finite predicate problem. 6.4.3 Taoism, the refusal of capture. The Taoist constraint is written into the opening of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Tao Te Ching, Laozi, 1972. Here, the map territory gap is expressed directly as ultimacy grammar. The ultimate is not an object of ordinary description. Language functions as guidance rather than as a literal mirror. Elimination without closure. Neti? Neti functioned refusal to identify it with any finite object, property, or category. Not this, not that. Brihataranyaka 2.6, Brihataranyaka 2.3. Self. It is a method of resisting premature closure. Whatever can be grasped, as this is not the ultimate in question. The intellectual posture is recognizably apophatic. The ultimate is approached by eliminatifications. What these anchors establish is minimal and structural. These traditions do not agree on metaphysics, practice, or institution. The claim is narrower. When ultimacy is taken seriously, and when a tradition is interpreted under maximal intelligence, the tradition is pushed toward the same representational constraint. Finite predicates do not straightforwardly apply to what is called ultimate. This is why sophisticated theology across traditions often sounds like ground of being language or limit language rather than like creaturely description. Serious theology already knows the constraint. It is important not to treat negative theology as a modern evasive maneuver. It is older than modern skepticism, and it is not confined to the margins. In the Christian tradition, apophatic theology is classically associated with works attributed to Pseudo-Dionysius, where the intellect is urged to move beyond affirmative naming as it approaches the divine. Areopagite. 1987. Patristic sources such as Gregory of Nyssa develop related themes, emphasizing the incomprehensibility of God and the inadequacy of finite concepts for capturing the divine nature. Nyssa. 1978. Modern scholarship often treats this apophatic strand as a recurring discipline that both coexists with and constrains affirmative theology. It is a way of preserving ultimacy by refusing to let finite concepts masquerade as literal capture. D. Turner 1995. In Islamic theology, divine incomparability is not optional rhetoric. It is a central doctrinal constraint, and it is accompanied by interpretive strategies designed to handle anthropomorphic language without collapsing God into a creaturely object. What? 1985, one sees, again, the same basic logic. The ultimacy claim forces a careful distinction between Scripture's surface predicates and the intended meaning of those predicates. Medieval Jewish philosophical theology provides a parallel case. Maimonides develops a negative attributes approach precisely because affirmative creaturely predicates threaten divine unity and ultimacy. Maimonides. 1963. The point is not that these traditions are identical. The point is that the apophatic constraint is discovered repeatedly by thinkers who take the ultimacy claim seriously and refuse contradiction. This is the convergence thesis of this chapter in historical form. The smartest reading does not stabilize naive literal predication. It destabilizes it, and it does so for principled reasons. 6.6 When ineffability becomes an ineffability shield. At this stage, a natural reply appears: ultimacy outruns language, and that is the whole point of theology. I agree that a disciplined acknowledgement of limits can be intellectually honest. The question is what such acknowledgement does to doctrinal content, especially when doctrine is used to justify strong claims about salvation, condemnation, and social authority. There is a difference between apophatic humility and an ineffability shield. Apophatic humility functions as a constraint. It reduces literal claims. It forces qualification. It limits the authority of confident creaturely predication about the ultimate. In other words, it pays a price. An ineffability shield functions as immunity. It allows strong positive claims to remain socially and psychologically operative while blocking any responsibility to specify conditions of meaning, application, or correction. When the shield is deployed, mystery stops being a recognition of finite limits and becomes a procedure for retaining propositions without evaluability. A practical diagnostic clarifies the boundary. 1. Constraint test. Does the appeal to ineffability actually constrain what the tradition is willing to assert literally, or does it merely protect assertions from challenge? 2. Asymmetry test. Is ineffability invoked only when a claim is under pressure, while other claims are treated as perfectly knowable and binding? 3. Cost test. Does the tradition relinquish specific creaturely pictures of the ultimate as a result of apophatic discipline? Or does it retain those pictures while declaring them beyond scrutiny? When the tests are passed, negative theology becomes a serious philosophical posture. It can function as an internal clarification that prevents anthropomorphism and contradiction. When the tests have failed, the tradition may retain social function, but it sacrifices epistemic traction. The claims cease to operate as knowledge claims in the ordinary sense. This matters for the trajectory of the book because many religious systems simultaneously insist on divine incomprehensibility and retain highly specific doctrinal overlays. That combination tends to be unstable. If apophatic discipline is taken seriously, much of the specific overlay must be downgraded to metaphor, pedagogy, or community practice. If the overlay is retained as literal while apophatic language is used as immunity, then the project has reached the Ineffability Shield case. 6.7 Convergence and the next step. The core result of this chapter is an apophatic convergence claim that can be stated without formalism. Under maximal interpretive intelligence, traditions that claim ultimacy tend to converge toward negative theology because finite predicates cannot apply unqualifiedly to what is taken to be ultimate. When apophatic discipline is taken seriously, the literal content of the God concept is reduced and begins to overlap with existential ground language. The ultimate is not an object within the world, not a creaturely agent, and not the kind of thing that can be captured by finite description. This convergence reinforces, rather than undermines, the earlier translation layer model. The most sophisticated readings are implicitly admitting the map territory gap. They are acknowledging that doctrinal language is an interface, not the territory. The next chapter is the natural continuation. Many traditions still speak of the ultimate in strongly personal terms: will, love, wrath, preference, choice. If those predicates are taken literally, they imply structure and limitation. If they are not taken literally, the tradition is retreating further into the apophatic posture described here. Chapter 7 makes that fork explicit by analyzing personhood and preference language under the same finite mind constraints. 6.8 Formal derivation of the smartest reading Steelman. This section formalizes the structural claim argued in the chapter body. When a tradition that asserts ultimacy is interpreted under maximal intellectual charity, the resulting semantics are pushed toward negative theology, unless the tradition retreats into an ineffability shield. Throughout, let T denote a religious translation layer, as developed earlier in the project, that asserts an ultimate referent you and employs ordinary human predicates in discourse about you. We take as established the project constraints that I, the informational endpoint, is interface-bound, human interface thesis. 2. A translation layer is not identical to its target, map territory gap. And 2. All predication available to finite agents is mediated by finite conceptual resources, finite mind constraint. 6.8.1 Definitions. Definition 6.1 Steelman hermeneutic. Let T be a translation layer with a corpus of basic utterances ST and a set of admissible interpretations I, S. For each S center, Steelman hermeneutic is an interpretive policy that for each SST selects an interpretation H, SIS, such that A. Coherence maximization, internal inconsistency, is minimized under the resulting interpreted corpus, H, S, or S stay B. Ultimacy preservation. U is not reduced to a finite item in a shared comparison field, insofar as T intends U as ultimate. C. Anthropomorphism reduction. Predicates that ascribe creaturely limitations are treated as non-literal or qualified where necessary. D. Moral intelligibility. Interpretations that generate gratuitous cruelty, caprice, or contradiction with the tradition's own justice commitments are disfavored. E. Interface realism. The interpretation does not posit a semantic bypass of the human linguistic and cognitive interface. Definition 6.2 Apophatic move. Let T assert an ultimate referent U and employ affirmative predicates PU within its discourse. An apophatic move is the interpretive transition in which the intended content of such predicates is systematically shifted away from univocal predication toward one or more of the following. A. Negation PU is retained only in a form that denies finite limitation, a via negativa constraint. B. Analogy PU is retained as analogical predication rather than as the ordinary creaturely predicate. Aquinas, 1920. Ashworth, 2014. Limit language PU is treated as a boundary marker indicating that U exceeds the predicate's finite application conditions. Zalta, 2026 day. An interpreter advances a non-trivial set of affirmative claims C+ about U, practice boundary making or authority, and B, evaluability plus the interpreter denies any stable conditions of application, correction, or refinement by appeal to ineffability or mystery, in such a way that substantive disagreement cannot be adjudicated even in principle. The definitional C+ is retained as socially or psychologically load-bearing while its semantic and epistemic accountability is suspended. Predicate finitude. Let M be a finite cognitive agent and let pred M be the set of predicates available to M in ordinary discourse. Predicate finitude is the constraint that for each P pred M there exists a finite practice-grounded domain of application DP, a comparison class of tokenable cases, and finite criteria of use such that A. P gains determinate content only via its role over DP, paradigms, contrasts, and correction practices, and B. Univocal predication of P to an intended referent X presupposes that X is treated as belonging to the relevant comparison field, in which P has its ordinary application conditions. 6.8.2 Lemmas. Lemma 6.5 Finite predicate lemma. Let T be a translation layer that asserts an ultimate referent U in the strong sense that U is not intended as one finite item among others. Assume predicate finitude. then no ordinary affirmative predicate P can be applied to U by univocal predication without collapsing the ultimacy role of U into a finite comparison class. Therefore, preserving ultimacy forces one of the following: negation, analogy, or equivocal predication. Proof. Fix an ordinary predicate P available to finite agents. By predicate finitude, P has determinate content only through its use over a practice-grounded domain dP. If P is applied to U univocally, then the same application conditions and inferential role used for finite cases are asserted to hold of U. This treats U as an admissible member of the comparison field, in which P has its ordinary sense, namely dP, or an extension of the same kind. But the strong ultimacy role for U is precisely that U is not to be treated as one member in a shared field of finite items and finite properties. If U is placed into dP as a subject of ordinary predication, the role collapses. U becomes an item comparable under the predicate to other items, which defeats the intended ultimacy. Therefore, under the ultimacy role, P, U, cannot be sustained as univocal predication. If PU is retained, it must be retained via I negation, refusing creaturely limitation, a Jew analogy, a controlled departure from univocal use, or 2 equivocation, a shift of sense, Zalta. 2026a, Aquinas 1920. Lemma 6.6. Humility versus immunity boundary. Let an interpreter assert that U exceeds ordinary language. If the interpreter accepts a systematic reduction of literal affirmative content, or supplies disciplined rules of analogy and correction, then the ineffability claim functions as epistemic humility. If the interpreter retains strong positive claims about U while refusing any stable conditions of correction or refinement, then the ineffability claim functions as an ineffability shield. Proof. If an interpreter reduces literal affirmative content, the resulting posture is constrained. Negations and disciplined analogies impose stable boundaries on what may be asserted, and on what must be withdrawn when contradiction or misapplication arises. In that case, the ineffability claim does not license arbitrary positive content, and the discourse retains at least minimal evaluability. If instead the interpreter retains a load-bearing set of strong positive claims C+, while denying any stable conditions of correction, refinement, or application, then, by Theorem 6.3, the posture is exactly an ineffability shield. The distinction is therefore structural. Humility narrows or disciplines claim content. Immunity blocks accountability while preserving positive load. 6.8.3 Main Theorem. Theorem 6.7, Apophatic Convergence Theorem. Let T be a translation layer that asserts an ultimate referent U, and let T be interpreted under a Steelman hermeneutic. Assume predicate finitude, and the strong ultimacy role for U. Then T is forced into the following fork: I, apophatic convergence. T undergoes an apophatic move, in which affirmative predications about U are systematically converted to negation, analogy, or limit language, thereby reducing the literal creaturely content of U-talk, or itse. Immunity by ineffability, T preserves strong positive doctrinal claims about U by deploying an ineffability shield, thereby retaining social or practical load while suspending evaluability. In case I, U no longer functions as a finite personal agent within the ordinary God-no-God frame. In case 2, U-talk may retain pragmatic force but forfeits the epistemic ambitions typically claimed for doctrine. Proof. Under a Steelman hermeneutic, T is interpreted to maximize coherence while preserving the intended ultimacy of U. Theorem 6.1. By the finite predicate lemma. Theorem 6.5. Ordinary affirmative predicates about U cannot be retained as univocal predication without collapsing the ultimacy role of U into a finite comparison class. Therefore, preserving ultimacy requires systematic qualification of affirmative predication. There are only 2 stable ways to perform that qualification. First, T can accept the semantic cost and shift U-talk into negation, disciplined analogy, or limit language. That is precisely the apophatic move, Theorem 6.2, yielding apophatic convergence. Second, T can retain strong positive doctrinal content while refusing any stable correction or refinement conditions by appeal to ineffability. By Theorem 6.3, this is the ineffability shield. By the humility versus immunity boundary lemma. Theorem 6.6, this is not epistemic humility, but immunity. Finally, in the apophatic case, the remaining literal content of U-talk is no longer the content of an ordinary personal agent description. A personal agent description requires stable creaturely predicates, knowledge, will, preference, temporal action, applied as more than metaphor. But those are exactly the predicate uses that the apophatic discipline refuses under ultimacy. Hence, in case I, U no longer functions as a finite personal agent within the ordinary God-no-God frame. 6.8.4 Corollary. Corollary 6.8, Anthropomorphic predication constraint. Let T assert an ultimate referent U under the strong ultimacy role and be interpreted under a Steelman hermeneutic. Then literal anthropomorphic predications of U must be either I, downgraded to metaphor, or disciplined analogy, or 2, discarded on pain of collapsing U into a finite agent description. Proof. Anthropomorphic predicates are finite, creaturely predicates with ordinary application conditions. By Theorem 6.5, such predicates cannot be applied to U by univocal predication while preserving ultimacy. Therefore, if they are retained at all, they must be retained only under metaphorical or analogical discipline, or else abandoned. Remark 6.9, Position in the project. This chapter's formal result is intentionally limited. It does not claim that apophatic or negative theology is false. It claims that under maximal coherence pressure, ultimacy talk either converges toward apophatic discipline or becomes immune to evaluation. The next chapter analyzes the alternative route, traditions that insist on personal agent predicates and preferences, and what that commitment implies for finitude and ultimacy. Chapter 7. Preference, Personhood, and the Finite God Trap. 7.1 Ultimacy language and person language do not automatically align. In the previous chapter, I argued that once the God question is read intelligently, many traditions drift toward a shared strategy. They preserve ultimacy by loosening literal person language. They move toward a God who is less a psychological agent and more the name of the irreducible background of reality, or the name of a limit concept that finite minds cannot stably fill with creaturely content. That chapter treated the apophatic direction as a disciplined response to the finite mind constraint. This chapter treats the other direction, the insistence that God is, in a strong and literal sense, a person. The public vocabulary of the major monotheisms is saturated with person terms. God loves, hates, commands, forbids, regrets, becomes angry, relents, rewards, punishes, and chooses. Many believers also experience their religious life primarily through these predicates, not through metaphysical definitions. The aim here is not to moralize or to ridicule the language. It is to analyze its structure. In L, the core method is to treat claims as commitments. If a claim is taken literally, it brings its full conceptual machinery with it. If that machinery conflicts with other commitments, one of the commitments must be revised, or the claim must be reclassified as analogical, metaphorical, or pedagogical. The central thesis of this chapter is that personhood predicates are not neutral. They import a preference structure by default. That structure is not a failure of goodness or a psychological defect. It is a logical shape. It presupposes comparisons, alternatives, and a standpoint from which some outcomes count as better than others. This is exactly what finite agents do, because finite agents are located, partial, and constrained. The question is whether an ultimate ground can carry that same structure without ceasing to be ultimate. This chapter builds to a fork. Either God talk remains strongly personal, and therefore inherits the preference machinery of personhood, in which case the resulting deity is finite in the relevant sense, or 2, God remains ultimate, in which case person predicates must be treated as non-literal or analogical, pushing the theology toward the apophatic register and away from a psychologically describable agent. I will refer to this fork as the Finite God Trap. 7.2 Working distinctions, preference, personhood, and finitude. 3 distinctions keep the discussion clean. 7.2.1 Preference is a structure, not an insult. A preference, in the relevant sense, is not merely a passing feeling. It is any commitment that ranks alternatives. To say that an agent prefers A to B is to say that, all else equal, the agent is for A rather than B. The ranking can be expressed as desire, approval, choice, love, hatred, command, prohibition, reward, punishment, or even an allegedly impersonal will. The form is the same. Some states are selected or affirmed over others. This can be moral, immoral, or morally neutral. It can be rational or irrational. None of that matters for the present claim. What matters is that a preference is inherently selective. It draws a line. 7.2.2 Personhood predicates. By personhood predicates, I mean predicates whose ordinary use presupposes agency in the recognizably interpersonal sense, having intentions, reasons, commitments, evaluations, and directed responses. Some examples are love, hatred, jealousy, mercy, wrath, regret, forgiveness, and command. These predicates can be used literally, analogically, or metaphorically. The problem is that religious discourse often slides between these modes without saying so. A reader who hears God is jealous will typically process it as a personal predicate unless instructed otherwise. 7.2.3 Finitude as partiality of standpoint. In this chapter, finite is not weak and not small, it is structural. A finite agent occupies a standpoint. It is this rather than that. It selects among alternatives rather than being identical to totality. It is shaped by internal structure and external constraints. A deity can be unimaginably powerful and still be finite in this sense if it is an agent with preferences. Among real alternatives, 7.3 Why preferences entail limitation. The argument here is simple, and it is best stated as 3 connected claims. First, preferences presuppose a space of alternatives. If there are no alternatives, there is no meaningful preference. If there are alternatives, then something can be otherwise than what is preferred. Second, preferences presuppose a comparative standard. To prefer A over B is not merely to register 2 items. It is to treat one as better, more fitting, more worthy, more aligned with what is to be done. Even if the standard is internal to the agent, it is still a structure that distinguishes. Third, a space of alternatives and a comparative standard jointly imply limitation. If an agent prefers some outcomes over others, then the agent is not identical with the whole space of outcomes in a non-selective way. The agent stands in a relation to the space. It chooses, approves, commands, or rejects. That relation is a mark of being a part of reality rather than reality as such. A common attempt to resist this conclusion is to say God prefers the good because God is good. There is no limitation, only perfection. But this does not remove the structure. It replaces one question with another. If good is meaningful, it functions as a comparative standard. Either goodness is independent of God, in which case God is not ultimate, or goodness is identified with God, in which case the predicate good ceases to function in the ordinary comparative way. That second move is available, but it is a semantic escalation. It begins the semantic retreat that classical theism later systematizes through divine simplicity and divine impassibility. The point is not that preferences are bad. The point is that preferences are shaped, they draw boundaries. A being identical with total existence cannot literally be for one local outcome rather than another without introducing a structure that functions like a standpoint. 7.4% Why personhood predicates import preferences. Even if the word preference is avoided, person predicates reintroduce it. Consider God commands. A command distinguishes permitted from forbidden. That distinction is a ranking of possible actions. Consider God punishes. Punishment distinguishes acceptable from unacceptable. Consider God loves. Love, in ordinary use, is not mere awareness. It is directed affirmation. Consider God hates or God is wrathful. These are directed negations. The particular emotional phenomenology can be denied, but the ranking remains. This yields a practical diagnostic. Whenever a religious system treats God as issuing obligations, distributing reward and punishment, or reacting differently to different persons, it has installed a preference structure at the level of ultimacy. That structure can be embraced, denied, or reinterpreted, but it cannot be treated as nothing. It is a commitment. The rest of this chapter does two things. It shows that the major monotheisms contain abundant preference language, including strong examples. Then it shows that classical theist strategies preserve ultimacy only by draining that language of its univocal creaturely meaning. This is the heart of the Finite God Trap. 7.5 Textual preference structures in monotheism. The aim of this section is not to build a cheap contradiction. Sacred texts are multivocal, layered, and historically sedimented. Traditions interpret. The aim is narrower, to show that the ordinary surface semantics of many central passages is explicitly preferential. That matters because it forces interpretive choices. Either the personal predicates are accepted in something close to their ordinary meaning, or they must be reclassified. 7.5.1 Jealousy and exclusive worship. In the Decalogue, the God of Israel is described in explicitly jealous terms in the context of exclusive worship. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Exod 25, NRS View 2021, even if the remainder of the verse is bracketed. The predicate jealous is already enough to indicate a relational stance. Jealousy is not mere transcendence. It is directed concern about exclusive devotion. It implies an as opposed to, that is, preference structure. 7.5.2 Election and selective status. The Hebrew Bible also contains explicit election language describing Israel as chosen out of the nations. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on earth. Deut 7.6, NRS View 2021. In the same textual world, God is also described as impartial. The Lord is not partial and takes no bribe. Deut 10.17, NRS View 2021. These two strands are not impossible to reconcile. An interpreter can distinguish impartiality in judgment from particularity in vocation, or can treat election as instrumental rather than favoritist. The point is that the reconciliation is not free. It is an interpretive decision about what the predicates mean. Election language, taken in its plain sense, is preferential. The New Testament continues this preference vocabulary, including stark comparative love and hate. I have loved Jacob, but I have hated Esau. Rom 9.13, NRS View 2021. A tradition can soften hate into love less, or relocate it into a discourse about corporate history. Those moves may be defensible. They are still moves. They preserve ultimacy by altering the literal force of the predicate. 7.5.3 Regret, change of mind, and the pressure toward immutability. The preference machinery becomes even clearer when the text uses regret language. In Genesis, the Lord was sorry that he had made humans on the earth. Gen 6.6, NRS View 2021. In 1 Samuel, I regret that I made Saul king. It presupposes counterfactual comparison and implies that things could evaluated negatively. This is preference structure in its most explicit form. The same chapter then introduces a countervailing assertion. He will not deceive or change his mind, for he is not immortal. 1 Sam 15:29, NRS View 2021. And Numbers makes a similar claim. God is not a human being, that he should change his mind. Num 23:19, NRS View 2021. This cluster is philosophically significant because it generates a predictable theological response. Either accept that God changes and regrets, and then develop a dynamic picture of God, or protect ultimacy by denying literal regret, either by reinterpretation or by appeal to divine immutability and divine impassibility. The important point for this project is not which theological response is correct. It is that the text itself forces the issue. One cannot preserve all the person predicates in their ordinary register and simultaneously preserve a strong ultimacy claim without doing additional semantic work. 7.54 The Quran, Transcendence and Directed Evaluation. Islamic theology often foregrounds transcendence and incompatibility, including the insistence that God is not like creatures. There is nothing like him. He is the all-hearing, the all-seeing. Quran 4-11, Abdel Halim 2004. This is a clear Tanzi H pressure toward non-anthropomorphic predication. At the same time, the Quran also uses strong preference and evaluation language, including love and non-love, preference, personhood, and the finite God trap. God loves those who turn to him, and he loves those who keep themselves clean. Quran 2:22-2, Abdel Halim 2004. God does not love those who ignore his commands. Quran 3:32, Abdel Halim 2004. And it employs anger, rejection, and punitive preparation in a way that is difficult to treat as merely decorative. They carry the burden of God's anger, whom God has rejected, and for whom he has prepared hell. Quran 48:6, Abdel Halim 2004. Here again, a sophisticated interpreter can reconcile transcendence with evaluative language by distinguishing God's essence from the relational descriptions of his acts, or by treating the predicates as accommodated speech. Sunni traditions, for example, have long navigated the tension between tanzir tashbih by carefully regulating how the attributes are affirmed. The present point is structural. The text speaks in a preference-laden register while also affirming incomparability. To keep both, theology must either regulate the semantics of the predicates or accept a God who is, in relevant respects, personal and therefore structurally finite. 7.6%. How classical theism tries to keep ultimacy without preferences. The strongest attempt to preserve ultimacy while retaining religious language is not the naive anthropomorphic picture. It is classical theism. Classical theism does not primarily argue that God is a person in the human psychological sense. It argues that God is the ultimate ground and that creaturely predicates applied to God are to be handled with philosophical discipline. This is not a dodge. It is a well-developed semantic framework, and it deserves to be stated at full strength. 3 pillars are central: analogical predication, divine simplicity, and divine impassibility. Often a fourth is paired with them, divine immutability. The logic is as follows. 7.6.1. Analogical predication versus univocity. Classical theism denies univocal predication for most divine attributes. Good and wise do not mean exactly the same thing when said of God and when said of humans. They are not merely equivocal predication either, where the word has unrelated meanings. They are analogical. The predicate is tethered to a reality, but not by simple sameness of concept. Nagasawa. And Oppie 2021, Aquinas 1920. Once analogy is adopted, person predicates become unstable if treated as straightforward psychological reports. God loves cannot simply mean God has the affection state humans call. Love something else is intended. 7.6.2. Divine simplicity and the collapse of internal psychological structure. Divine simplicity denies composition in God. God does not have parts, and in strong formulations, God does not have really distinct attributes the way creatures do. Vallicella. This has immediate consequences for person language. A finite mind has a sequence of states. It deliberates. It is angry, then calm. It regrets, then resolves. It has competing motives, tensions, and learning. A simple being cannot literally have this internal structure. This does not mean that God cannot be described. It means that descriptions cannot function as straightforward psychological state ascriptions. The semantic burden shifts from internal states to the effects of God on creatures, or to God's single act considered under multiple aspects by finite minds. 7.6.3. Immutability as protections of ultimacy. Divine impassibility denies that God undergoes passions in the creaturely sense. God is not moved, not overwhelmed, not emotionally altered by events. Creal. 1986. Divine immutability extends this. God does not change. God does not gain knowledge, lose resolve, or revise plans. This is not a cheap refusal to read texts. It is a metaphysical claim about what ultimacy requires. If God is the ultimate ground, God cannot be one temporal object among others whose internal states shift in response to external triggers. If God were like that, God would be in the world rather than the ground of the world. Taken together, these classical moves generate a disciplined conclusion. Many personhood predicates are not literal in the creaturely sense. They are either analogical, accommodated, or descriptions of the relational profile of God's act relative to finite creatures. When Scripture says God is angry, classical theism does not treat this as a report of a passion. It treats it as a way to name the ordered consequences of God's justice as experienced by finite agents. 7.6.4. The cost. Drift toward the apophatic register. The point of stating classical theism at full strength is that it clarifies the book's central claim. Classical theism can preserve ultimacy, but it does so by performing a controlled semantic retreat from univocal person talk. That retreat is coherent. It is also a major concession to the finite mind thesis. The psychological reading of divine personhood is recognized as an artifact of finite conceptual machinery. In other words, classical theism does not refute the preference argument by showing that ultimacy can literally carry creaturely preference. It refutes it by changing the semantics of the predicates. It moves toward the apophatic register already analyzed in the previous chapter. That is why the Finite God Trap is not a cheap dilemma. It is what the strongest traditions already negotiate, usually without stating it bluntly. 7.7. The Finite God Trap stated cleanly. At this point, the 4 can be stated without drama. If person predicates are taken in a strongly literal univocal predication sense, then God is an agent with a preference structure that imports alternatives, comparative standards, and directed evaluations. The resulting God is structurally finite, because the God is a standpoint within reality, rather than identical with totality. If God is taken as ultimate in the strong sense that motivates classical theism, then literal personhood collapses. The language can remain, but it cannot remain univocal. It must be analogical, accommodated, or negative. This preserves ultimacy at the cost of psychological describability. God becomes, to a large extent, what Chapter 6 described, a disciplined limit concept, or a name for the irreducible ground whose full nature outruns finite predicates. This is the Finite God Trap. The more literal the person, the less ultimate the God; the more ultimate the God, the less literal the person. This is also why the familiar cultural divide between theist and atheist often mislocates the real question. Much of what is debated is not existence versus non-existence, but 2 different semantic regimes for God talk. One regime uses person predicates univocally. The other retreats from univocity to preserve ultimacy. These are different objects of discourse. 7.8. Anchor list for the reader. For convenience, here are the anchor texts used above, grouped by the predicate they exemplify. Jealousy and exclusive devotion, Exit 20, 5, NRS View 2021, election and chosen status, .7, 6, .7 Thit, Rom 9, 6, NRS View 2021, comparative love and hate, Rom 9, 13, 17, regret and sorrow, Gen 6, 6, NRS View 20. Transcendence. Quran 4:11. Abdel Halim 2004. Love and non-love. Quran 2:22. Abdel Halim 2004. Quran 3:32. Abdel Halim 2004. Anger, rejection, and punishment. Quran 48:6. Abdel Halim 2004. 7.9. What this chapter secures for what follows. This chapter secures a constraint, not a conclusion about anyone's sincerity. If God is spoken of as a personal agent in a strongly literal register, the resulting object is not an ultimate ground in the strict sense. It is a finite deity, even if an immense one. The finite marker is not power level. It is preference structure and standpoint. If God is retained as ultimate, the strongest available theological strategy is to control and restrict predicate use through analogy, simplicity, impassibility, and immutability. But that strategy converges on the apophatic register. The God that survives is increasingly unlike any interpersonal agent. The preference language becomes interpretive, not literal. The next chapter uses this result as a sorting tool. Many non-dual ultimate Eastern and philosophical traditions avoid the preference problem by rejecting literal personhood from the start. They often converge on an impersonal ultimate, or on a ground that is not a chooser among alternatives. The question then becomes whether those ultimates are genuinely distinct from existential ground, or whether they are relabeled descriptions of existence and its structure. That is where Chapter 8 begins. Formal derivation of preference equals finitude. Frame. Let E denote the totality of existence, whatever exists, in any mode. Let it denote a non-empty set of alternatives. Possible states of affairs, actions, or outcomes. In this formal layer, ultimate totality is treated as coextensive with E, in the sense developed earlier. An unlimited, absolute ultimate is not coherently a proper part of what exists. Definitions. Definition 7.1. Anthropomorphic predication and personhood predicates. Let God be a candidate referent for theistic discourse. Fix a family of personhood predicates, understood as predicates that functionally characterize person-like agency in ordinary explanatory practice, including at minimum. Preference, personhood, and the finite God trap. I, intentional willing, chooses, intends, commands, prohibits. 2. Effective states, loves, is pleased, is angered, is jealous. Taken, temporal responsiveness, reacts, relents, forgives, changes course. IV. Relational evaluation, favors X over Y, rewards, punishes. V. Narrative agency, acts in history for reasons, pursues aims. These predicates are standard in philosophy of action and mind as the core explanatory profile of agency and practical reason. Dennett. 1987. Davidson, 1963. Frankfurt, 1971. An anthropomorphic predication is any attribution of a non-trivial subset of personhood predicates to God, where non-trivial means the attribution is not vacuous and carries discriminating content across at least some alternatives, for example. It supports counterfactual contrast, such as God wills X rather than Y. A God concept is an anthropomorphic God if it includes at least one anthropomorphic predication in the above sense. Definition 7.2. Preference structure, ultimacy, limitation. A being B has a preference structure if there exists a non-trivial, strict ordering B on a set of alternatives as such that for some X, YA, XBY. Call B ultimacy as totality, or simply ultimate totality. IFFB equal to E. This captures the standard ultimate ambition of perfect being and absolute totality discourse. Canterbury. 1979. Aquinas, 1920. IFFB equal to E results. Theorem 7.3. Preference finitude result. Preference finitude result. Let B be a being, and suppose B has a preference structure over a domain of alternatives. A. If B is non-trivial, then B is limitation, hence not ultimate totality. Proof sketch. Because B is non-trivial, there exist X, Y, A, with X, B, Y. This entails 3 structural commitments. I. Alternativity. At least 2 distinguishable alternatives are in play. E. Comparative standard. There is some criterion, stance, or evaluation relative to which X is ranked above Y for B. TI. Directional selection. The ordering is asymmetric, meaning the evaluation is not indifferent across A. Now assume for contradiction that B is ultimate totality. That is B equal to E. Definition 7.2. The comparative standard that realizes the asymmetry XBY must be either A. External to E, an evaluative standard not contained in totality. This contradicts B equal to E as totality, since it posits something relevantly outside the total. B. Internal to E, an evaluative structure within totality. But then the bearer of the preference structure is that evaluative subsystem, not E as such. Attributing the preference ordering to E itself conflates totality with one of its proper internal stances. In that case, the correct bearer of B is a proper part of E, and so the entity that literally has preferences is not E. Either way, a non-trivial preference structure is incompatible with ultimacy as totality. Therefore, any being that literally has B is not E, hence is limitation. Lemma 7.4. Personhood entails preference. If a God concept is anthropomorphic God, definition 7.1, then the concept entails that God has a preference structure, definition 7.2. Proof sketch. Each anthropomorphic predication listed in definition 7.1 carries, at minimum, contrastive content across alternatives. For example, intentional willing implies an agent selects some outcomes or actions rather than others. Selection among alternatives entails a ranking, even if coarse. Affective states such as love, approval, anger, or jealousy are evaluative attitudes. Evaluative attitudes distinguish favored from disfavored states. Relational evaluation, rewarding, punishing, favoring, is explicitly comparative, and so directly induces an ordering over at least some alternatives. Hence, if a God concept includes non-trivial personhood predicates, it entails that there exist x, y, a with x, g, y for some relevant domain A. That is, the concept entails a preference structure. Theorem 7.5. Finite God Trap. Finite God Trap. Let God be defined by the conjunction of A. Ultimacy is totality. God is ultimate totality. G equal to E. And B. Literal personhood. God is an anthropomorphic God with non-trivial personhood predicates. Then the concept is unstable. Either I. The personhood attributions are not literal. They are metaphorical, analogical, or otherwise semantically demoted, or T. The personhood attributions are literal, and God is limitation by Theorem 7.3 and Lemma 7.4. There is no coherent third option where God is simultaneously ultimate totality and literal personhood. Proof. Assume B. By Lemma 7.4, literal personhood entails a preference structure for G. By Theorem 7.3, any bearer of a non-trivial preference structure is limitation, hence not ultimate totality. This contradicts A. Therefore, if ultimacy as totality is retained, personhood predicates cannot be literal. Conversely, if personhood predicates are retained as literal, ultimacy as totality fails. Corollary. Stability condition for theistic discourse. Any semantically stable theistic framework must satisfy at least one of the following. I. Demotion personhood predicates are treated as metaphorical or analogical, a move continuous with apophatic or negative theological restraint, or to sec on. Finitization, personhood predicates are literal, and the deity is accepted as limitation rather than ultimate totality. Proof. Immediate from Theorem 7.5%. Note on a stantical classical theism response is to avoid literal preference and effect by invoking divine impassibility and divine simplicity, treating scriptural or devotional person language as accommodated, analogical, or pedagogical. This is precisely option I in Theorem 7.5. The discourse remains coherent only by demoting literal personhood. Chapter 8. Nondual ultimate God and the same collapse. A common reaction to the argument, developed so far, is to reach for an escape route. Perhaps the Western framing of God versus no God is the problem. Some mystical and non-dual ultimate traditions avoid it. On this view, the project collapses only because it has taken the wrong target. The cure is to shift vocabulary from God to Brahman, Tao, suchness, emptiness, or some other ultimate term that is not modeled as a supernatural person. This chapter tests that escape route under the same constraints already established. I. Any intelligible content must be presented through the human interface thesis. 2. Any attempt to make ultimacy an object of finite description generates a map territory gap. And 2. Any attempt to preserve a personal ultimum reintroduces the finite God trap, because preference, partiality, and situated agency remain signatures of finitude. Chapter 7. The point here is not to adjudicate which tradition is true. The point is narrower, where the changing religious vocabulary changes the underlying logical options. 3 recurring strands in Eastern philosophical traditions that are especially instructive. 1. Non-dual ultimate. Ultimacy is not a being among beings, and is not capturable by literal description. 2. Devotional plurality. Multiple practices, names, and deities are treated as legitimate approaches to the divine or to liberation. 3. Practice primacy. Authority claims are subordinated to lived verification and to what practice does to suffering and conduct. When those strands are read carefully, they do not evade the collapse developed earlier. They converge with it. They typically yield one of 3 outcomes. Ultimacy is identified with total existence, and thus ceases to be a separable personal being. Ultimacy is declared ineffable, and thus ceases to be a disputable object. Or the debate is bracketed as non-primary in favor of practice. None of these outcomes reconstructs a stable, separate, infinite person standing outside reality issuing propositions for assent. 8.1. The alleged escape. Ineffability as a shield. The most tempting move is the Ineffability Shield. If the ultimate is beyond thought and speech, then logic cannot touch it. In one respect, this is correct. If a claim has no determinate content, then it cannot be refuted by determinate argument. But this also means that it cannot play the role that the classical God concept is asked to play. It cannot ground specific doctrines, licenses, prohibitions, salvation conditions, or historical claims, because those are determinate. An ineffable ultimate cannot coherently authorize a finite list of literal propositions as if the finite list were the ultimate itself. In practice, ineffability is rarely left alone. What follows the ineffability declaration is almost always a re-entry into language, non-dual ultimate God and the same collapse. A tradition proceeds to name attributes, prescribe rituals, specify warnings and promises, and regulate communal life. This is where the earlier structural tension returns. An ineffable ultimate can exist as a boundary marker, a direction of attention, or a denial of capture. It cannot, without contradiction, be both ineffable and also the author of a detailed, literal, finite rulebook that binds all persons under threat. The second move requires reintroducing finite content claims about what the ultimate wants, prefers, commands, and rewards. That is exactly where the preference constraint reappears. This chapter therefore treats ineffability as an admission of the limit, rather than as a solution to it. It is not an attack on mysticism. It is a clarification of what mysticism can and cannot do in an argument about a personal separable ultimate agent. 8.2 Non-dual ultimate, ultimacy without a separable person. Non-dual and apophatic strands are not marginal curiosities. They are recurring in multiple traditions, and they often state explicitly what the earlier chapters implied. Ultimacy is not correctly modeled as a being among beings. 8.2.1 Ineffability is not a loophole, it is a diagnosis. A minimal Taoist statement captures the core point. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Tao Te Ching 1. Tao Te Ching Chapter 1. Feng, English translation. 2026. The philosophical content here is straightforward. Any named object is already a finite representation, and therefore cannot be identical with what is claimed to be ultimate. Once this is accepted, two consequences follow immediately. First, ultimacy is no longer in the same category as an agent that issues sentences. A being that authorizes a text is already in a relation to that text and to its readers. Relations of this kind are structured, directional, and partial. They belong to the domain of finite agency. Second, the meaningful role of the ultimate becomes diagnostic rather than descriptive. It marks a limit on representational capture and thereby enforces humility about metaphysical claims. Nothing in this conflicts with the main line of the book. The collapse argument does not require denying ultimacy. It requires rejecting the incoherent combination of ultimacy with separability and with finite person attributes. Non-dual ultimacy declines that combination from the beginning. In that sense, it is not a counterexample. It is a convergence. 8.2.2 What non-duality does to the God-no-God frame. If ultimacy is non-dual, then the usual atheism-theism opposition is misframed. God exists, and God does not exist, are both attempting to treat ultimacy as an object in the inventory of the world. A non-dual ultimate is not an item in the inventory. It is the condition under which inventories arise at all, or it is the totality that includes every item without being one more item. This yields a clean result. Disputation about a separable God becomes category confusion. The relevant question becomes how finite minds relate to existence as a whole, and how they manage the map territory gap between what is lived and what is said. That is the same relocation already developed in chapters 2 and 5. It is important not to overclaim here. Not every tradition in Asia is non-dual, and not every school labeled Vedanta or Buddhism is apophatic. There are robust theistic schools in Hindu philosophy, and there are devotional and cosmological strands in Buddhist history. The point is not that all Eastern or non-dual ultimate traditions are the same. The point is that where non-dual ultimacy is affirmed, the separable person-God question is not being answered differently. It is being dissolved. 8.3 Devotional plurality. Many approaches without an exclusivist gate. The second strand is not ineffability, but pluralism. Many traditions affirm that there are multiple valid approaches, often including multiple divine forms. This strand is sometimes treated as the definitive alternative to the salvation gate analyzed earlier, chapter 4. If multiple paths are valid, then the belief gate problem appears to disappear. This does not defeat the book's argument, it relocates it. Plurality shifts the conflict from which one doctrine is correct to what is the status of these many doctrines and deities. Once that question is asked, the same two options recur. Either the many forms are finite or they are not ultimate. If one insists that a particular form is ultimate in the strict sense, then the plurality becomes inconsistent or is demoted to a pedagogical concession. If one preserves the plurality as genuine, then ultimacy is either a totality behind the many forms or an ineffable limit, and the personal forms are finite modes. 8.3.1 Reciprocity as admission of many interfaces. A clear textual anchor for plural approach appears in the Bhagavad Gita. As all surrender unto me, I reward them accordingly. Everyone follows my path in all respects, O son of Parthiae. Bhagavad Gita 4.11. Prabhupada 2026a. As a philosophical move, reciprocity has a precise implication. The divine-human relation is mediated by the form of approach. That is, the interface matters. This aligns directly with the human interface thesis constraint. A finite mind relates to the ultimate through finite modes, and those modes shape what the mind experiences and says. If reciprocity is taken seriously, then it becomes difficult to maintain the most rigid version of an exclusivist salvation gate. Multiple approaches can be meaningful, which implies that the human side of the relation is not reducible to assent to one doctrinal proposition. In the book's terms, the Fairness Clause pressure is partially acknowledged by the tradition itself. 8.3.2 Absorption and reinterpretation of other worship. Plurality can also appear in a more guarded form. Other worship is not denied, but is reinterpreted as indirect worship of the ultimate. Another anchor text is explicit. Those who are devotees of other gods actually worship only me, O son of Kunti. Bhagavad Gita 9.23, Prabhupada 2026b. Even without endorsing the evaluative tale of the verse, the structural point is clear. Multiple deities are acknowledged as objects of devotion, but their ultimacy is denied. They are either absorbed into a single ultimate or treated as subordinate. Under the framework of this book, this is simply the familiar reduction. The many are finite. The ultimate is either totality or ineffable ground. That reduction is not a problem. It is a disclosure. It shows what a sophisticated theism does when faced with plurality. It moves toward non-duality, toward symbolic interpretation, or toward a hierarchy of finitude. In each case, the separable person ultimate is not preserved as a literal competitor to atheism. The frame shifts away from the binary. 8.4 Practice primacy and the Buddhist epistemic constraint. The third strand is the most decisive, because it attacks the authority structure that generates salvation gates in the first place. In many Buddhist contexts, metaphysical speculation is secondary to the problem of suffering, and the legitimacy of a teaching is tied to the observable consequences of taking it up. This is not a superficial modern reading imposed on an ancient tradition. It is articulated within the canon itself as a criterion for acceptance. A compact anchor from the Kalama Sutta states the constraint directly. Don't go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture. And 3.65. Bhikkhu 1994a. The remainder of the passage develops a disciplined method. Evaluate teachings by whether they lead to harm or welfare, and check one's judgments against the wise. That method is not identical to modern empiricism, and it is not the same as subjectivism. It is, however, an explicit refusal to treat authority as self-justifying. It prioritizes lived verification over inherited assertion. When practice primacy is taken seriously, the God-no-God dispute becomes non-primary. A creator hypothesis does not function as the engine of the practice. The emphasis shifts to how desire, aversion, and delusion operate in experience, and to what systematically reduces their grip. In the vocabulary of this book, this is a direct alignment with existential grounding. The question becomes what is undeniably occurring and what follows for conduct, not what metaphysical picture is most flattering or most socially rewarded. This does not make Buddhism a simple form of atheism. It makes it a test case for the central claim of this project. When ultimacy is approached through finite life, the decisive constraints are experiential and ethical rather than doctrinal. That is precisely why the classical salvation gate appears increasingly strained even within theistic contexts. Chapter 6, 8.5, What survives the shift in vocabulary? At this point, the non-dual ultimate escape can be stated precisely. It attempts to preserve ultimacy while avoiding the contradictions attached to a separable, preference-laden cosmic person. The three strands analyzed here show that the escape works only by conceding what the main argument already forced. 1. If ultimacy is framed as non-dual ultimate, then it collapses into totality or into an apophatic limit. Either way, it is not a separable person. 2. If plurality of deities and paths is preserved, then the deities are finite modes, and the ultimate is not a rival object in the world. The frame shifts from assent to relationship in practice. 3. If practice primacy is affirmed, then metaphysical disputes are subordinate to transformation of life, and authority is evaluated by consequences rather than granted by fiat. None of these outcomes reconstitutes the classical God concept as a literal, disputable entity that stands outside existence and issues a finite list of mandatory beliefs. Non-dual ultimate God and the same collapse. This is why the chapter title includes the same collapse. Different traditions begin in different places, with different metaphors and practices. But when the question is reduced to its logical bones, the space of coherent options does not expand. It becomes clearer. The project is not forcing historically Eastern traditions into Western boxes. It is showing that when ultimacy is handled with maximal sophistication, it converges with the same structural constraints that motivated the earlier chapters. 8.6 Why this chapter matters for what comes next. This chapter is not an attempt to rank traditions. It secures a narrower point needed for the rest of the book. Changing vocabulary does not change the basic logical options. Where a tradition is most philosophically rigorous, it tends to either I, admit the apophatic limit, 2a2, demote person-like divine forms to finite modes, or 2, subordinate metaphysics to practice. That has a consequence for the analysis that follows. If ultimacy is not a separable person, and if salvation is not primarily assent, then the remaining question is not which metaphysical picture is correct. The remaining question is what the overlays do, what they regulate, what they stabilize, what they threaten, what they permit. Once the metaphysics is softened by non-duality, plurality, or practice primacy, the project of religion often relocates to a different domain: social technology, identity formation, and authority maintenance. That relocation is not unique to any hemisphere. It is a predictable function of finite communities trying to manage meaning and coordination under uncertainty. The next chapter examines that relocation directly by analyzing control overlay dynamics as the practical residue that can persist even when the metaphysical claims are read intelligently. 8.7 Formal derivation of the non-dual ultimacy collapse. 8.7.1 Definitions. Definition 8.1 Non-dual ultimacy. A doctrinal model treats its ultimate term U as a non-dual ultimate when the following two conditions hold. 1. Ultimacy role. U is presented as ultimate, in the sense that it is not one conditioned item among others, but the final terminus for the explanatory question, what ultimately obtains and why. 2. Non-duality constraint. U is not presented as a separable agent object within the domain of ordinary entities. In particular, the model denies that U is a discrete individual standing alongside the totality of what obtains and instead treats U as identity with, or the non-objectual ground of, the totality. This definition is structural. It specifies the role a term plays in a model, not the truth of the model. Definition 8.2 Reciprocity principle. A doctrinal model satisfies the reciprocity principle when the model affirms that the ultimate meets an agent according to the agent's sincere orientation, rather than requiring a uniquely correct doctrinal description of ultimacy as a necessary entry condition. Equivalently, the model denies that there is a single belief gate, keyed to one privileged formulation that separates accepted from excluded merely by the absence of that formulation. Definition 8.3 Practice primacy. A doctrinal model satisfies practice primacy when the model's central criterion of success is primarily practical and transformative, for example. Ethical formation, attentional training, and liberative insight, rather than assent to a proposition of the form there exists a separable ultimate agent G. In such a model, doctrinal propositions may function pedagogically, but soteriological or evaluative standing does not reduce to crossing a uniquely specified belief gate. Definition 8.4, skillful means. A doctrinal model employs upaya. Skillful means when the model explicitly treats at least some of its doctrinal formulations as instrumentally valid teachings, adapted to the condition of the agent, rather than as final metaphysical descriptions that must be believed as literal and exclusive. 8.7.2 lemmas. Lemma 8.5, non-dual identity lemma. If a model treats you as a non-dual ultimate, then you cannot function as a separable being in the sense required by the God-no-God frame. In particular, either 1. You is identified with the totality of what obtains, so you exists is not an additional inventory claim, or 2. You is not the type of entity for which exist behaves like an ordinary predicate over discrete individuals. Proof. Assume you is treated as a non-dual ultimate. By definition 8.1, you is constrained to be non-separable from the totality. If one nonetheless attempts to interpret you as a separable individual alongside the totality, the interpretation contradicts the non-duality constraint, which explicitly denies that you is a discrete object located within the domain of ordinary entities as one item among others. Therefore, the model must take you either as identical with the totality, identity reading, or as non-objectual in the relevant sense, non-object reading. In neither case does you behave like a separable being whose existence can be disputed in the usual God-no-God frame sense. Lemma 8.6, reciprocity demotes exclusivism. If a model satisfies the reciprocity principle, then the model cannot consistently maintain an exclusivist belief gate that makes assent to one privileged doctrinal formulation a necessary condition of acceptance. Proof. Assume the model satisfies the reciprocity principle. By definition 8.2, acceptance is not made contingent on a uniquely correct doctrinal description as a necessary entry condition. An exclusivist belief gate is precisely the contrary claim that there exists a privileged formulation P such that the absence of assent to P suffices for exclusion, independent of sincere orientation. These claims are incompatible. Therefore, under the reciprocity principle, an exclusivist belief gate cannot be maintained. Lemma 8.7, practice primacy demotes belief gates. If a model satisfies practice primacy, then the model cannot treat assent to there exists a separable ultimate agent G as a necessary condition for success in the model's own primary evaluative register. Proof. Assume practice primacy. By definition 8.3, the model's primary criterion of success is transformative practice and insight rather than assent to a separable agent proposition. If the proposition there exists a separable ultimate agent G where a necessary condition, then the model's primary register would reduce to a belief gate keyed to that proposition. This contradicts the primacy condition, which denies that the decisive separation is doctrinal assent of that kind. Hence, such a belief gate is not necessary within the model's own primary register. 8.7.3 main theorem. Theorem 808, non-dual ultimate collapse theorem. Let M be a doctrinal model that is offered as an alternative route around the collapse of the God-no-God frame. If M satisfies at least one of the following structural conditions. 1. M treats its ultimate term U as a non-dual ultimate. 2. M satisfies the reciprocity principle. 3. M satisfies practice primacy. 4. M explicitly employs upaya, skillful means, in a way that demotes literal doctrinal finality. Then M does not restore the God-no-God frame as a fundamental metaphysical fork. More precisely, in M the central binary God exists as a separable ultimate agent versus God does not exist is either 1. A category mismatch, because ultimacy is non-dual or non-objectual, or 2. A non-primary question, because the decisive criterion is not assent to a privileged proposition. Proof. Proceed by cases. Case 1. M treats ultimacy as a non-dual ultimate. By lemma 8.5, U is either identical with the totality or non-objectual in the relevant sense. In either subcase, the God-no-God frame does not apply as a dispute over a separable individual. Case 2. M satisfies the reciprocity principle. By lemma 8.6, M cannot coherently maintain an exclusivist belief gate keyed to a privileged doctrinal formulation. Therefore, the God-no-God classification is not the fundamental hinge within M's own evaluative structure. Case 3, M satisfies practice primacy. By lemma 807, assent to a separable agent proposition cannot be the necessary condition in M's primary register. Hence, the God-no-God frame is not fundamental within the model. Case 4, M employs upaya, skillful means, in a way that demotes literal doctrinal finality. Then even where theological or metaphysical language appears, the language is not treated as a single, exclusive, and final description whose assent is a necessary entry condition. This again prevents the God-no-God frame from functioning as the decisive fork in the model's own structure. In each case, M fails to restore the God-no-God frame as a basic metaphysical binary. This establishes the claim. Corollary 8.9% convergence with apophatic collapse and translation layers. Models with the structures in theorem 8.8 converge with two earlier results of this project. 1. They converge with the apophatic or negative theological move, in which ultimacy is not captured by finite predicates as though it were a separable object. 2. They converge with the translation layer analysis, in which doctrinal systems function as finite interfaces over the existential ground rather than as privileged metaphysical inventories. Proof. If ultimacy is non-dual or non-objectual, the apophatic constraint follows as a limit on object-like predication. If reciprocity, practice primacy, or upaya, skillful means, are in force, doctrinal plurality and pedagogical adaptation are expected, which is precisely the translation layer picture. Both alignments are structural rather than historical. 8.7.4 remarks. Remark 8.10. Textual anchors for the structural definitions. The definitions above are role-based abstractions, but they track well-known textual motifs. And nondual and ineffability motifs are prominent in Upanishtadic and Advaita contexts, for example, the neti-neti pattern, and in Taoist formulations of ineffability, Upanishads. 1965, Laozi 1972, Zolta 2026J, Zolta 2000 and 26 degrees Celsius. A reciprocity and devotional plurality appear in prominent strands of Hindu theistic literature, including passages commonly cited as permitting multiple forms of approach. Bhagavad Gita. 1972, Flood 1996. Practice first and caution against doctrinal fixation is standard in many Buddhist presentations, including canonical discourse emphasizing evidential and ethical testing rather than blind assent. P. Ali. Canon 2012, Bhikkhu 1994b, Zolta 2026 billions. The formal results do not depend on any single translation. The structure is what matters. Remark 8.11, Scope. Theorem 8.8 is conditional. It does not claim that every tradition labeled Eastern or mystical satisfies the antecedent conditions. It claims that whenever a non-dual ultimate model does satisfy those structural conditions, the model does not rescue the God-no-God frame as a fundamental metaphysical fork. Control overlays the map disguised as the territory. Religious systems are never only metaphysical positions. They are also lived institutions. They operate as schools, courts, kinship networks, identity regimes, moral pedagogies, and collective memory machines. Any serious analysis of the God topic has to address this layer directly, because it is where doctrine becomes practice, where ultimates become incentives, and where translation layer structures acquire the psychological and social force of reality itself. This chapter isolates a phenomenon I flagged earlier as the control overlay problem. The problem is not that religions control people in a cartoon sense. The problem is structural. When a translation layer is treated as the territory, the map tends to acquire enforcement mechanisms that make it feel compulsory. Once ultimate stakes are attached to compliance, the map becomes a governance device. This is how a finite human-mediated symbolic system can take on the posture of an absolute, non-negotiable authority. The map territory framing is classical in form and is often associated with Korzybski's General Semantics, Korzybski. 1933. I will proceed with a disciplined posture. I will not claim that religion is reducible to control. Classical sociology supplies a better baseline. Religions function as meaning-making and cohesion-making systems that coordinate groups and stabilize expectations. Durkheim, 1995. Weber, 1978. Geertz, 1973. Berger, 1967. I will also not claim that leaders or communities are necessarily engaged in conscious manipulation. Institutional dynamics rarely require conspiracy. Selection pressures, competition for attention, status mechanisms, and boundary maintenance can generate stable patterns without centralized intent. Weber. 1978, Foucault, 1977. The claim of this chapter is narrower and more precise. Given the human interface thesis constraints, given salvation-gated structures, and given the unobservability of ultimate outcomes, there is a predictable drift toward proxies, gatekeeping, and threat architectures. That drift is what I call an overlay. 9.1 What a control overlay is and is not. 2 interpretive errors dominate public discussion. The first error is naive innocence. It assumes that because many believers are sincere and morally serious, the institutional layer must be epistemically innocent. That does not follow. Sincerity and structure are orthogonal. A sincere community can still enforce non-truth tracking rules if those rules function as identity boundaries or coordination mechanisms. The second error is cynical reductionism. It assumes that because religions can function as power systems, they must therefore be nothing but power systems. That also does not follow. Humans use symbolic systems to survive, coordinate, mourn, celebrate, and transmit moral orientation. Religion can be a genuine response to existential pressure, while also being an institutional machine that generates overlays. To keep analysis stable, I will name the phenomenon in ordinary language. By control overlay, I mean an institutional layer of practices, roles, sanctions, and identity boundaries that attaches compulsory force to a translation layer. It is the layer that makes the map feel like the territory in lived governance. A control overlay is not defined by malice. It is defined by function. It makes adherence measurable. It makes deviance costly. It stabilizes group identity. A common subset of overlays is what I will call compliance technology. This is the cluster of rule types and practice types whose primary institutional role is to make compliance legible and enforceable. Highly observable rituals, purity codes, regulated sexuality, regulated dress, mandated attendance, confession-like mechanisms, and hierarchical adjudication are standard examples. These elements can carry genuine meaning for participants. The structural point is that they also solve a governance problem. 9.2% unobservability and proxy metrics. Salvation claims and metaphysical claims share a crucial feature. Their decisive outcomes are not empirically inspectable in ordinary life. If a tradition teaches an afterlife, cosmic judgment, rebirth conditions, or liberation states, those states are not publicly testable, in the same way that ordinary claims about weather, medicine, or engineering are testable. This does not immediately refute such claims. It does, however, create a predictable incentive gradient inside institutions. If ultimate outcomes cannot be audited directly, institutions that claim access to those outcomes must regulate inputs that are visible. They must generate proxy-metric proxies. This yields a simple mechanism. Unobservable ultimacy pushes control toward observable behavior. This mechanism is cross-traditional. One can see it whenever ultimate standing is said to depend on membership, belief, or obedience, while the outcome remains inaccessible. Institu, shunal enforcement then shifts from outcomes to signals. 3 illustrative clusters are enough to show the pattern. First, boundary entry acts. Initiation is made legible through boundary ritual events such as baptism, circumcision, conversion declarations, initiation vows, or formal enrollment under an authorized lineage. These practices can be spiritually meaningful. They are also institutionally efficient. They create a publicly recognizable threshold between insider and outsider. Ritual theory and practice theory clarify why such thresholds are stable social technologies. V. Turner, 1969, Bell, 1992. Second, repeatable routine practices. Fasting calendars, mandated gatherings, prescribed recitations, and other high-frequency rituals create visible patterns that can be monitored. When an institution needs a legible measure of adherence, frequency, and visibility are functional advantages. Third, costly commitment signals. When adherence is costly in time, money, or social opportunity, the costs reduce free riding and increase within-group predictability. This is one reason costly ritual commitment recurs, even when the metaphysical content diverges across traditions. Sosis and Alcorta, 2003, Iannacco, 1994. The logical relevance for this book is not moral. It is epistemic. Once proxy metrics are installed, it becomes easy for the proxy to become psychologically primary. A visible ritual becomes confused with invisible salvation. A boundary marker becomes confused with moral worth. This is one meaning of the map pretending to be the territory. 9.3 Purity systems and compliance markers. Purity systems appear across traditions in domains such as food, sex, dress, and taboo. They are not arbitrary accidentals. They are especially efficient compliance markers because they satisfy a predictable set of properties. Mary Douglas remains a canonical analysis of why purity and danger frameworks generate stable classifications and boundary anxieties. Douglas. 1966. First, purity systems are high-frequency. Eating, sex, and dress are daily or near-daily domains. High frequency produces continuous reinforcement. Second, purity systems are publicly legible. Even when private, they are often socially inferable. People notice clothing, marriage patterns, dating norms, consumption restrictions, and association patterns. Third, purity systems are identity-binding. They make group membership visible to self and other. A purity code is a portable boundary. Fourth, purity systems are high salience. Violations trigger disgust, shame, and moral panic. That psychological profile increases enforcement without requiring constant external policing. This is why purity systems recur across divergent religions. One does not need to posit that ultimacy has deep metaphysical concern with textile blends, food preparation methods, or hand positions in prayer. It is enough to see that purity systems are stable identity technologies. They shape a person's day, social circles, dating pool, and family ties. They bind the self to the institution. A useful analytic distinction in this context is between moral norms that track harms and flourishing, and boundary norms that track membership maintenance. Many traditions contain both. The control overlay problem arises when boundary norms are elevated to the status of cosmic ultimates. At that point, the institution gains a strong lever. Compliance becomes existentially loaded. In this chapter, I will use the term compliance marker for any observable practice, abstention, or display that is treated as evidence of belonging and is used to enforce conformity, especially under salvation-gated or ultimacy claim structures. Purity systems provide dense compliance markers. They also provide dense opportunities for policing. 9.4% authority stacking and interpretive gatekeeping. The institutional response to interpretive complexity is rarely flat. It tends to form an authority stacking structure. Priests, imams, pastors, rabbis, monks, gurus, and other authorized roles function as adjudicators and gatekeepers. Weber. 1978, Bourdieu, 1991. This is not a moral accusation. It is a predictable response to the human interface thesis. Earlier chapters established that revelation is filtered through human language and social transmission. That means texts are ambiguous, multi-layered, and historically situated. Ambiguity generates interpretive competition. Interpretive competition creates institutional demand for adjudication. Adjudication creates roles. Weber's analysis of authority types and institutional rationalization helps explain why interpretive authority tends to stabilize as office, tradition, or charisma. Weber. 1978, Bourdieu's analysis of symbolic power helps explain why authorized interpreters can convert interpretive control into social capital. Bourdieu. 1991, Foucault's analysis of discipline and normalization helps explain why compliance is often internalized rather than continuously coerced. Foucault. The gatekeeping mechanism is straightforward. If a tradition makes claims about ultimacy while admitting that ordinary readers disagree about meaning, then an institution that wants stability must answer questions such as who is authorized to interpret, which interpretations count as orthodox, which disagreements are permitted, which deviations are punished. Orthodoxy is not only a content claim, it is an administrative problem. This is where orthodoxy policing emerges. Creeds, councils, responsa traditions, doctrinal courts, inquisition-like procedures, and formal shunning or excommunication practices are institutional forms of the same structural function. They reduce interpretive entropy. They do so by converting interpretive disagreement into social cost. Authority stacking also changes the epistemic posture of the believer. Under authority stacking, the believer is not simply responding to existential ground and conscience. The believer is responding to a hierarchy that claims to represent ultimacy. The map is now guarded. This produces an important tension with the Steelman hermeneutic and the apophatic move analyzed earlier. The more a tradition is pushed toward abstraction, contextualization, and ineffability, the less concrete control content remains. A pure apophatic ultimate is not an efficient governance tool. It does not dictate dress codes, diet codes, or institutional revenue with mechanical clarity. Therefore, there is institutional pressure to keep the concrete layer intact even while endorsing sophisticated theology at the academic edge. 9.5 Threat architecture. The enforcement spine of an overlay is a threat architecture. Foucault. 1977, Norenzayan 2013. Threat architecture attaches emotional cost to deviance and moral cost to dissent. It does this by binding multiple threat types together. Metaphysical threat is fear of cosmic punishment. exclusion from salvation or negative rebirth conditions. Social threat is exclusion from community, family rupture, stigma, and loss of status. Goffman. 1963, psychological threat is guilt, shame, and fear of being unclean or rebellious. A threat architecture is efficient when it stacks these two together. Metaphysical threat amplifies social threat. Social threat amplifies psychological threat. The result is an internalized enforcement loop. A disciplined analysis must admit a difficult fact. Threat architectures are often effective at producing behavioral conformity. They can also produce pathological outcomes, including anxiety, scrupulosity, moral outsourcing, and epistemic paralysis. The moral critique is not required for the logical critique. The logical critique predicts why threats are stable tools. When a soteriological criterion is belief-gated, threats also target cognition. They target doubt. This is institutionally rational. If doubt is allowed to spread without consequence, belief gating collapses under the fairness and involuntarism pressure developed earlier. Systems that rely on belief gating, therefore, tend to generate meta-norms against doubt, inquiry, and contact with rival views. This is a boundary maintenance adaptation, even when it is epistemically costly. 9.6 In-group and out-group sacralization. The in-group-out-group distinction is a universal group structure. The question is how it becomes sacralized. A translation layer is a narrative and symbolic encoding of ultimacy and moral order. As soon as that encoding becomes central to identity, it becomes a boundary. As soon as it becomes a boundary, the group divides into insiders and outsiders. Durkheim's account of the sacred and the profane is a classical analysis of how boundary making becomes morally charged. Durkheim. 1995, Geertz's account of religion as a symbol system adds how those boundaries are interpreted as world descriptions, not mere conventions. Geertz. 1973. This matters for the overall thesis of this book because it shows why the God debate is socially sticky, even when it is conceptually unstable. The theism versus atheism frame is not only a metaphysical dispute, it is often a membership dispute. When a claim functions as a membership boundary, it becomes insulated from ordinary evidential revision. That insulation is not always conscious. It is structurally maintained by social costs. The most important consequence for this project is the one developed earlier. The fairness clause and doxastic involuntarism undermine the moral legitimacy of condemning outsiders for non-belief. An institution that treats boundary maintenance as existentially required will resist that erosion. It will reinterpret, special plead, intensify threats, or relocate criteria. The overlay fights back. 9.7 Economic persistence. Institutions require resources. Buildings, clergy, schools, media, and social services have material cost. Therefore, any stable religious institution must solve a resource problem. Weber. 1930, Weber 1978. This can be morally benign. Many communities use donations to provide real goods. The structural point is that when a translation layer is treated as territory, funding can become sacralized. Revenue streams become holy obligations. Dissent becomes not merely disagreement, but threat to the moral world. Weber's analysis of institutional rationalization and the economic dimensions of religious life is relevant here. Weber. 1930, Weber 1978. The pattern is stable across time. The more it develops specialized roles, formalized fundraising, and political alliances. This does not imply moral corruption. It implies institutional selection. The overlay problem emerges when economic persistence mechanisms are merged with ultimacy claims. Once cosmic stakes are attached to giving, the map has become a coercive territory substitute. 9.8 Exclusivism and strictness. Exclusivism is not only a doctrinal stance, it is also a functional technology. The relevant question is why exclusivism is stable under selection pressures. Norenzayan. 2013-1994. Exclusivism, clear boundaries reduce free riding. Clear boundaries increase with in-group trust. Clear boundaries improve recruitment clarity because the group can say what it is and what it requires. Clear boundaries also increase retention by raising the cost of exit, especially when exit is paired with social rupture or metaphysical threat. Iana Cohn. 1994, this is not an exotic hypothesis. It aligns with multiple strands of work in the social science of religion, including costly commitment models and the role of moralizing supernatural monitoring in cooperation. Norenzayan. 2013, Atran 2002, Boyer 2001, Sosis and Alcorta 2003. This project does not require committing to any one evolutionary story. The narrower reason to cite these literatures is that they make the institutional drift toward exclusivism intelligible without appealing to divine preference or divine cruelty. Exclusivism can arise because it solves human coordination problems. The problem for my thesis is that once exclusivism is installed, it collides with the fairness logic. The system faces a dilemma. Either it relaxes exclusivism in a way consistent with access and capacity. In that case, salvation gating loses much of its boundary function and collapses toward conscience and existential ground. Or it retains strict belief-gated boundaries. In that case, it must accept moral arbitrariness or intensify overlay mechanisms to preserve compliance. This is one place where the broader thesis of this book becomes visible. The drift toward sophisticated theology and fairness is a drift toward existential ground. The drift toward institutional survival is a drift toward overlays. Traditions tend to contain both. The tension is not accidental. 9.9 Why the smartest reading is not the institutional default. Earlier chapters treated the Steelman hermeneutic as a serious move. It pushes traditions away from literalism and toward abstraction, contextualization, and apophatic constraint. But the institutional layer is not built to live inside ineffability. A fully apophatic ultimate does not produce a detailed compliance ledger. It does not specify diet codes, dress codes, or sexual codes with the same mechanical clarity. It does not generate a clear method for identifying insiders and outsiders. It also undermines threat architectures, because if ultimacy is beyond predicate and beyond human moral comprehension, then the content of specific commands becomes negotiable, and the fairness principle becomes difficult to deny. Institutional systems therefore often compartmentalize. High theology may be tolerated in scholarship and mysticism, while governance remains concrete. Weber. 1978, Berger, 1967. A scholar may say God is beyond being while the community is still organized around a concrete rule set. This is a stable equilibrium. The institution gains intellectual prestige while retaining enforcement capacity. This is another instance of the map pretending to be territory. A tradition can endorse ineffability at the top while enforcing legible obedience at the bottom. The bottom layer is what shapes most lives. The top layer supplies metaphysical cover. 9.10 What survives the overlay. This chapter does not conclude that religion is fraudulent. It concludes that the institutional layer has predictable incentive, gradients that can distort the epistemic meaning of religion. A translation layer can carry real existential insight, while also being wrapped in overlay mechanisms that are not truth-tracking. Distinguishing the two is part of dissolving the God-no-God frame. It is also part of recovering the deeper ground that this book has defended from the beginning. There is existential ground. There are finite agents operating inside the human interface thesis. There is moral reality as lived consequence, not as a mere label imposed by a sacred bureaucracy. There is the persistent fact that proxy markers are not the thing they claim to measure. If a reader takes only one operational lesson from this chapter, it should be this. Whenever ultimacy is unobservable, and the institution claims exclusive access, it is rational to expect overlays. It is rational to look for proxy metrics. It is rational to look for authority stacking. It is rational to look for threat architectures. Seeing these layers does not entail contempt. It entails clarity about what is human, what is institutional, and what is being mistaken for metaphysical necessity. Formal definitions, and the corresponding structural results, are stated in the appendix for this chapter 9, Control Overlays. 9.11 To be compatible with the book's standing orientation, want and available to a community, is mediated through finite interpretive practices and finite institutional procedures. 2. The translation layer orientation. Religious and ideological systems function as maps of experience. They can be meaningful and socially effective without being identical to the territory. 3. The book's earlier collapse results. Ultimacy cannot be operationally packaged as a separable, institutionally verifiable object without introducing finite proxies and enforcement structures. No psychological claims are required. The results below are structural and hold even when all actors are sincere. 9.11.2 Definitions. Definition 9.1 Observable and unobservable predicates. Let it be a set of agents. Let sigma be a set of publicly observable signals, where sigma denotes the observable record of agent A, actions, utterances, ritual participation, affiliations, artifacts, and other public traces. A predicate P, A, 0, 1 is publicly decidable, relative to sigma, if there exists a procedure D, sigma, 0, 1 such that D, sigma, A, equal to P, A for all A. If no such D exists, then P is unobservable, relative to sigma. Definition 9.2 Proxy metric. Let P, A, 0, 1 be unobservable, relative to sigma. A proxy metric for P is any function, M, sigma. M into some set M, typically ordered or graded, that is used as an input to institutional decisions that purport to track P. Definition 9.3 Compliance marker. Let P, A, 0, 1 be an unobservable predicate, and let M be a proxy metric for P. A compliance marker is a publicly observable token or pattern, kappa sigma, such that within an institution, observing kappa is treated as presumptive evidence for PA equal to 1, or for a sufficiently high proxy value M, kappa. A compliance marker can be linguistic, confessional utterances, behavioral, ritual performance, material, dress codes, or relational membership attendance association. Definition 9.4 Authority stacking. Let J be a set of justificatory sources available within a system, texts, offices, traditions, charismatic claims, councils, courts, lineages, and similar. An authority stacking is a finite sequence, J0. Jn, with each Gj such that the legitimacy of G1 is asserted to depend on G, and Jn is treated as non-appealable within the system. The defining feature is not the length of the chain, but the role it plays. It terminates contestation of a lower-level decision by invoking a higher level whose review is not, in practice, open to the governed parties. Definition 9.5 Threat architecture. A threat architecture is a tuple, RSE, where 1. R is a set of promised rewards, 2. S is a set of threatened sanctions, 3. E is an enforcement rule that maps observable records to applications of R or S, or to intermediate statuses that reliably alter access to R and S. The sanctions and rewards can be otherworldly, thisworldly, social, legal, reputational, economic, or psychological. The defining feature is that E makes the system behaviorally consequential. Definition 9.6 Control overlay. A control overlay is an interpretive normative system O that satisfies all of the following conditions. 1. Ultimacy claim. O asserts that its central categories track an ultimate domain, final meaning, cosmic order, salvation, ultimate standing, and that inclusion or exclusion relative to this domain is decisive. 2. Unobservable inclusion predicate. The decisive predicate P that marks inclusion in the ultimate domain is unobservable in the sense of definition 9.1. 3. Proxy governance. Because P is unobservable, O governs through at least one proxy metric M and at least one compliance marker kappa that are treated as evidence of P4. Authority protection. Interpretive control over M and kappa is stabilized by authority stacking so that challenges to the proxy regime are treated as challenges to the highest source of legitimacy. 5. Enforcement. Compliance and conformity are stabilized by a threat architecture. A control overlay is defined by function rather than intent. Malice is not required. 9.11 3 lemmas. Lemma 9.7. Unobservability implies proxy metrics. Let A be a set of agents with observable records, sigma, A sigma. Let P, A, 0, 1 be unobservable relative to sigma. Suppose an institution issues decisions about agents by a rule P, sigma. D. For some decision set D, and that the institution asserts that PI tracks P, for example, by claiming that PI, sigma, A, reflects whether PA equal to 1, then the institution must, in fact, be operating through at least one proxy metric M for P proof. By hypothesis, the institution's decision procedure PI takes as input only S, A, SE, and produces an output in D. Since P is unobservable, there is no publicly decidable procedure that computes P, A, from S, A without remainder. Nevertheless, any operational attempt to track P must be realized as some function of observable records. Define. M equal to pi, then M, sigma. D is a function from observable records to a codomain used to act as if P were being tracked. By definition 9.2, M is a proxy metric for P. If the institution uses intermediate summaries, scores, checklists, ritual completions, confessional formulas, those are also proxy metrics. At minimum, the decision rule itself is a proxy in the operational sense. Lemma 9.8. Proxy metrics induce interpretive gatekeeping and authority stacking. Let P be unobservable, and let M be a proxy metric used to govern inclusion claims about P assume. 1. The system treats inclusion relative to P as high stakes, decisive standing, salvation, ultimate legitimacy, or equivalent. 2. There exist multiple agents or subgroups capable of proposing rival proxy interpretations, distinct criteria, rival markers, rival thresholds, rival readings of what counts. 3. The institution aims at stable coordination rather than indefinite fragmentation. Then stabilizing the proxy regime requires an authority mechanism that functions as authority stacking. Proof. Because P is unobservable, M cannot be uniquely validated by a publicly decidable test that forces convergence. Under the stated assumptions, rival proposals for what should count as adequate evidence for P are predictable. This is not a claim about bad faith. It is a claim about underdetermination. Observable records generally permit multiple consistent interpretations when the target predicate is internal or metaphysical. If the institution seeks stable coordination, it must specify which proxy interpretation is binding. That specification requires adjudication of disputes about M and about the status of particular compliance markers kappa. Adjudication is itself a decision, and therefore requires a legitimating basis that is treated as higher than the disputant's competing claims. A sequence of justificatory sources, J0, Jn, that terminates dispute by appeal to a non-appealable Jn is by definition 9.4 authority stacking. Hence an authority stacking mechanism is required to stabilize the proxy regime under the given assumptions. Lemma 9.9 authority stacking yields threat architecture. Let a system employ authority stacking to stabilize decisions about M and kappa for an unobservable. Assume the system aims to produce behavioral compliance with its proxy regime across a population that includes non-trivial disagreement, defections, or competing incentives. Then the system must implement a threat architecture. Proof. Authority stacking alone does not alter incentives. It specifies that certain interpretations and decisions are treated as binding, but without consequences. Bindingness is merely declarative. Under the assumption of non-trivial disagreement or competing incentives, at least some agents will deviate from prescribed markers or will contest proxy interpretations. If deviations have no reliable cost and compliance has no reliable benefit, the proxy regime cannot be behaviorally stabilized at scale. Therefore, in order to produce compliance, the system must attach rewards and sanctions to the observable markers and proxy outputs, and must implement an enforcement rule that maps observable records to those outcomes. This is precisely a threat architecture by definition 9.5. 9.11.4 theorem and corollary. Theorem 9.10 control overlay theorem, let O be an interpretive normative system that 1. Makes an ultimacy claim about decisive standing, and 2. Conditions inclusion in that standing on a predicate P that is unobservable relative to public records. If O is institutionally implemented in a way that coordinates behavior across a population, then O necessarily produces proxy governance via proxy metric and compliance marker, authority protection via authority stacking, and enforcement via threat architecture. In this operational sense, O functions as a control overlay. Proof. Assume O is institutionally implemented to coordinate behavior across a population, while inclusion is conditioned on an unobservable predicate P. By Lemma 9.7, any institutional attempt to govern or decide inclusion claims about P must operate through at least one proxy metric M. In practice, this includes compliance markers kappa treated as evidence for inclusion. Given high stakes and the ordinary availability of rival interpretations in a population, stabilizing such a proxy regime requires an authority mechanism that terminates contestation. By Lemma 9.8, this takes the form of authority stacking. Finally, because the proxy regime is meant to coordinate behavior across disagreement and competing incentives, the system must attach consequences to compliance and deviation. By Lemma 9 and 9, this yields a threat architecture. Thus, the operational conditions of definition 9.6 are satisfied. Therefore, O functions as a control overlay. Corollary 9.11. Map territory preservation. Any framework that I. Treats ultimacy as not institutionally decidable in the sense of definition 9.1, and second, treats interpretive systems as finite maps rather than as the territory itself, blocks the central move that turns a translation layer into a control overlay. In particular, Under such a framework, proxy metric and compliance marker remain social tools rather than ultimate facts, and the conflation of compliance with ultimacy is diagnostically available as a category mistake. Proof. If ultimacy is treated as unobservable and not institutionally decidable, then proxy governance cannot be granted ultimate standing. Proxies can still exist as social conventions, but their outputs cannot be treated as equivalences for the unobservable target predicate. If interpretive systems are treated as maps rather than territory, then the system's own symbolic tokens are not permitted to self-certify their ultimacy claim. The move that defines a control overlay is precisely the elevation of proxy markers into ultimate categories, combined with authority protection and enforcement. Denying the legitimacy of that elevation blocks the formation of a control overlay in the strong sense of definition 9.6. Therefore, the map-territory distinction is preserved, and the proxy regime is recognized as finite, contingent, and revisable, rather than absolute. Remark 9.12. The theorem identifies a mechanism, not a moral diagnosis. Control overlays can be implemented by sincere agents and can arise in non-religious contexts, states, parties, movements, corporate cultures, whenever unobservable standing is governed through public proxies under high stakes. Chapter 10. Beyond the God-No-God frame. The opening claim of this book was that the God debate is usually staged in the wrong key. Theism and atheism are treated as rival answers to the same well-formed question, as if the main work were deciding which camp to join. My argument has been that this is a category mistake in the literal sense. It treats God as though it names a stable kind of object, available for ordinary affirmation or denial. Under the finite mind constraints that govern all meaningful assertion, that assumption does not survive contact with careful analysis. What I have tried to do here is not to insult religion, nor to reduce it to ignorance, nor to write a demolition tract. This book is an attempt to identify what must be true of any God concept that a finite mind can meaningfully assert, and then to follow those constraints wherever they lead. What follows is the closing synthesis. It recaps what was dismantled, what remains, and what I take existential logicism to replace the old frame with. 10.1% what died and what did not. The first thing to say plainly is that nothing mystical has to happen for this project to succeed. No new cosmic picture needs to be invented. When the God-No-God frame collapses, the world does not. There is no new ontology that replaces the old one by decree. There is only a return to what was already carrying the entire conversation. This is why the word dismantling can be misleading if it is heard as a cultural posture. The dismantling here is conceptual. It targets a specific structure, the attempt to treat God as a separable ultimate preference-bearing agent, who stands in a relation to the world analogous to how finite persons stand in relation to local facts. That structure is forced to fail for two reasons that repeat in different clothing throughout the chapters. 1. Ultimacy cannot be stably modeled as an external agent without importing finitude. A preference-bearing person is a structured being, and structure is limitation. 2. Ultimacy cannot be coherently modeled as a separable object without collapsing into totality. If it is genuinely unlimited, it is not one thing among others. It is either identical with total existence or it is not ultimate. Once this is clear, God becomes less like a disputed entity and more like a word that performs several distinct functions. Sometimes it is an agent hypothesis. Sometimes it is a symbolic anchor. Sometimes it is a moral proxy. Sometimes it is a communal identity marker. Sometimes it is the name a tradition gives to the brute fact that existence obtains. These uses can be psychologically powerful and socially central. But the power and centrality do not convert them into a single metaphysical kind. So what died is a particular metaphysical role. God as a separable, decisive answer to the question what ultimately exists and who ultimately judges. What did not die is everything that motivated the use of that role. Awe, gratitude, fear, moral urgency, and the demand for meaning. Those pressures are real. They do not disappear when a concept fails. What changes is where they are permitted to point. 10.2. The shared flaw, existence, finitude, and interpretation. A reader can now see why the initial move mattered. Before anyone can meaningfully affirm or deny God, the agent doing the affirming is already standing inside existence. The conversation happens within what is. That is not a triviality. It means the deepest asymmetry between believer and non-believer is not metaphysical access to a hidden object. It is interpretive posture toward what is already common. 3 constraints form the spine of the book. 10.2.1 Existence is not optional. This is the existential ground of L. Any attempt to deny existence in the relevant sense is self-undermining because the denial is itself an occurrence. This does not decide physics. It does not privilege materialism. It simply establishes the non-negotiable background something is happening. All further metaphysical proposals are downstream of that. 10.2.2 Finite minds do not get to speak in infinite registers without paying a price. The finite mind is not a scandal. It is the condition of having any content at all. Every representation of finite mind forms is built out of finite materials. This is true even when the mind speaks the language of infinitude. A tradition can call God infinite, absolute, and beyond comprehension. Those words have a role. But they do not magically grant a finite mind an actual infinite object. They indicate a limit, a boundary where ordinary predication fails, where language shifts into a different function. Chapters 6 through 8 argue that the smartest readings of many traditions drift toward this apophatic boundary. The drift is not a coincidence. It is a forced response to the instability of preference talk and agency talk at the level of ultimacy. 10.2.3 There is no revelation bypass around the human interface. The human interface thesis mattered because it blocks a common escape route. When a religion encounters internal strain, it often appeals to special access, revelation, miracle, or privileged mediation. But even if such access occurred, it would still be received, transmitted, and stabilized through finite human channels, testimony, language, canon formation, interpretation, and institutional selection. That is not a cynical point. It is simply the structure of any information that enters communal life. The conclusion is not, there is no truth. The conclusion is that the truth conditions of religious claims do not float above the same epistemic constraints that govern everything else. A system that demands assent as the gate to ultimate outcome cannot avoid the fact that assent itself is produced within finite cognitive and social systems. That fact becomes decisive when combined with the fairness clauses found across traditions. 10.3 The fairness clauses were not a side issue. The mid-book analysis of ignorance exceptions is not a rhetorical trick. It is an internal inconsistency pressure test. Many major traditions contain some version of a moral intuition that is difficult to dislodge. A just ultimate order cannot condemn agents for conditions outside their control. These clauses appear in different forms. Sometimes they are explicit, ignorance excuses. Sometimes they are implicit, God judges the heart. Sometimes they are distributed across doctrinal disputes about infants, the unevangelized, the mentally impaired, and the invincibly ignorant. In chapters 3 and 4, I argued that once a tradition introduces these exceptions, it has already conceded the deeper principle that does the real work. The deeper principle is not belief, is required, it is closer to this. Responsibility tracks control, and ultimate evaluation must be sensitive to circumstance and cognitive capacity. Once that principle is admitted, the exclusivist, belief-gated structure becomes unstable. The distinction between never heard and heard, but could not sincerely assent, is not morally foundational. In both cases, the person is being measured by an outcome their epistemic situation did not reliably allow. The tradition can try to preserve the gate by narrowing what counts as sincere or culpable, but the drift is predictable. The gate becomes less about truth and more about belonging. This matters for the conclusion because it shows that even within belief systems, the deepest moral intuitions already point away from the God-no-God binary. A person can be morally serious, spiritually sensitive, and intellectually honest without being able to affirm the specific overlays of a tradition. The tradition often knows this, because it builds exceptions that admit it. The exceptions are admissions that moral reality is not cleanly captured by doctrinal assent. 10.4 Religions as translation layers, and why this is not an insult. At the scale of history, religions behave less like competing scientific theories and more like translation regimes. They take recurring existential pressures and render them into stories, rituals, metaphors, and moral architectures that fit a community. This does not mean the content is worthless, it means the content is a map. The translation layer model has two implications that the conclusion needs. First, it explains why religions can be spiritually effective while being mutually incompatible in metaphysical detail. If a tradition were a direct, unfiltered report of a single ultimate speaker, one would not expect deep doctrinal divergence to correlate so strongly with geography, language, and polity. If a tradition is a translation layer, divergence is expected. Convergence is expected too, but at the level of existential themes, mortality, guilt, forgiveness, gratitude, or suffering, communal cohesion. Second, it explains why the strongest philosophical moves inside religion often look like retreats. When a tradition confronts contradiction, it can retreat into apophatic language. It can reinterpret God as ground, not agent. It can claim the ultimate is beyond predication. From the inside, this looks like sophistication. From the structural perspective of EL, it is what happens when a map is forced to admit that it is a map. The key point is, the translation layer language is compatible with reverence. The mistake is treating the translation as if it were the territory. The philosophical work of the book has been to draw a clean boundary between legitimate translation and illegitimate ultimacy claims. A tradition can hold practices and symbols as meaningful without granting them metaphysical authority over reality. 10.5 The deepest reversal, not have more theists did. Here is the claim I want the conclusion to make as sharply as possible. The theist posture is often organized around a felt asymmetry. Believers have God, non-believers do not. The believer has something added, a metaphysical supplement. The non-believer is missing it. Under the analysis of this book, that asymmetry is false in both directions. 10.5.1 If God names total reality, nobody lacks it. If God is taken in the strongest possible sense, as ultimacy, then God cannot be one object among others. Ultimacy is not a resident of the world. It is the condition that the world is at all. In that case, God exists, becomes a reformulation of existence, obtains. That can be a legitimate religious posture. It resembles some forms of negative theology and some forms of non-dual metaphysics. But it cannot support the old asymmetry. No finite agent stands outside existence. No one is missing ultimacy. In this register, the believer cannot claim to possess a metaphysical surplus that the atheist lacks. The most that can be claimed is a difference in language and interpretation. 10.52 If God names a person with preferences, then God is a finite overlay. If God is modeled as a personal agent who prefers, commands, reacts, punishes, and rewards, then God is being represented in the same category as finite persons. But personal agency has a structure. Structure implies limits, a preference space, a ranking of outcomes, a relation to alternatives, and therefore a standpoint. This is not a moral critique of personhood. It is a conceptual fact about what the word means. In that case, the believer is not adding a metaphysical surplus. The believer is imposing an overlay. The overlay can be emotionally comforting and socially stabilizing. It can also be morally energizing, but it is not reality itself. It is a finite picture placed between the mind and the cosmos. This is the reversal the conclusion must insist on. A finite God image is not more than reality. It is less. It is a reduction of the territory to a bounded portrait. It is a narrowing of what can be seen and what can be questioned. So the asymmetry flips. The believer does not have something the non-believer lacks. The believer has a filter. In the strongest form of the claim, it is a filter that demands epistemic closure in exchange for psychological security. 10.5.3. The atheist posture often remained trapped in the same frame. It is not enough to say theists are wrong that would still accept the frame. A large portion of modern atheism is a negative stance within a religiously inherited conceptual space. It expends energy denying a particular God model. It can be correct in its denial and still miss the deeper point. If the God-no-God question is a bad frame, then a purely negative answer does not finish the job. It corrects a local error, but preserves the category. It still treats God as though it were the kind of thing one might discover or refute in the same way as any other object. This is why I have described L's posture as a kind of exit from the binary, not a more aggressive commitment to one side. The aim is not to convert theist to atheist. The aim is to make both labels less central. The question is relocated from "is there a God?" to what can a finite mind coherently mean by ultimacy, and what follows for how one should live. 10.6. What L replaces the God category with. If the goal is not to delete meaning but to clean it, then the book must leave something substantive standing. This is where L matters. Existential logicism is not nihilism. It is a discipline of constraint. Start with what cannot be coherently denied, refuse contradiction and brute regress, and build only what can be stably grounded. The replacement is not a competing mythology. It is a set of commitments that can be held without pretending to possess what finite minds cannot possess. 10.6.1. Existential ground. As the ultimate common reference. The first replacement is the simplest, existence itself as the shared condition of all experience and all inquiry. This is not a God. It is not an agent. It is not a personality. It is the ground that makes all talk possible. Naming this ground does not solve every question. It relocates questions into honest form. Instead of asking for a cosmic ruler to stop regress, the work becomes understanding how explanation, necessity, and contingency actually function within the world that is given. 10.6.2. Interpretive honesty about maps and overlays. The second replacement is methodological. A map can be useful without being mistaken for the territory. This is not merely a slogan. It is the difference between symbolic meaning and metaphysical coercion. A tradition can preserve ritual, prayer, and ethical formation as practices that shape attention and behavior. But once the metaphysical claims are treated as translation rather than literal reportage, the tradition loses the right to demand closure on inquiry. It becomes one meaning practice among others, accountable to ordinary standards of coherence and moral seriousness. 10.6.3. Moral reality without belief gates. The third replacement is moral realism without metaphysical blackmail. The fairness clauses were signals that many traditions already recognize the deeper principle: moral evaluation tracks control and circumstance. L makes that principle explicit and removes the need to root it through a cosmic gatekeeper. Moral reality persists because it is lived. Actions have consequences. Suffering is not an illusion. Care is not a superstition. The fact that no ultimate agent is available as a punitive accountant does not remove moral weight. It removes a proxy. What replaces the proxy is direct responsibility, a sober recognition that finite agents are embedded in a causal and social world, and that moral formation is not outsourced to a metaphysical tribunal. 10.6.4% reverence without a face. The fourth replacement is existential, not doctrinal. The religious impulse often tries to personify the whole in order to make the whole addressable. This is psychologically intelligible. It is also, in many cases, a contraction of wonder into familiarity. L points in the opposite direction. It treats the cosmos as larger than any face that can be painted onto it. It insists that the unknown remains unknown. It permits reverence without pretending that reverence is information. It permits awe without converting awe into a personality claim. This is where the alleged deprivation becomes an expansion. If reality is larger than any God image, then relinquishing the image is not losing reality. It is losing a small substitute that was offered in reality's place. 10.7%. The practical meaning of no blinders. The language of blinders can sound polemical if it is used carelessly. So I will state the practical claim as neutrally as possible. An overlay becomes a blinder when it does three things. 1. It assigns ultimate authority to a finite proxy. 2. It treats dissent as moral defect rather than epistemic difference. 3. It closes inquiry by declaring the central question answered in advance. Those mechanisms are not unique to religion. They are general features of human institutions. The last chapter made the point with the language of proxy metrics, authority stacking, and threat architecture, because those are the predictable tools that arise when a system needs compliance under conditions of unobservability. The conclusion does not need to repeat the sociology. It needs to state the existential upshot. When ultimacy is unobservable, the honest posture is epistemic humility. If an institution cannot survive humility, it will try to replace humility with proxies. The proxies can be doctrines, rituals, purity rules, identity markers, and loyalty tests. Once a proxy becomes the gate, a human being's relation to reality is mediated by the proxy. The L posture rejects that mediation as a matter of principle. It insists on direct contact with the world as it is, as far as finite minds can reach it. It does not claim omniscience. It claims honesty about the boundaries of assertion. This is why the theist's imagined advantage cannot hold. If the alleged advantage consists in possessing a finite proxy treated as ultimate, then it is not an advantage in contact with reality. It is an advantage in closure and certainty, purchased at the price of narrowing. The cosmos becomes smaller so that it can be governed by a familiar story. 10.8. A final synthesis. If the chapters did their work, the conclusion can be compressed into a small set of stable claims. 1. The God-no-God binary is a bad frame for ultimacy. 2. Finite minds can construct only finite God images. When those images are treated as ultimate, they become conceptual and moral liabilities. 3. When God is refined toward genuine ultimacy, it collapses into existence and becomes indistinguishable from the existential ground. 4. The deepest moral intuitions inside religions already undermine belief-gated exclusivism, because responsibility tracks control and circumstance. 5. Religions function historically as translation layers and under institutional pressure as control overlays. These functions are not identical, and confusing them produces unnecessary conflict. 6. What remains after the collapse is not nihilism. What remains is the world, existence, finite minds, moral reality as lived consequence, and the need for intellectual honesty. I will close by restating the reversal that motivated this book. The human desire behind theism is often a desire for more meaning, more security, more moral order, more ultimate care. The tragedy is that the common implementation of that desire achieves the opposite. It reduces the cosmos to a manageable portrait, and then calls the portrait ultimate. It trades the infinite territory for a finite image, and then demands gratitude for the exchange. L refuses the trade. If reality is larger than every finite picture, then the most serious posture is not to cling to a finite God and call it infinity. The most serious posture is to let reality be as large as it is, to let the unknown remain unknown, and to build meaning and morality without pretending that a proxy is the thing it proxies. That is not a subtraction. It is a removal of blinders. It is also the only posture that treats both theists and atheists with conceptual fairness. Believers are not fools. Non-believers are not morally deficient. Both are finite minds inside the same existential ground. The difference is not who has reality. Reality is not a private possession. The difference is whether a finite model is treated as a doorway into reality, or as a wall placed in front of it. Chapter 11. Terminology, Notation, and Conventions. 11.1. How to use this appendix. This appendix is a reference layer for readers who want a clean map of the book's moving parts. It does 3 things. 1. It lists the logical and mathematical symbols that appear in the formal derivations. 2. It defines the book's technical terms in plain language. 3. It distinguishes system labels used in this project from established terms used in their ordinary scholarly sense. 11.2. Provenance key, what I am and am not claiming. In the glossary below, each entry is marked with one of these tags, system term, a technical label used as part of the FMFG framework, and, where noted, continuous with the larger existential logicism. Project. This tag does not claim that the underlying philosophical concern is historically new. It only means the label is used here as a defined tool inside this book. Standard term. An established term in philosophy, logic, theology, or the study of religion. These are included so readers can track what is being imported from the literature versus what is being formalized inside FMFG. Source label. A title, tradition, document family name, or proper noun used as a reference point, scriptures, councils, genres, etc. 11.3 Typographic conventions. Italics. Variables and schematic placeholders in formal sections, for example, P, Q, M, U. Quotation marks, used for ordinary language phrases that are being treated as candidate tokens or claims, for example, God exists. Small caps, not required. If your main template uses them, treat them as stylistic only. Definition, theorem, labels, if a glossary entry is formally defined in the text. I point to its chapter definition number, for example, def. 9.6. 11.4 Logical notation. This book uses standard logical notation in the usual way. 11.4.1 Propositional operators. Not P, P, Q, P, and Q. Q, inclusive. P, Q, P, and Q, and identity. X for all X, X there exists, and X equal to Y, identity. X for all, identity. A equal to B definitional assignment. Read as A is defined as B syntactic derivability. A proof system yields the conclusion. Semantic entailment. The conclusion follows in all relevant models. 11.5 Set. Several later chapters formalize map territory and institutional mechanisms using standard set and function notation. X is an element of the set A f x, y, a function f from domain X to codomain Y. 0, 1. A two-value codomain used for binary predicates, for example, inclusion versus exclusion. Sigma, an alphabet of symbols used to represent publicly observable records. The set of finite strings over sigma, used to represent publicly observable traces or records. 11.6 Project-specific schematic letters, what the symbols are doing. These letters are used in the book as schematic placeholders. They are not metaphysical commitments by themselves. M, a finite mind or epistemic subject, ch1 formal derivation. I am, the experiential interface of M, the totality of internal states through which anything is available for judgment, def. 1.3 GM, a God concept tokened in M, meaning the concept appears as a content item within I am, def. 1.3 U, an ultimate referent when the argument is evaluating ultimacy claims, for example, in Nondual or totality readings. T, a tradition, interpretive lineage, or doctrinal system when the argument compares structured religious claims. Tau, L, a translation layer map from a language L into an anchor domain, F, P, A, 0, 1. A predicate that classifies agents or cases by a binary inclusion condition used in CH9 formal derivation, M sigma, M a proxymetric function mapping observable records into a decision space, def. A compliance marker, a publicly observable token treated as evidence for inclusion, def. A threat architecture tuple of rewards. A threat architecture tuple of rewards are FMFG Finite God. The broader framework FMFG draws on CCC Catechism of the Catholic Church. CCC Catechism of the Catholic Church. NRS View New Revised Philosophy. System terms versus standard terms. System terms versary of key terms. So any content it can judge. A mind is faciant interface, states through which anything is available to a finite mind. God concept tokening. God concept tokened in order to be asserted at all. A God claim must be tokened if it appears. In default modern staging and atheism. The default modern station, system term. The constraints required for meaningful assertion by finite minds, already available categories under certain readings. Existential grand fact of existence, the shared floor of whatever obtains after object level God claims fail to name a stable kind of thing. Standard term, specialized use, a claim about what is decisive in meaning, value, or standing. If MFG does totality readings from personhood agent readings from personhood agent readings, some theological moves identify ultimacy with totality, which drives a non-constraint system term, the constraint that any meaningful claim must be expressible within a finite interface, and therefore cannot bypass perspectival limitation by pure stipulation. One main theorem sequence, interpretation and revelation. Human interface thesis, system term, the claim that there is no epistemic bypass around the human interface. Any revelation, scripture, tradition, or doctrine still enters human life through finite cognitive and social channels. Epistemic interface, system term. A structured set of internal states or tokens through which an agent encounters and assesses claims, def. 2.1, token, standard term, technical use, a concrete occurrence of a symbol or content item in an agent's interface. FMFG uses tokening to keep claims anchored to what finite minds can actually host, def. 2.1, revelation filter, system term. The set of human transmission constraints that any alleged revelation must pass through, language, memory, institutions, interpretive disputes, translation drift, incentives, and enforcement structures. Steelman, hermeneutic, system term, and interpretive. Discipline, read a tradition in its strongest coherent form before drawing conclusions, while still treating the reading as a finite map and not the territory itself. Closed revelation, standard term. A theological position that public revelation is complete and not open to further canonical additions, source label category. Silence of new revelation, system term. A diagnostic. Observation, if decisive divine guidance is claimed, persistent absence of publicly verifiable updates matters for how authority and enforcement get stabilized socially. 11.8.3 Fairness, accountability and salvation mechanics. Soteriology, standard term, a theory of salvation, how ultimate standing is gained, lost, or judged. Def. 4.1. Soteriological criterion, system term, a specific condition C such that meeting C is necessary or sufficient for salvation within a given system. Def. 4.1. Belief gate, system term. A soteriological criterion that requires holding a particular belief or assent state as a condition of ultimate standing. Def. 4.2. If a system makes ultimate outcomes depend on an individual's response to some content, then fairness requires genuine access to that content and the capacity to respond in the required way. Def. 3.7. Access condition, system term. The condition that a person must have a fair opportunity to encounter and understand the relevant saving content, not merely be exposed to noise or coercion. Def. 7. Capacity condition must have the cognitive, psychological, and situational ability to satisfy the required response, not just be demanded to do so. Def. Age of accountability, standard term. A family of doctrines, common in some Protestant settings, that treats moral or salvific accountability as beginning after a developmental threshold. Invincible ignorance, standard term, a Catholic category for ignorance not culpably acquired, often used to argue that lack of access can excuse condemnation. Doxastic voluntarism, standard term, the thesis that belief is voluntary, either directly, choosing beliefs at will, or indirectly, choosing actions that reliably produce beliefs. Def. 4.4. Doxastic involuntarism, standard term, the thesis that beliefs are not directly voluntary in the at-will sense. In FMFG, this matters because belief-gated soteriology can fail fairness if belief cannot be chosen. Def. System term, a practical test for direct voluntarism, whether an agent can sincerely form a belief on command, in the way one can raise a hand on command. Non-culpable non-belief, standard term, a condition, where someone lacks a belief without fault due to access limits, evidential conditions, or cognitive constraints. Salvation paradox, system term. A structural tension, strict belief gates and exclusionary criteria produce fairness failures under realistic access and capacity limits, while relaxing gates often dissolves the authority claims that motivated the strictness. 11.8.4 Translation layers, tradition, structure drift, and cross. Translation layer, system term. A mapping tau. L from a public language L into an anchor domain A that supplies meaning and reference. FMFG uses this to model religions as interpretive maps rather than direct access to an ultimate territory. Def. 5.4 Map territory gap, standard term, specialized use, the fact that representational systems are not identical to what they represent. FMFG formalizes this gap to block the move where a tradition treats its map as the territory itself. Def. 5.5 Translation drift, system term, divergence introduced by copying, oral transmission, editor, file selection, translation choices, institutional incentives, and interpretive disputes over time. Doctrinal divergence, system term, divergence at the level of explicit claims and propositions across traditions or within a tradition over time. Existential convergence, system term, convergence at the level of lived constraints and shared human conditions even when doctrines diverge. 11.8.5% predication, personhood, and the finite God trap. Predication, standard term, attributing a property to a subject, as in X is wise. Anthropomorphic predication, system term, attributing human-like psychological or agentive predicates to God, wants, chooses, commands, punishes, which can import finite agent structure into what is claimed to be ultimate, def. Personhood predicates, system term, predicates that imply agency or mindedness in a recognizably personal sense, intention, preference, deliberation, anger, approval, def. 7.1. Preference structure, system term, a pattern of ranked outcomes or approvals that functions like a choice profile. When attributed to ultimacy, it tends to force finitude-like constraints, def. 7.2. Finite God Trap, system term. The structural result that if a purported ultimate is described with personhood predicates and preference structure in a way that makes normative demands, it becomes functionally finite and contestable. Apophatic theology, standard term, a tradition of describing God by negation, emphasizing what cannot be said via negativa. Cataphatic theology, standard term, a tradition of describing God by positive predicates and analogies. Univocal, equivocal. Analogical predication, standard term, standard distinctions in philosophy of language and theology about whether predicates apply in the same sense, different senses, or analogically between God and creatures. Ineffability Shield, system term, a rhetorical move where ineffable is used not as humility, but as insulation, blocking evaluation while still extracting authority from the claim. Negative theology, standard term, another label for apophatic approaches that emphasize negation and limit statements. 11.8.6 Nondual ultimacy and practice vocabularies. Nondual ultimate, system term, a claimed ultimate that is not a separable individual alongside the world, often identified with totality or non-objectual ground. Each 8, formal derivation. Neti, standard term, source label. An Upanishadic formula meaning not this, not that, used for apophatic style negation. Atman, anatta, standard term, source label, Hindu and Buddhist terms for self. Atman and non-self, anatta, relevant to how personhood predicates get treated in some traditions. Upaya, standard term, source label, a Buddhist concept of skillful means, relevant to practice-first frameworks. Practice primacy, system term, a pattern where practice, discipline, or transformation is treated as epistemically prior to doctrine, especially when metaphysical claims are treated as provisional tools. 11.8.7 Institutions, enforcement, and overlays. Proxymetric, system term, a function from publicly observable records into a decision space, used as an operational substitute for an unobservable target predicate. Def. Compliance marker, system term, a publicly observable token or pattern, treated as evidence for inclusion or standing. Def. 9.3. Authority stacking, system term, a terminating chain of justificatory sources where contestation is stopped by appeal to a highest, non-appealable level inside the system. Def. 9.4. Threat architecture, system term, a tuple of rewards, sanctions, and enforcement rules that makes compliance behaviorally consequential, including social and other worldly forms. Def. 9.5. Control overlay, system term, an interpretive normative system that I makes an ultimacy claim, 2 ties inclusion to an unobservable predicate, and therefore 2 must govern via proxies, protect itself via authority stacking, and stabilize via enforcement. Def. 9.6. Orthodoxy policing, standard term, institutional practices that maintain boundary lines of accepted belief and punish deviance. Boundary ritual, standard term, public markers that separate in-group from out-group, often used to stabilize identity and compliance. 11.8.8 Source labels, texts and tradition terms that recur. Canon formation, standard term, the historical and institutional process by which a community fixes an authoritative text set. Oral tradition, transmission chain, standard term, mechanisms of preservation and handoff prior to or alongside written canonization. Trinity, standard term, a Christian doctrine about divine persons and unity, referenced where personhood predication and classical theism intersect. Classical theism, standard term, a broad label for the tradition emphasizing divine simplicity, immutability, and impassibility. 11.9% reader note, why the notation is here at all. The symbols are not included to make the argument look technical. They are included to make the dependencies explicit. When the prose says a framework forces proxy governance, or that a belief gate cannot satisfy fairness under finite access, the derivations show what assumptions are doing the work. If you ignore the symbols entirely, you can still follow the book. If you want to audit the machinery, the symbols are the shortest honest path. Bibliography.